I will tell everyone, those of you in the audience, we're so glad to have you here. Thanks so much for coming. This is a public hearing. It is also the official business of the United States of America, and as a result of that, the committee has a zero-tolerance policy for interruptions or for attempts by anyone in the room to communicate with somebody up here or the witness. So as a result of that, if you do disrupt, you will be arrested. You'll be banned for a year. However, I'm told that we have some guests today who have completed their ban and are back with us again today. We hope you've had the time to think about your indiscretions and will behave yourself today. If you don't, as a persistent violator, you'll be banned for 3 years this time. So in any event, welcome to everyone, and certainly Secretary Rubio, we're glad to have you here, and welcome back. The new co-pilot I got, Pete, is doing just fine in the seat you used to sit in, and I'm glad to have him. Thank you so much for being here. We were a little afraid we were going to lose you to the Miami Dolphins there for a while, but I guess that went a different direction, so it's certainly our gain. I'd like to start this hearing on the Venezuela situation by recognizing the brave men and women who participated in this operation. The intelligence gathering, planning, and execution were incredible. Only the U.S. could have pulled off this mission, and that's only because of the dedication and professionalism of each and every one of our service members. As we know, much of their work is done in secret. But I do hope these people will receive the accolades that they so rightly deserve. I also want to acknowledge the leadership of President Trump that he has shown, and also you, Secretary Rubio. It's no easy job keeping drugs and narco-terrorists off our streets and keeping Americans safe. Thank you for extraditing Nicolas Maduro and bringing him to account for his many crimes against the American people. Let me reiterate a point that I've made many times on the Senate floor. President Trump's actions against narco-terrorists and his capture of Maduro have made America safer. Every American should be thanking Donald Trump and Marco Rubio for what they have done. There are a lot of Americans today who wouldn't be alive if not for your commitment and dedication to stemming the flow of drugs into our country. The actions in Venezuela were limited in scope, short in duration, and done to protect U.S. interests and citizens. What President Trump has done in Venezuela is the definition of the President's Article 2 constitutional authorities as Commander-in-Chief, and wholly consistent with what other presidents' efforts and what they have done and actions they have taken to protect the American people come to order. Good morning, everyone. Our own hemisphere. In fact, President George H.W. Bush authorized similar, but much broader and more extensive military operations before I start to arrest and bring Panama's Manuel Noriega to the United States to stand trial for drug-related charges. This is a public hearing. In that case, President Bush also the official business of the United States of America, and as a result of that, for more than a month, the committee has at the time all leaders of the Senate, including Democrats, for attempts by anyone in the room to communicate. Unlike in Panama, President Trump authorized a much more limited military result of that, if you do disrupt, with only about 200 troops inside the country, you'll be arrested, you'll be banned in a firefight that lasted. However, I'm told less than we have some guests today who no loss of life on the United States and are back with us again today. Casualties. We hope you've had the time to this military action was incredibly brief, and targeted and successful. Will behave yourself. When bad guys are in the business of flying drugs into the United States, drugs that kill our children, hurt our country, so violate U.S. laws and destabilize our hemisphere. To everyone, and certainly they'll have to be held to answer for those actions, and that's what's being done now. Maduro was not recognized as the legitimate leader of Venezuela by President Trump, or even by President Biden, or by most of the international community. We were a little afraid we were going to lose you to the Miami Dolphins there for a while. This illegitimate leader has no went a different direction. So it's now the United States has a tremendous opportunity. I'd like to start the hearing because start this hearing on the Venezuela situation. There has been some confusion by recognizing how it will be done. Brave men and women who participated by the way you, Secretary Rubio, the intelligence gathering, planning, and execution right from the start. It is clear the U.S. could have pulled off this mission, and that's only because of the dedication, Venezuela's natural resources of each and every one of our service members. As we know, much of their work is done in secret, but I do hope these people will receive the accolades giving the United States tremendous leverage. I also want to acknowledge the leadership in years past. Many Americans are rightfully concerned about he has shown, and also you, Secretary. I know this administration no easy job keeping drugs and narco-terrorists off our streets and keeping Americans safe. Thank you for extraditing Nicolas Maduro and bringing him to account for his many crimes against the country has a history. Let me reiterate a point that I've made many times on the Senate floor. It is only during Trump's actions against narco-terrorists and his capture of Maduro have made the Venezuelan people safer. Are not strangers. Every American should be thanking Donald Trump and Marco Rubio for what they have done. You and the President are a lot of Americans today giving them another chance. Who wouldn't be alive. It is all our hope that the Venezuelan people will soon be able to hold free and fair elections and dedication for their leaders. Stemming the flow Venezuela may require U.S. and international oversight to ensure the actions in Venezuela are limited in scope, free, duration, and fair, and done to protect U.S. interests and citizens. Unlike the President Trump has done in Venezuela, is the definition. Secretary Rubio, thank you for being here today. I look forward to a productive and wholly consistent with that, with what other presidents' efforts and what they have done and actions they have taken to protect the American people
Mr. Chairman.
from threats
Welcome back,
in
Secretary
our own
Rubio.
hemisphere.
Thank you for
in fact,
being here.
President George H.W. Bush authorized
I certainly
similar,
agree with the
but
chairman
much broader
in terms of
and
his
more
comments
extensive
relative to
military
Nicolas
operations
Maduro.
to
He was
arrest
bad
and
for
bring
Venezuela.
Panama's
He was bad for the
Manuel
region. He
Noriega
was
to the
bad for
United
the
States
United
to stand
States.
trial for
I think the question we
drug-related
have to
charges.
ask now
In the case,
is, was
in
the
that
raid
case, President
to
Bush
arrest
deployed more
him
than
worth the
9,000
cost?
troops into
And
Panama
I also
for more
share
than a
the
month.
chairman's
At the time, all
admiration
leaders of the
for
Senate,
the
including
military
Democrats,
operation that
praised
took him out.
that move. Unlike in
The
Panama,
U.S. naval
President
blockade
Trump
around
authorized
Venezuela
a
and
much
the
more
raid
limited
have already
military
cost
action in
American
Venezuela,
taxpayers
with
hundreds
only
of millions
about
of dollars.
200 troops inside
Outside
the country
estimates
for a
are as
couple of
high
hours
as $1 billion.
in a firefight that
and
lasted
yet, the Maduro
less than
regime is
27
essentially
minutes,
still in
with
power.
no loss of life
All the
on
same
United
people are
States
running
side,
the country.
but significant
Maduro's
casualties
vice
on the
president,
other side.
now the interim
This military
president,
action was
has
incredibly
taken
brief,
no steps to
targeted,
diminish
and
Iran,
successful.
China,
When bad
or
guys are in the
Russia's
business of
considerable
flying drugs into the
influence
United
in
States,
Venezuela.
drugs that kill our children,
One of the
hurt
reasons
our
that
country,
has been given
violate U.S.
for
laws, and
the mission.
destabilize our hemisphere,
Her cooperation
then,
appears
you'll
tactical
have
and
to-
temporary
they'll
and
have
not
to be
a real
held,
shift
to
in
answer for
Venezuela's
those
alignment.
actions, and that's what's being done.
In the process, we
Maduro was
traded
not
one dictator
recognized as
for
the
another.
legitimate leader of
So it's no
Venezuela by
wonder that
President
so many of my
Trump, or even
constituents are
by
asking,
President Biden,
why is
or
the
by most of
president
the
spending
international
so much
community.
time focused
It
on
is a service
Venezuela
to the world
instead of the
that this
cost of
illegitimate
living and
leader
their kitchen
is no
table
longer
economic
in power.
concerns?
Now the United States has a
Unfortunately,
tremendous
I
opportunity
think this has been a
before us
pattern
in
across the
Venezuela.
administration.
Because of the complexity
losing sight
of this
of what
operation,
actually
there
advances
has been
America's
some
interests
confusion
and
as to how it
delivers
will be
results
done.
for the American
I've been
people.
impressed by the
Take
way
the
you,
elimination of
Secretary Rubio,
personnel
explained the plan to me
and
going
departments that
forward
were
right
critical
from
to
the
our
start.
national security,
It is clear
for example.
and it's doable. I know
These
you
are
will lay that out
cost-effective
for us here
tools
today.
like Voice of
Venezuela's
America that
natural
help us
resources have
advance
frequently
America's
been used
interests
to bolster the
globally.
economy
And
of our
Mr. Secretary,
adversaries,
as you
especially
remember,
China.
you strongly
Through President
supported
Trump's
most of these
actions, we
programs
have
when you were on
effectively
this
cut off
side
that
of the
supply,
dais.
giving the United States
The administration
tremendous
says
leverage.
those cuts were
After our
about
lengthy
saving money.
engagements in the Middle East in
But the
years
total
past,
federal
many
spending
Americans
last year
are
went up
rightfully
by 4%,
concerned
not
about
down.
so-called
We
forever
spent
wars.
more, not
I know
less.
this administration
As
is
a result, our
laser
adversaries
focused
like China
on
are
avoiding
expanding
those
their
experiences.
influence. And
With
there is
Nicolas
broad
Maduro out of power,
bipartisan
the United
agreement
States
in
has the
Congress
opportunity to
that
better
China
protect
is the
America
central
by bringing
strategic
stability
challenge
to
of our
Venezuela.
time. The
The country
president
has a
himself has said
history
that as well.
of democracy,
But we're
capitalism,
cutting
and a
foreign
respect
aid
for
and
human
diplomacy
rights.
tools.
It is only during
We're
the last
leaving
two
embassies
dictatorships
without
that it has
leadership.
lost these
We're shutting
attributes.
down
The
counter
Venezuelan
disinformation
people
programs.
are not
We are
strangers
driving
to these
talent away from
concepts
the United
and
States
long
while
to have
Beijing
them
is
reinstated.
actively recruiting.
They have
and I
you
would just
and
like
President
to point
Trump
out,
to thank
this is
for
a
giving
picture
them another chance.
of the globe.
It is all our hope
These
that the
are
Venezuelan people will
countries
soon
where
be able
China
to hold free
has
and fair
ambassadors
elections for their leaders.
in those
to get there,
countries.
Venezuela may
All
require
of the
U.S.
red.
and international
Those are
oversight
China.
to ensure these
Places
elections
where their
are indeed
diplomats are on
free
the ground,
and
except
fair.
of course for China, which is in blue, and they don't need
Unlike
to put
their
diplomats
most
there.
recent
This
elections.
map,
Secretary
this is
Rubio,
where
thank you for
we
being here
have
today. I look forward to a
diplomats.
productive
You can
discussion.
see the
And
red
with that, I'd like
is
to
where
hear
we're filled.
the distinguished
And look at
ranking
all of the
member's
white,
views on
where we
these
do
matters.
not
Senator
have
Shaheen.
ambassadors.
Thank you, Mr.
on the
Chairman.
ground.
Welcome back, Secretary Rubio. Thank you for being here.
We're even giving China
I
some of
certainly
our
agree
most
with the chairman
advanced
in terms of his
semiconductors.
comments relative
And
to
after a
Nicolas
year of
Maduro.
tariffs that
He
were
was
supposed
bad
to
for
make us
Venezuela.
stronger,
He was bad for the
China's
region,
posted
and he was
the
bad for the
largest
United
trade
States.
surplus in history.
I think the question we have
and
to
American
ask families are
as was
paying
the raid
more to
at a
arrest
time when the
him
prices were
worth
already too
the
high.
cost. And
Since
I
the
also
start of
shared
the tariff campaign in
chairman's,
2025,
admiration
U.S.
for
manufacturing
the
employment has
military
fallen by
operation
anywhere from
that took
50
him
to
out.
70,000 jobs,
But
depending
the
on
U.S.
whose
naval
estimates
blockade
you look
around
at.
Venezuela and
That's a
the
trend that
raid have already
undercuts
cost American
promises that
taxpayers
tariffs would bring
hundreds of
factory
millions of
jobs
dollars.
roaring back.
Outside
And
estimates are
instead
as
of
high
creating
as
a
$1 billion.
united front
And
against
yet,
China,
the Maduro
we're
regime
pushing
is
our
essentially
closest
still in
allies
power.
into their
All the
arms.
same people are
Just
running
look
the
at
country.
Canada,
Maduro's vice
whose
president, now the
business
interim
with
president,
the state of New
has
Hampshire
taken
has
no
been really
steps
critical.
to diminish Iran,
They recently
China,
cut a trade
or
deal
Russia
with China
considerable
because they no
influence
longer
in
view the
Venezuela.
United States as a
One of the
reliable
reasons
partner.
that has been given
Pushing
for
allies
the mission
away like that is
for
not
cooperation
strategic
appears
competition.
tactical and
It is
temporary,
unilateral
and not a real
disarmament.
shift in Venezuela's
We see the
alignment.
same gap between
In the
rhetoric and
process,
reality
we've traded
and how
one
this
dictator for
administration
another.
deals with other
So
authoritarian
it's no wonder
regimes.
that so many of my
At a
constituents
time when
are
Iran
asking,
is violently
why is the
cracking down on
president spending
protests,
so much time focused
US
on
is coming to
Venezuela
agreements
instead
to
of the
deport
cost of living
Iranians in
and their
this
kitchen table
country
economic
back
concerns.
to Iran. People who
Unfortunately,
will face
I think this has been a
persecution
pattern
and
across the
interrogation by
administration,
Iranian security
losing sight of
forces.
what actually advances
And yet
America's
President
interests
Trump told the
and
Iranian
delivers
people that
results
help
for
was
the
on the
American
way.
people.
But
Take the
United States
elimination
has
of
largely
personnel
stood on the sidelines as the
and
departments that were
situation
critical
has
to our national
deteriorated.
security, for example.
Americans are right in
These are
thinking that the Trump
cost-effective
administration
tools
is
like
tougher
Voice
on
of
our
America
allies
that help us
than on
advance
most
America's
of our
interests
adversaries.
globally.
And
I
Mr.
just returned from
Secretary, as you
Denmark,
remember, you strongly
where I met
supported
with
most
Danish
of these
and Greenlandic
programs when you
leaders.
were on
Senator
this side
Coons
of
was
the
also
dais.
on that trip. He led
The
it.
administration says
What I
those
heard
cuts
directly
were about
is
saving
that
money.
President Trump's
But
threats
the total
to take
federal
green
spending
money
last year
have
went up
shaken
by 4%,
public confidence
not
in the
down.
United States
We spent
to the
more,
core,
not
and
less.
this from an ally.
As a result, our
who
adversaries like
first
China are expanding
recognize
their
the
influence.
new United States
and
of
there is
America in
broad bipartisan
1792
agreement in
has
Congress
fought on our
that
side
China
in both
is the
world
central
wars and in
strategic challenge
Afghanistan.
of our time.
And I heard from
The
one
president
Danish
himself
American
has said
woman
that
whose
as well.
son holds both citizenships.
But we're cutting
and is
foreign
approaching
aid and
conscription
diplomacy
age.
tools.
That
We're
she's
leaving
worried that her
embassies
son might
without
one day
leadership.
be forced
We're
to
shutting
choose
down
between the two
counter
countries
disinformation
that he
programs.
loves. We are driving
That
talent
kind
away
of
from the
fear
United
would have
States
been
while
unthinkable
Beijing is
2 years ago.
actively recruiting
Or
it.
10 years
And I would
ago.
just like to point out
Or
this is a
50 years
picture
ago.
of the globe.
There is no strategic
These
objective
are
in Greenland
countries where
that
China
cannot
has
be achieved through
ambassadors
cooperation.
in those countries.
The only thing these
all of
threats
the
have
red,
accomplished
those are
is
China.
weakening trust
And
in the United States.
places where
That trust is the
diplomats are on the
foundation of our
ground,
alliances.
except, of course,
and
for
at a
China,
moment
which
when
is in
Russia
blue,
is
and they don't need to
waging the
put
largest
diplomats
land
there.
war in Europe since World War II,
This map
we should be
this is where
strengthening allied
we
unities.
have
Instead,
diplomats.
we're undermining it.
You can see the red.
European allies
where
are
we're
worried
filled.
about open conflict
And look at
with
all
the
of the
United
white,
States.
where we
Canadian
do
trading
not
partners
have
are turning toward
ambassadors
China
on the ground.
instead of the U.S. And the constant threat of new tariffs raising
even
prices
giving China
and making
some
it
of our
impossible
most
for
advanced
businesses to invest
semiconductors
is
And after a year of
ever-present.
tariffs that were supposed to make
So,
us stronger,
From
China's
Venezuela
posted
to Europe,
the
the
largest
United States
trade
is spending
surplus
more
in history,
risking more,
and American
achieving
families are paying more at a
That
time
does
when the
not
prices
project
were
strength.
already too high.
It hands
Since
our
the start of the
adversaries
tariff campaign
exactly
in
what they want.
2025,
Thank you, Mr.
U.S.
Chairman.
manufacturing employment
Thank you,
has
Senator
fallen by
Shaheen.
anywhere
We're now
from
going to hear
50
from
to
Secretary
70,000
Rubio.
jobs,
After
depending
that,
on
we'll do
whose
a round
estimates
of
you look at.
5-minute questions.
That's a trend that
And
undercuts
so with
promises that tariffs would
Secretary
bring
Rubio,
factory jobs
welcome back
roaring
to the committee. Love to
And
hear what you
instead
have
of
to say.
creating a
Thank you.
united
I
front
appreciate it. And I'll be
against
brief in
China,
my opening statement so
we're
we can leave
pushing
more
our
time for
closest
questions. I've
allies
submitted
into their arms.
a written statement, but
Just
I'm
look
not
at
going to
Canada,
use it. I'm just going to talk to you guys for a
whose
few minutes.
business with the state of New Hampshire
All right, here
has
we
been
go.
really critical. They recently cut a trade
been-
deal with China.
you know the
because
drill.
They no
Off to
longer
jail.
view the United States as a
That's a
reliable
one-year
partner.
ban from the committee.
Pushing allies away like that
Anyone
is
who
not
is a persistent
strategic
violator
competition.
will be
It
banned
is
for 3 years.
unilateral
So
disarmament.
Don't know whether the guy falls in that category.
We see the same gap between rhetoric and reality and how this administration deals with other
Secretary
authoritarian
Rubio, we have 2
regimes.
hearings
At a time
week,
when Iran is violently cracking down
seem
on
to have a more
protests,
robust
the
following
U.S.
than
is
most
coming
of
to
our,
agreements to
witnesses that
deport
come before us. But
Iranians in this
anyway,
country back to Iran.
There'll be a couple more,
People
so
will
I
face
just
prosec-
thank you for stopping the
persecution
clock.
and interrogation by Iranian
I
security
appreciate it.
forces.
So,
And yet
and I know there's a lot of other
President Trump
topics
told
you're going
the
to ask me
Iranian
about,
people
so we
that
can
help
talk
was
about
on the
those,
way.
including the ones that
But the United States has largely stood on the
Senator Shaheen
sidelines
outline,
as the
but let me just talk about
situation
Venezuela
has
in particular.
deteriorated.
Please.
Americans
I think we
are
can
right
talk,
in
if you want. I'm
thinking
sure
that
your
the Trump
questions will be about what
administration is
happened
tougher
before and
on
led
our
up to in the
allies
operation.
than
I
on
want to
most
focus
of
my
our
comments this
adversaries.
morning on what happens now.
I just returned from Denmark,
because you're going to ask
where I
about
met with
the
Danish
going
and
back.
Greenlandic leaders.
And
Senator
let me
Coons
just say
was
this: what
also
is our
on that
goal
trip.
going
He
in?
led
We
it.
had in our hemisphere
What I heard directly
a regime
is that President Trump's threats to
operated
take
by
Greenland
an indicted narco
have shaken
trafficker
public
that
confidence
became a
in the
base of
United
operation
States
for
to the
virtually
core.
every competitor,
And this from an
adversary, and
ally
enemy in the world.
who
It was, for
first
Iran, their primary spot
recognized
of
the
operation
new
in the
United
Western
States of
Hemisphere
America in
was Venezuela.
1792.
For Russia,
has fought on our
their
side
primary
in both
base of
world wars
operation in
and
the
in
Western Hemisphere,
Afghanistan.
along Cuba and
And I
Nicaragua,
heard from one Danish
was
American
Venezuela.
woman whose
In the
son
case of
holds
China,
both citizenships
China was
and is
receiving
approaching
oil at a
conscription
huge, like
age,
$20 a barrel
that she's
discount.
worried that her son might one
And
day
what
be
they weren't
forced to
even paying money
choose
for it.
between
It
the
was
two
being used to
countries
pay down
that
debt
he
that they were
loves.
owed. This is the
That
oil
kind
of
of
the people of
fear would have
Venezuela, and
been
it was being given to the
unthinkable 2
Chinese
years
as
ago.
barter at a
Or 10
20%,
years
at a
ago.
$20
Or
discount per barrel in some
50 years
cases.
ago.
And so you had
There is
basically
no
three of our
strategic
primary
objective in Greenland that
opponents
cannot
in the
be
world
achieved through
operating from our
cooperation.
hemisphere from that
The
spot.
only thing
it was
these
also a
threats
place
have
where you had a
accomplished
narco-trafficking
is
regime that
weakening
openly
trust in the United
cooperated
States.
with the FARC
That
and the
trust
ELN
is the
and other
foundation of our
drug trafficking
alliances.
organizations
And at a
using
moment
their
when
national
Russia is
territory.
waging
It
the
was an
largest
enormous
land war in
strategic
Europe
risk for the
since
United
World War
States,
II,
not
we
halfway
should be
around the world,
strengthening
not in
allied
another
unities.
continent,
Instead,
but
we're
in the hemisphere
undermining
in
it.
which we all live. And it was having dramatic
European
impacts
allies
on
are
us,
worried about
but also
open
on Colombia
conflict with the
and on the
United
Caribbean
States.
basin. and
Canadian
all sorts
trading
of other
partners are
places.
turning
It
toward
was an
China
untenable situation,
instead of the
and
U.S.
it had to be addressed.
And the constant
And
threat
it was
of new
addressed.
tariffs
And
raising
now the
prices
question
and
becomes
making
what
it
happens
impossible
moving
for
forward.
businesses
As
to
I've
invest
described to you in previous
is
settings and in
ever
individual
present.
conversations, we had
So,
three objectives here.
from
The final,
Venezuela
I'll
to
work
Europe,
it backwards
the United
because,
States is spending
the
more,
end state here is we
risking
want
more,
we
and
want
achieving
to reach a
less.
phase of transition where we
That
are left
does
with a
not
friendly,
project strength.
stable,
It hands
prosperous
our
Venezuela
adversaries
and democratic,
exactly what
in
they
which
want.
all elements of
Thank you, Mr.
society are
Chairman.
represented and free and
Thank
fair
you, Senator
elections.
Shaheen.
By the way,
We're
you
now
can have
going to hear
elections.
from Secretary
You can have
Rubio.
elections all
After
day.
that, we'll do a
But if
round
the opposition
of,
has no access to the
5-minute
media,
questions.
if
And
opposition
so with
candidates
that,
are routinely
Secretary Rubio,
dismissed
welcome
and
back to the
unable
committee.
to
We'll
be
hear
on
what you have to say.
unable
Thank
to
you.
be on
I
the ballot
appreciate it.
because
And
the
I'll be
government
brief
goes
in
on
my
free and
opening
fair
statement so we
elections.
can leave more
That's
time
the
for
end state
questions.
that
I've
we want.
submitted
Free,
a written
fair,
statement, but I'm
prosperous,
not
and
going to use
friendly
it. I'm just going to
Venezuela.
talk to you guys.
We're
for a
not
few
going to get
minutes
there in
and-
3 weeks. It's going to take some time.
All right, here we go.
And so objective number one was stability. In the aftermath of the
been-
removal
you know
of
the
Maduro,
drill.
the
Off to
concern was
jail.
what happens in Venezuela. Is there
That's a
civil
one-year
war?
ban
Different factions
from the
start
committee.
going at each other. Are a million
Anyone
people
who
crossing
is
the
a
border into
persistent
Colombia?
violator will
All
be
of that has been
banned for
avoided.
3 years.
And one of the
Don't know what
primary
the
ways
guy
that it has
falls in
been
that
avoided is the
category
ability
looks
to
like.
establish
I hope
direct,
after 3 years,
honest,
you'll find a more productive
respectful,
means of employment.
but very
Secretary
direct
Rubio,
and
we have two
honest
hearings
conversations
a week.
with the
you know,
people who today control the
you
elements
seem
of
to have
that
a more
nation,
robust following
meaning the
than
law
most of
enforcement,
our,
the government
witnesses who
apparatus,
come
et
before
cetera.
us. But
And one of the
anyway,
tools that's available to us is the fact
There'll
that
be a
we have
couple more,
sanctions
so
on
I just
there was
it
oil
will
that
leave-
is
stopping the
sanctioned that
clock,
cannot
but-
move from Venezuela
I appreciate
because
it. So-
of our quarantine.
And I know
so
there's a
what
lot
we
of
did is
other
we entered
topics you're
into
going to
an
ask me
arrangement
about,
with
so
them.
we can
And the
talk about
arrangement is
those,
this:
including the
on the oil
ones
that is
that
sanctioned in quarantine, we will allow you to
Senator
move
Shaheen
it
just
to
outlined,
market.
but
We
let me
will
just
allow
talk
you to
about
move it to
Venezuela in
market
particular.
at market
Please.
prices, not at the discount.
I think we can
China is
talk,
getting.
if you want, I'm sure your
In
questions will be
return,
about what
the
happened
funds
before
from
and
that
led
will
up
be
to in the
deposited
operation.
into an
I want to
account
focus my
that we
comments
will
this
have
morning what
oversight
happens
over.
now moving
And
forward.
you will
'Cause you're gonna
spend
ask
that
about
money for the benefit of the
going back.
Venezuelan people.
And
Why was that
let me just say
important?
this. What is our goal
Venezuela was
going
running
in?
out
We
of
had in our
storage capacity.
hemisphere
Okay, they were producing
regime
oil, they were drilling oil, they had nowhere to put
operated
it.
by
They had nowhere
an
to move
indicted
it, and they were facing a
narco-trafficker
fiscal crunch.
that became a
They
base
needed
of
money in the
operation for
immediacy to
virtually
fund
every
the police
competitor,
officers, the
adversary, and
sanitation
enemy in the
workers,
world.
the daily
It was,
operations
for
of
Iran,
government.
their
And so we've been
primary
able to
spot of
create a
operation in the
short-term
Western
mechanism. This is
Hemisphere
not going to be the
was
permanent
Venezuela.
mechanism.
For
But this
Russia,
is a short-term
their primary
mechanism in
base
which
of
the needs
operation
of the
in the Western
Venezuelan people
Hemisphere,
can be
along
met
Cuba and
through a
Nicaragua,
process that we've
was
created,
Venezuela.
where they will
In the
submit
case of
every
China,
month
a budget,
China
this is
was
what we need
receiving
funded. We will
oil at a
provide
huge
for them
buck
at
at the front
$20
end, what
a
that
barrel
money
discount.
cannot be used for.
And
they've
they
been
weren't
very
even paying money
cooperative in
for
this
it. It
regard.
was being
In
used to
fact,
pay down debt
they
that
have
they were
pledged
owed.
to use a
This is
substantial
the
amount
oil
of
of the
funds
people of
to
Venezuela, and
purchase
it was being given to
medicine
the Chinese
and
as
equipment
barter
directly
at a
from the United
20%
States.
at a $20
As
discount
in
per
fact,
barrel
one of
in
the
some
things they
cases.
need is diluent.
And so you had
Dilute,
basically three
depending
of
how
our
you wanna
primary
pronounce it. And that basically basically is
opponents
the
in the
light
world
crude that you need to
operating
mix
from our
with the heavy
hemisphere
crude in
from
order
that
for the
spot.
oil to
It was
be able
also
to
a
be
place where you had a
mixed and moved.
narco-trafficking regime
They're
that
getting, they
openly
used to get 100%
cooperated
of that from
with
Russia.
the FARC.
They are
and
now
the
getting
ELN
100%
and other
of that
drug
from the
trafficking
United
organizations
States.
using their
So,
national territory.
We're
It was
using
an
that
enormous
short-term
strategic
mechanism
risk
both
for
to
the United
stabilize
States,
the country,
not
but also
halfway
to make
around the
sure
world,
that the oil
not in another
proceeds that are
continent,
currently being
but
generated
in the
through
hemisphere
the
in which
licenses
we
will
all
now
live.
begin
And
to
it was
issue
having
on
dramatic
the
impacts
sanctioned oil
on us,
goes
but
to the
also on
benefit of the
Colombia
Venezuelan
and on the
people,
Caribbean
not to
basin
fund
and
the
all
system
sorts
that
of other
existed in the
places.
past.
It was an untenable
The
situation.
second is a
and it had to
period
be
of
addressed.
recovery. And
it
that
was
is the phase in
addressed.
which you want to
And
see
now
a
the question
normalized
becomes what
oil
happens
industry.
moving
Again, this is,
forward.
look,
As I've
we've got
described
plenty
in
of oil. There's
previous
plenty of
settings
oil
and
all over the
individual
world.
conversations.
Canada
We had
produces
3
heavy crude,
objectives
so
here.
it's not like
The
Venezuela
final,
as well
I'll
is
work it
unique in that
backwards
regard,
because
despite the fact they
the
have
end
the largest
state here
known
is we
reserves
want
in the world.
we
It's
want
not
to reach a phase of transition.
But we understand
where we are
that that
left
is
with a
lifeline.
friendly,
Their natural resources
stable,
are going to allow
prosperous
Venezuela to be stable
Venezuela,
and prosperous
and democratic
moving forward,
in which
And
all
so we've
elements
created
of
this-
society
what we
are
hope to do is
represented in
transition
free and
to a
fair
mechanism.
elections.
By the way,
that
you can
allows
have
that to
elections.
be sold in a
You can have
normal way,
elections
a
all day.
normal oil
But
industry.
if the opposition
Not
has
one
not
dominated
access
by
to the
cronies,
media,
not one dominated
if
by graft and
opposition
corruption.
candidates are
To that
routinely
end, dismissed, and
the authorities there
unable
deserve
to
some credit.
be
They
on
have
the-
passed a new
unable to
hydrocarbon
be
law
on the ballot
that
because the
basically
government does not
eradicates
free and fair
many of the
elections.
Chavez
That's the
era
end-state
restrictions
restrictions
on
free,
private investment
fair,
in the oil
prosperous, and
industry.
friendly Venezuela.
It probably
We're not
doesn't
going to
go
get
far
there in
enough
3
to
weeks.
attract sufficient
It's
investment,
going to take some
but it's
time.
a big step from
And
where
so
they were
objective
3
number
weeks
one
ago.
was stability.
So that's a major
In the
change.
aftermath of the removal
we
of
can
Maduro,
address some of the other
concern
components,
was
but I'll
what
run out of
happens in
time.
Venezuela.
But
Is there
one of the
civil
parts of
war?
the
Do the different
transition
factions
phase
start going at
or
each
the
other?
recovery phase
Are a million people
is beginning
crossing the
to
border
create
into
space
Colombia
for different voices.
All of that has been avoided
inside of
and one of the
Venezuelan
primary
politics
ways
to
that
have
it has
an
been
ability
avoided
to
is the
speak
ability to
out.
establish
Part of that
direct,
is the release of
honest,
political prisoners. By some
respectful,
estimates, up to 2,000.
but very direct
They are
and
releasing
honest
them. They are releasing them probably
conversations with the
slower than I
people
would
who
like
today
them to.
control the
But
elements
they are
of that
releasing
nation.
them. And in fact, you're
Meaning
starting
the
to see
law
some of the people
enforcement,
being
the government
released, beginning to
apparatus,
speak
etc.
out and participate.
And one of the
in political
tools that's
life in the
available
country.
to
We have
us
a
is the
long
fact
ways
that to
we
go.
have sanctions
Look,
on
we can
oil.
talk in more detail
There's
about
oil
all
that
of
is
these
sanctioned.
things that
Suffice it
cannot
to
move
say, I'm not here to
from
claim to you this
Venezuela
is going to be
because
easy or
of our
simple.
quarantine.
I am
And
saying
so what we
that
did
in
is we
3.5
entered into an
almost 4
arrangement with
weeks,
them, and the
we are
arrangement is
much
this.
further
On the oil
along
that is
on this
sanctioned in
project than we
quarantine,
thought we would
we
be
will
given the
allow you to move it
complexities
to
of
market.
going into it.
We will allow
And
you
I
to move it to
recognize
market.
that it won't be easy.
Market
I mean, look,
prices,
at the end of the day, we
not
are
at the
dealing with
discount
people
China
over there
was
that have
getting.
spent
In
most of their
return,
lives living in a
the
gangster
funds from that
paradise.
will be
So
deposited
it's not
into
going to
an
be like
account
from one day
that
to
we
the
will have
next.
oversight over.
We're going to have this thing
And
turn
you
around
will
overnight. But I
spend
think
that
we're
money
making
for the
good and
benefit of
decent
the
progress.
Venezuelan people.
It is the
Why
best
was
plan,
that
and we are
important?
certainly better off
Venezuela
today
was running out
in
of storage
Venezuela
capacity
than we were 4 weeks
They were
ago.
producing oil,
And I
they
think
were drilling
and
oil, they had
hope
nowhere to put
and
it.
expect
They had
that
nowhere
we'll
to
be better
move it,
off
and
in
they
3
were
months
facing
and
a
6
fiscal
months and
crunch.
9 months than
They
we would
needed
have
money
been
in the
had Maduro
immediacy
still
to
been
fund the
there.
police office, for
you.
the sanitation workers, the daily operations of government.
Thank you,
And so we've been able to create a
Secretary
short-term
Rubio. We'll now
mechanism. This is
do
not
a,
going to be the permanent mechanism.
round
But
of
this is a
questions, 5
short-term
minutes
mechanism
each.
in which the needs of the
I'd like to
Venezuelan
start,
people can be
and,
met
I'd ask you
through
to
a
go-
process that we've
I understand
created,
we're not in a
where they will
classified
submit
setting,
every month
but,
a budget of this is
I
what we
think,
need funded.
a
We
lot
will
of
provide
people
for them
have
at the front
no
end what that money
understanding of
cannot be
the-
used for.
of
And they've been
the
very cooperative
groundwork
in this
that
regard.
was
In
done
fact,
before,
they have pledged to
the
use a
actual
substantial amount of those funds
action
to
took place.
purchase
I was
medicine
incredibly
and
impressed
equipment
with,
directly
what
from
you
the
told
United
me
States.
about,
As in fact,
how
one of the
you,
things
the
they need
president,
is dilutin, or dilutin, depending
negotiated
how you want to
with
pronounce
parties
it.
there on the
And that
ground,
basically is
particularly the
the
parties
light
who
crude
were,
that you need to mix with their heavy
going
crude
to
in order
be
for the oil to
in
be able to
charge
be mixed
after,
and moved.
Maduro
They used
was
to get
removed.
100% of that from
And,
Russia.
I
They are
wonder
now
if you
getting
could talk about
100%
that
of
for a
that
minute,
from the
understanding that
United States.
we aren't
So
in a classified
we're using that
setting.
short-term mechanism both to stabilize
And,
the country,
I'd
but
like
also
to,
to make
if you
sure
could,
that the oil
say a few
proceeds
things
that are
on that.
currently
One of the
being
things I've come
generated
to maybe
through
more
the
fully
licenses
appreciate
will now
than I
begin
did
to issue
when I was
on
here
the
in the
sanctioned
Senate
oil
was the
goes
number
to
of
the benefit of the
contingencies that the
Venezuelan
Department
people,
of War
not to
plans
fund
for all over the
the
world. The
system that
overwhelming
existed in the
vast majority of
past.
them will never come to
The
fruition.
second is a
But there's
period
all kinds
of recovery,
contingencies that are planned
and that
for.
is the phase in
And
which
one
you want to see a
contingency
normalized
that had to
oil
be
industry.
planned
Again,
for
this
is the
is
fact that
look,
sitting
we've
in
got plenty of
Venezuela
oil. There's plenty of oil
with a
all over the
$50 million
world.
reward on his
Canada
head
produces
was
heavy
an
crude,
indicted
so it's not like Venezuela as well as unique
fact,
in that
I
regard.
believe it's the
Despite
largest
the fact
reward
they
we've
have
ever
the largest
issued for
known
anybody.
reserves in the
I'd
world.
remind everybody the
It's
Biden
not
administration had a
irreplaceable.
$25 million reward.
But we understand that
on
that is the
indicted
lifeline. Their
narco
natural
trafficker.
resources are going to
The same
allow
person.
Venezuela to be stable
And
and
so,
prosperous.
multiple administrations from both
so we
parties
created
have
the,
wanted
what we
this
hope
man
to do is
arrested.
transition to a
And
mechanism
one of the options
that
the
allows
president
that to
had
be
beforehand
sold in a normal
was
way,
the
a normal
opportunity if
oil
things didn't
industry.
work out to
not
go in
one
and remove
dominated
this
by cronies,
individual
not one
because he was
dominated by
wanted
graft
in
and
a law
corruption.
enforcement operation.
To that end,
Now, obviously, a law enforcement
the authorities there
operation
deserve some credit. They
the
have
de
passed a new
facto
hydrocarbon
head of
law
a
that basically eradicates
is
many
not
of the
as simple as
Chavez
going after some
era
fugitive hiding in
restrictions
a
on
closet
private
somewhere.
investment in the oil
It
industry.
required planning and it required
It probably doesn't go
eliminating
far enough
anything
to
that
attract sufficient
was a threat
investment,
to the
but it's a
forces that
big
were
step
going
from
in
where
to
they were
distract
3
them.
weeks ago.
I want to be
So
clear,
that's
and
a
I'll
major
share with you
change.
what I've shared publicly.
We can address
We
some
made
of the other
multiple
components,
attempts
but I'll run out
to
of
get
time.
Maduro
But
to
one of the
leave
parts of the
voluntarily,
transition
and
phase
to
or the
avoid all
recovery
of this.
phase is beginning
Because we
to create
understood that he
space
was an
for
impediment
different
to progress.
voices
You couldn't make a deal with
inside
this guy.
of Venezuelan
Okay?
politics.
This guy has
They
made
haven't multiple deals, he's broken every one of them. As a part of that is the release of political prisoners. He made a deal with the Biden administration. By some estimates, up to 2,000. It was a bad deal. They are releasing them probably slower than I would like them to. Pardon my nephews. And in fact, you're starting to see some of the people being released beginning to speak out and convicted already and serving time in the country. We have a long ways to go. Pardon and release. We can talk in more detail about all of these things. Suffice it to say, I'm not here to claim this is going to be easy or simple with Iran. I am saying that in 3.5, almost 4 weeks, we are much further along on this project to release some political prisoners, which he did. Many of them were subsequently. And I recognize that it won't be easy. I mean, look, at the end of the day, we are dealing with people over there that have spent most of their lives living in disqualified Maria Corina Machado. It's not going to be like from one day to the next. And Edmundo Gonzalez ends up being the nominee for the opposition party. But I think we're making good and decent progress. It is the best plan, and we are certainly better off today. And despite that, he loses an election that everyone around the world recognizes and hope and expect. So he's made better off in 3 months. In fact, he's broken so many deals, not even the Vatican still been there, has been willing to interact with Maduro in the past because he's broken so many of these deals. He's just simply not a guy who can make a deal. He had no intent of keeping it. What he wanted to do was tap us along and buy 3 years of time until he could deal with the new administration.
I understand we're not in a classified setting.
He was an impediment to progress.
I think
None of the things we're talking about now,
no
not the release of
understanding
political
of the
prisoners,
of
not the
the
transition of the
groundwork
oil
was
industry to a
done
legitimate
before,
oil industry,
the
not
actual,
the
action took
erosion
place.
of Iranian,
I was
Russian, or
incredibly
Chinese
impressed
influence.
with,
None of
what
these
you
things would have
told
been
me
possible as
about,
long as Maduro was there.
how you,
and so
the
this was one
president,
option that was available to the president
negotiated
after
with
exhausting
parties there on the ground,
every other option to
particularly the
remove
parties
this
who
individual
were
from the scene.
going to
Again,
be
I'm not here to
charge
tell you these are all going to be
after,
roses along the way and
Maduro
it's all going to
was
go
removed.
perfectly. But for the first time in 20
I wonder if you
years,
could
we are
talk
having
about that for a
serious
minute, understanding that
counter-narcotic talks
we aren't
with Venezuelan
in a
authorities about
classified
going
setting.
after counter-narcotics,
And
about
I'd
going
like
after
to,
narcotics
if you could,
organizations.
say
For
a
the
few
first
things.
time in
One of
20
the
years,
things I've
we are
come
having
to
serious
maybe more fully
conversations
appreciate than I
about
did when I
eroding
was
and
here in the
eliminating
Senate
the Iranian
was the number of
presence, the Chinese
contingencies that the
influence,
Department of
the
War
Russian
plans for all
presence
over
as
the
well.
world. The
In
overwhelming
fact, I would
vast
tell you
majority
that there are
of them will
many
never come to
elements
fruition. But there's
there
all
in
kinds of
Venezuela
contingencies
that
that are planned
welcome
for.
a
And
return
one
to
contingency
establishing relations
that
to
had
the
to be
United
planned
States
for
on
is the
multiple
fact that
fronts.
sitting in Venezuela,
we are at the end talking about a
with a
Western
$50 million
country
reward
that has a
on his
long
head,
history of
was an
cooperation
indicted
and work with the United States. At
narco-trafficker.
one time,
In fact,
Venezuela,
I believe it's
pre-Chavez,
the largest
was a very
reward we've
strong
ever
U.S.
issued for
ally.
anybody.
And we
I
hope to
remind
get
everybody
back
the
to
Biden
that
administration
point.
had a
We're not there.
$25
This
million
thing still is in
reward
its infancy.
on an
But I
indicted
certainly think a lot of progress has been made
the
in
same
that
person.
regard. And so,
I was impressed
multiple
with,
administrations
your,
from both
description
parties
of the
have
fact
wanted
that
this man
how
arrested.
careful
And
you
one of
were
the
in
options the president had
operation not
before
to
him
dismantle
was the
either
opportunity if
institutions or
things didn't work out to go in and remove
because
this
you
individual
wanted to
because
see
he was
the
wanted
Venezuelan
in a
people
law
take
enforcement
that
operation.
over and
Now,
get
obviously,
back
a
on
law
their feet
enforcement
again.
operation against
I think
the
that
de
was
facto head of a
really
of a regime
a wise
is not as
decision
simple as
to
going
make,
after some fugitive hiding
and
in the
have it
closet
as surgical.
somewhere. It required
as,
planning and it
was.
required
The
eliminating
last thing I'd
anything
ask
that
about, if you could
was a threat
touch
to
on
the
for
forces
just a
that were
minute.
going in to
I
extract
know
them.
you spent a
I want to be
considerable
clear, and I'll
period of
share
time
with you what I've
negotiating
shared
with people
publicly.
that,
We made
that
multiple
were going
attempts
to do
to
day-to-day
get Maduro
operations
to leave
the
voluntarily,
Venezuelans who were going
and to avoid all of this.
vacuum.
Because we understood
How's
that he
that
was an
going, and
impediment
how do
to
you feel
progress.
about
You couldn't make a deal with this
where
guy.
we are there?
Okay,
Well,
this guy's
first of all,
made
let me
multiple deals.
understand
He's broken
something. I
every one
spent
of them. As a
14 years
point
in
of
the U.S.
example,
Senate going
he made
after
a deal
these
with the
people
Biden
pretty hard,
administration. He was the
along
deal
with
that he
many of
made.
you.
It was a
So,
bad deal.
I mean, I
knew
understand
he
who they are, and I
He made the
understand
following
this
deal.
portfolio from a personal level quite
my
well.
nephews, his
So
nephews,
we're very
who were
realistic about
convicted
what we're dealing with
narco-traffickers.
here.
We also understand
Convicted
that
already
in
and
geopolitics
serving time in
sometimes
jail,
pardon
required.
them. And in this
Pardon
particular
and
case,
release
there
are
are
an
an
alignment
alignment
of
who was his
interests.
money man.
And
his
we
bag
certainly
man,
think that the
primarily
approach
in
we're
charge
taking
of
is
the
preferable
portfolio
to
with
some of the
Iran.
other alternatives that people
Release
speculate
these
about
people.
or fear.
And
I
he
would
in
say at
turn
this point,
agreed
I do have to
release some
characterize,
political
again,
prisoners,
being realistic,
which he did.
clear-eyed,
Many of them
and
were
understanding that
subsequently
there'll be
exiled or
impediments
rearrested,
and unexpected
and that he
events
would
along
hold
the
free and
way.
fair elections.
What we
which he
have
did
found
not.
so far,
in fact, he basically
is
disqualified
cooperation,
Maria
respect,
Corina Machado,
dialogue, and it's not just me.
And
As
Mundo
has been
Gonzalez
reported
ends
in
up
the
being the
media,
nominee for the opposition
Director
party
Radcliffe
simply
traveled
because
to
they forgot
Caracas
to
and
ban
met
him.
with leaders there
And
and
they
discussed
forgot to
important
put him
items
on the
of
ban
potential
list.
cooperation.
And despite that, he loses an election.
I've also
that everyone
discussed,
around the
and I
world
think I've alerted
recognizes
some
would
of
be a
you
legitimate
that we
election.
have.
So he's
Laura
made previous deals.
Dogue,
In fact,
who
he's
was
broken
our
so many
ambassador
deals,
to
not even the
Nicaragua
Vatican
in the past
has
and to
been willing to
Honduras
interact with
will
Maduro
be
in the
taking
past
over the
because he's
Venezuelan
broken
affairs
so many of
unit.
these deals.
First
He's just
in
simply not a
Bogota,
guy
but
you can make a
ultimately
deal
in
with. He had no
Caracas.
intent
We've
to
had
keep
a team
him.
on
What
the
he wanted
ground
to do
already there.
was tap us
We already had
along
70
and buy
locally
3
employed
years
that
of
sort of
time
maintain
until he
that
could deal with the
facility.
new
But we
administration.
have a
that he
team
thought
on
may
the
be
ground
more
there
favorable,
assessing
et
it,
cetera.
and we think very quickly
He was an
we'll be able
impediment
to
to progress.
open
None
a
of the things we're
US
talking about now,
diplomatic
not the
presence
release
on
of
the ground,
political
which will allow us to have
prisoners,
real-time
not the
information
transition of the
and
oil
interact,
industry
by the
to a
way,
legitimate
not just
oil
with officials
industry,
in the regime
not
and the interim
the
authorities,
erosion of
but
Iranian,
also
Russian, or
interact
Chinese influence.
with members of
None
civil
of these things
society,
would have been
the
possible
opposition.
as long as
We think we're
Maduro
going to
was
be
there.
much further along.
And so
when we
this
get
was one
them along
option
the
that
way.
was
They've been
available
very
to the president
cooperative on that
after
front.
exhausting
Obviously, there's some hard
every
asks
other
along
option
the way.
to remove
We'll
this
see what the
individual
responses
from
to
the scene.
those. But whether it's
Again,
General Kane with
I'm
his
not here to tell you
counterpart,
these are all going to be
Director
roses along
Radcliffe,
the way
or
and it's all going to go
myself
perfectly.
with
But for the first
with
time
Delcy
in 20
Rodriguez,
years, we are having
we've established what I think so far has been a very
talks
respectful and
with Venezuelan
productive
authorities
line of
about going after
communication as we
we go through this stabilization
about going
phase
after
and towards the
narcotics
recovery
organizations.
phase. For the first time in 20 years,
There's
we're
a lot
having
of work to be
serious
done here.
conversations
And, we
about
ultimately are
eroding
going to
and
judge
eliminating
actions,
the
not
Iranian
words.
presence, the Chinese influence,
and
the
that's what
Russian
we're
presence as
we're
well.
hoping to work towards.
In fact, I would tell
Well
you that
done.
there are many
Very
elements
Thank you.
there in Venezuela that welcome
I'm
a
pleased
return to
that
establishing
we are
relations
looking
to
at
the
a
United States on
diplomatic
multiple
presence
fronts.
in
We
Venezuela
are at the end
in the near
talking about a
future. I
Western
think that's very
country
important.
that has a long history of
But the
cooperation
DEA
and work with the
has
United States. At one
reportedly
time, Venezuela,
identified
pre-Chavez,
Delcy
was a
Rodriguez
very strong
as a
U.S. ally.
significant actor
And we hope
in
to
the
get
drug
back to that
trade.
point. We're
Do you
not
agree
there.
with
This
that?
thing still is in its
And
infancy.
if you
But I
do,
certainly think a lot of progress has been made in
how are
that
we
regard.
to assure the
I was
American
impressed with
people
your
that
description of the fact how
money that's
how
going to
careful
Venezuela is not
you
going
were
to
in
any
the
of the
operation not to
cartels or
dismantle
drug
either
running?
institutions
and that,
or
well, first of all, on the
infrastructure
first point, I would say she's
because
not
you
indicted
wanted to see
the way
Venezuelan
Maduro and his
people
wife were.
take that
So
over
I'm not
and
going
get
to
back
speculate
on
about
their feet
newspaper
again.
articles and what law enforcement
I think
is
that
working
was
on. If in fact there were such an investigation,
really,
you know, I mean, that's something that
wise
we would
decision to
speculate
make,
on. Suffice it to say
and
that
have it as
this was
surgical
not enormous system.
as
We all should
it was. The last thing I'd ask about,
that
if you could
regime,
touch
as
on for
everyone
just a
understood, was
minute,
held together by
I know
corruption.
you spent a
The glue that
considerable
kept
period
people
of
together
time
was not
negotiating
loyalty
with
to
people
Maduro. It was the
that
fact
were
that
going to
these
do
five
day-to-day
guys had 5 separate oil
operations,
fields that
the
were assigned to them.
Venezuelans
These
who were
people
gonna
No,
were
I
drug routes.
understand that.
So that's going to be
I'm
clear.
not defending
How's that
the
going,
regime.
and how do you
In
feel
fact,
about,
I'm
where we are
concerned that we haven't
Well,
really
first of all,
changed
let
the
me
regime
understand
enough,
something. I
and
spent
that
14 years in the
America's
U.S. Senate going after these
dollars
people
are
pretty
going-
hard,
still going
along with many
to
of you.
drug runners
So,
and
I mean,
to,
I understand who they are, and I understand
significant
this portfolio
organizations
from a
who we
personal
don't
level
want to
quite
have,
well. So we're very
benefit
realistic about what
from
we're dealing with
the
here. We
funding
also
that
understand
we're
that in
selling now
geopolitics
of oil
sometimes that's
and
required.
providing to
And in this
Venezuelan
particular
people.
case, I acknowledge that we are dealing with,
I
told you,
and we
with
certainly
individuals
think
that have
that
been
the
involved
approach
in
we're
things that
taking
in
is
our
preferable
system would
to
not
some
be
of the other
acceptable, would not be
alternatives that
acceptable to
people
us in the long
speculate
term.
about
By
or
no
fear.
means is our policy
And
to leave
I
in
would say
place
at this
something
point, I do have to
permanent
characterize,
that's
again,
as
being
corrupt as you've
realistic,
described.
clear-eyed, and
We are in
understanding
the
that there will be
transition and
impediments and
stabilization
unexpected
phase.
events
We are
along
just
the way.
acknowledging reality.
What we
and
have
that is you
found
have
so
to work
far
with the people that are
is
in charge
cooperation,
of the
respect,
elements of government.
Okay, but
Now, what are the
reassure
discussions?
people that money is not going
Director
continuing to go to the drug cartels?
Right, so that's the process of potential cooperation. So on the sanctioned oil, the oil I've also discussed, and I think I've alerted some of you that we have that oil, the proceeds of that oil, which by the way is being sold at market price, not at Nicaragua in the past and to Honduras, is being deposited taking over the account that ultimately will become a U.S. first in Bogota, but ultimately in Caracas. We've had a team on the ground they will submit. We already had 70 locally employed. This is what this money can be spent on. But we have a team on the ground there. We will submit to them very quickly. They will submit to us a budget request. We want to use this money for these things, which will allow us to have real-time part of the proceeds will go to fund and interact. By the way, not just audit officials to make sure that that's how the money is being spent.
authorities.
And that's how we intend to handle those funds in the short term.
Members of
There's
civil
an
society,
actual
the
audit
opposition.
process that's
We think
been
we're going
set
to
up.
be much
It
will
further
be
along
set up,
than
and we
get
have a
them
couple
along the way. They've been
options.
very cooperative on
You know,
that front.
One
Obviously,
option
there's
is
some hard
Ex-Im
asks
banks. They
along
have
the way.
expertise
We'll
as
see what the
bankers
response
being
is
able
to
to do
those.
some of that part.
But whether it's
option,
General King
there
with
may be
his
some others in
counterpart,
place. We
Director
haven't finalized
Radcliffe,
what that
or
audit
myself
process would be.
with
We've
the,
only made one
with
payment,
Delcy
and that
Rodriguez.
payment we
We've
did.
established what I think so far has been a very
but it was
respectful
important we
and
made that
productive
payment because they
line
had to
of
meet payroll. They had
as
to
we
keep
go through the
sanitation
stabilization
workers, police
phase and
officers,
towards the
government
recovery
workers
phase.
on staff.
But
It was a $300
there's a lot of work to be
million
done here.
Right,
And,
so it's been
we
reported
ultimately
that
are going
the
to
oil
judge
sold for
actions, not
$500
words.
million, that $300 million went to
that's what
Venezuelan
we're hoping to
government.
work towards.
What happened to the
Well
other
done.
$200 million?
It's still sitting in the account, is my understanding at this time.
I'm pleased that we are
Well, the
looking
account,
at a
yes, but that will
diplomatic
ultimately be
presence in
that's a
Venezuela
short-term
in the near
account.
future.
Ultimately,
I
it will
think
be a
that's very
U.S.
important.
Treasury blocked account
But the
in the United
DEA
States.
has
And will it also
reportedly
be
identified
audited?
Delcy
Correct.
Rodriguez
Well,
as
the
a
audit will be on the
significant actor
expenditures.
in the drug
At
trade.
the front end, we'll
Do you
tell them
agree
this is
with
what the
that?
money can be spent on.
And
Again,
if
I'm
you
not talking
do,
about all the other revenues the Venezuelan
how are
government
we
may have.
to assure
We're
the
talking
American
about the
people
revenues from the
that
sanctioned
the
oil. At the
money
front end, we will
that's
say
going
this
to
is what the
Venezuela
allowable
is not
expenses
going
are,
to any of
and
the
then they will agree to
cartels or
fund
drug
as
money.
part of the and that overall well, cost. first of all,
they
the
will
first
pay
point I
for
would say
and
she's
fund
not indicted.
an audit system
the way
acceptable
Maduro
to
is
us
wife to ensure that
so
I'm
that's
not
how
going
the
to
money is
speculate about
spent.
newspaper
And can you
articles
report
or
to
what law
this committee
enforcement
once
is
that
working on.
audit
If in
system
fact
is
there
set
were
up?
such an investigation, you know, I mean that's something that we would
I'd like to change
speculate
the
on.
topic
Suffice
in
it
my
to say that
short time
this was
that I
not a
have
normal
left,
system.
because
We
when
all should
you were a member of this committee, you
stipulate to that,
authored
okay?
legislation
That
to prevent
regime,
President
as everyone
Trump
understood, was
from
held together by
unilaterally
corruption. The
leaving
glue
NATO.
that kept
You
people
and,
together was not
Senator
loyalty to
King.
Maduro.
Do
It
you
was the
still
fact
believe
that
that the
these
U.S.
five guys
benefits
had
from
5
NATO?
separate oil fields.
We
that were
do.
assigned
I mean,
to
the
them.
problem
These
with
people-
I
NATO
understand
needs to
that.
be
So that's going to be
I'm
clear
not
well in terms
defending
of the
the
obligations.
regime.
And this is not
In
new to
fact,
this
I'm
president. Multiple
concerned
presidents
that
have
we
complained
haven't
about
really
it.
changed
I think
the
this president
regime
just
enough,
complains
and
about it
that
louder than other
America's
presidents.
well, I'm just
dollars are
trying
going
to be
still
clear,
going
get a
to
clear
drug
answer
runners
on
and
where this
to,
administration stands
significant
relative to NATO,
organizations
because
who we
it's
don't
been-
want to have
been a very fuzzy message
benefit
over the
from
last
the funding that
year.
we're selling
And
now
do you
of
agree
oil
that
and
we're stronger in
providing to
confronting
Venezuelan
China?
Yeah, look, no, I
when we do so
acknowledge
with
that we are
like-minded
dealing with, I
partners,
told you, with
and that China
individuals
is
that have been
still
involved in
the
things that
number
in
one
our
threat
system would
that
not be
we face
acceptable,
in
would
the
not be
United
acceptable to
States.
us.
Yeah,
in the
but
long
our
term.
like-minded
By no
partners
means
have
is
to
our
have
policy to
capability,
leave
and
in
that's been
place
part of the
something
problem is the
permanent
erosion in
that's
European
as corrupt as
defense
you've described.
capabilities.
Because they've
We are
taken
in the
vast amount of the money.
transition
These are rich
stabilization
countries.
phase. We are just
and because of the
acknowledging
NATO
reality, and that
umbrella,
is you
they
have to
gave
work
them the
with the people
flexibility
that
to
are in
spend a
charge
tremendous
of
amount
the
of their elements of government.
on social
Okay, but
Now, what are the
reassure
events? Now, maybe
people
that trend line
that
will begin to
money
change.
is not going,
Well, it's
but it
already
needs to-
begun
yeah,
to
so-
continuing to go to the drug
frankly,
cartel?
and-
Right,
Thanks,
so that's
and I
the,
think the
that's the
president
process that I
deserves credit
outlined
for
to you.
that,
So
for the
on the
fact that
sanctioned
there's
oil,
now a
the oil
commitment
that
for
requires
5%
U.S.
of
permission to move,
GDP to be
that
spent
oil,
on
the
defense.
proceeds
But
of that oil, which by the way is
part of
being
that
sold at market price,
strength
not at the
also
discount
comes
Venezuela
not
was
just
being
from
forced to
having
sell,
the-
is being deposited
the
into an
mechanism
account
the
that
military
ultimately will
might,
become
but
a
it
U.S.
also
Treasury
comes from
blocked
the
account
unity
here in
with
the
our
United
allies.
States.
And to the extent
They
to
will
which
submit,
that
we will,
unity is
at the front
undermined,
end,
like the talk
say
about
this is what
Greenland
this money can
and
be spent on
antagonizing
these things.
Denmark,
We will
then
submit
it
to them.
undermines NATO's
They will
ability,
submit
and the
to
only
us a
people who are
budget
excited
request. We
about
want to
that
use
are
this money
Vladimir
for
Putin
these
and President
things.
Xi.
And as part, and well,
Part
I
of the
would say
proceeds
that
will go
I
to
think our
fund
alliances in NATO ultimately
audit
are
process
something that's
to
going to
make
work
sure that
out.
that's how the
Our
money is
partners
being
understand the
spent.
So
importance. That's
there
how
is-
we
The
intend to
US
handle those
president
funds.
NATO
Without the
without
U.S., there
There's
is no
an
NATO.
actual
And we
audit
understand that
process
in order
that's
for
been
NATO
set
to
up.
be
Who is
strong, will be set up. And we have a couple options. And one of the things we've explained to our allies in NATO is the United States is not simply focused on Europe. We also have defense needs, and there may be some others in place. We haven't finalized what that audit process and it will require. We've only made one payment. We may be the richest country in the world, but we don't have and retrospectively will be audited. And as we reassign
Exactly
that payment,
why
because they
we
had to
want
meet payroll,
to
they
have
had to
allies
keep
and partners
sanitation
to
workers,
help
police
us as we're
officers,
looking
government
at conflicts
workers
around the
on
world.
staff. It was
And when we antagonize our
$300
allies and
million
partners,
So
and
it's
when
been
we
reported
send
that
Canada
the oil
to
sold
do a
for
trade deal
$500
with
million,
China instead of
that
coming to
$300
New
million went to
Hampshire or the
Venezuelan
United
government.
States, it
What happened
weakens
to the
our
other
ability
$200 million?
to
It's still
confront
sitting in
our
the account, is my understanding at this
adversaries.
time. But our allies have to
Account
be
in
two
Qatar?
things. They have to be willing.
Well, the
to
account,
step up,
yes,
but
but
they also
that
have to
will
be capable
ultimately
of
be
stepping
that's a
up.
short-term
And
account.
frankly, many of them
Ultimately
have
will be
not. I
used-
mean,
the
Spain
US
is still not
Treasury
doing
will
the
fund
5%.
in the
I mean,
United
there are
States.
countries that are
And
still
will
not
it
doing.
also be
And in fact,
audited?
Mark Rutte
Correct.
yesterday
Well,
pointed out
the audit
that
will be on the
without the
expenditures.
United States, at the front end, we'll
countries
tell
of
them this is
Europe
what
would
the
have
money
to
can be
spend
spent on.
10%
Again,
of
I'm
the
not talking about all the
for
other
the next
revenues
20
that
years
Venezuelan
to be able to
government may
make
have.
up the hole.
We're
So I
talking
do
about
think there
the
needs to be a
revenues from the
rebalancing,
sanctions
and hopefully
war.
we'll have
At
cooperation.
the front
I
end,
think
we will say this is what the allowable expenses
has done a
are.
great job of
And then they will
And
agree
I'm not
to fund
arguing that
as
point
part
with
of
you.
the
As
overall
I
cost.
said,
They will pay
I
for
agree
and fund
with what the
an audit
President has
system
asked of our
acceptable to
European
us
allies. What
to
I'm
ensure that that's how the
arguing
money was
with you
spent.
about
And can you
is that
report
his
to this
rhetoric
committee
is
once that audit
undermining
system is set up?
NATO
Oh, absolutely.
and
Yeah.
our partnerships with
I'd
our
like
allies.
to change
and
the
that's a
topic in
problem.
my
Thank you,
short
Mr.
time that I
Chairman.
have left, because
Thank you,
when
Senator
you were a
Shaheen.
member
Senator
of this
Ricketts.
committee, you authored legislation to
Mr. Chairman.
prevent
Thank you,
President
Mr.
Trump
Secretary
from
Rubio, for being here.
unilaterally leaving NATO.
So
You and,
some of the
Senator
comments
Kane,
from my
do you
colleagues on the
still
other
believe
side
that the U.S. benefits
of
from
the
NATO?
aisle are
We do. I mean,
difficult
the
to
problem
square
with,
with
but
the
NATO needs to be reimagined
The
as well in terms of the
goalpost didn't
obligations.
move,
And this is not
nor
new to
did
this
Maduro
president. Multiple presidents have
change. The only
complained
thing
about
that
it.
changed
I think this president just
was
complains
President
about it
Trump
louder than
acted
other
on
presidents.
what members
Well,
of
I'm
both
just
parties
trying to be
said needed to be
clear,
happen-
get a
that
clear
needed to happen.
answer on where this administration
And
stands relative
did so,
to NATO.
by the way,
because
with an
it's
operation
been-
that will go down
been a
in
very
history
fuzzy message
as one of the
over
most
the last,
impressive and tactically
year.
proficient
And
to
do you
be ever
agree that
carried out.
we're stronger in
So, Secretary
confronting
Rubio,
China
I'd like to get your
when we
response
do
to a
so with
few yes or
like-minded
no questions.
partners,
I know
and
that's
that China
typically
is
not your
still
nature, but please
the number
bear
one
with me
threat
here a moment,
that we
okay?
All right,
face
let's
in
hear
the
them
United
first.
States.
Yeah, but our like-minded partners have to have capability, and that's been part of the problem is the erosion of European defense capabilities.
For years, the
Because
United
they've
States
taken vast
had a
amount of the
standing
money.
bounty on
These are
Nicolas
rich
Maduro,
countries.
correct?
And
Have
because
what,
of the
sir?
NATO
Standing
umbrella,
bounty on
it gave them the
Nicolas Maduro.
flexibility to spend a tremendous amount of their
And
revenues
this
on
bounty was
social
increased by
programs
both
and
the
not on
Biden and
defense.
Trump
Now, maybe that trend
administrations,
line will
correct?
begin to change.
Well, it's already
And
begun to
despite that
change,
bounty, did
frankly.
Maduro remain in power?
Thanks, and I think the president deserves credit for that, for
Did
the
he
fact that
continue to
there's now a
support drug
commitment for
traffickers?
5% of
Oh, yes.
GDP
Was the
to be
operation
spent on defense.
Operation
But
Absolute
part of
Resolve
that
a law enforcement
strength
operation
also comes
supported by
not
the
just from
military?
having
It was.
the
Did that operation
mechanism, the
successfully
military
remove
might, but it also
Maduro
comes
and his
from the
wife,
unity
and
with
they were
our
taken into
allies.
custody?
And to the
Yes.
extent to which
Great
that
questions.
unity is undermined, like the talk
Were
about
any
Greenland
service members, law
and
enforcement
antagonizing
officers
Denmark,
killed in that operation?
then it undermines NATO's
Has
ability.
any of
The
ours.
only people who are
None
excited
of
about
ours,
that
right.
are
Has
Vladimir
there
Putin and
largely
President
been a
Xi.
broad support
Well,
across
I would
Latin
say
America
that
for
I think our
Maduro's
alliances
removal?
in NATO Yes. ultimately are something that's going to work out.
And is the United
Our
States
partners
better
understand
off
the importance of the U.S.
with
presence
Nicolas
in NATO.
Maduro
Without the U.S.,
in
there is no
custody?
NATO. And we understand Yes, that in and order for Venezuela NATO to too. be stronger, our partners
Right.
need to be stronger. And
I
one of the things we've
realize
explained
that
to
you'll
our
hear
allies in
different
NATO is
views
the United
during
States
this
is not
hearing,
simply
but
focused on
I
Europe. We
want to
also
at
have
least
defense
offer my
needs in the
personal
Western Hemisphere. We have
congratulations to you and
defense
everybody
needs
who
in the
helped clear this out,
Indo-Pacific.
because
And it
the
will
world is
require us.
better off
We may be the
without
richest
Nicolas
country in the
Maduro.
world, but we don't have
A few weeks
unlimited
ago,
resources.
you briefed
And
the
as we
Senate on
reassign
your
Exactly
Tuesday
why
plan.
we
We talked
want
about it here
to
today
have
on
allies and
stabilization,
partners
recovery,
to help
and the
us as we're looking
transition
at
in
conflicts
Venezuela.
around the world.
Is
And
there
when we
anything this
antagonize our
Congress can
allies
do
and
to be
partners, and
helpful
when
we send
in
Canada to
executing on
do a
that
trade
plan.
deal with China
There will be in
instead of
time,
coming
there's
to
no
New
doubt about it. On
Hampshire
the
or
stabilization
United
front,
States, it
in order to
weakens our
stabilize
ability
it, for
to
example, we're going to have to
confront
begin to provide some
our
licenses to
adversaries.
OFAC.
But our allies have
So
to
as
be
an
two
example,
things. They have to be
if
willing
a company
to
wants
step
to
up,
go
but they also
down
have to
and
be capable
explore
of stepping
the
up.
opportunity to
And
do
frankly, many of them have not.
some
Spain is still
economic
not doing
activity in
5%.
Venezuela,
I
they
mean,
will
there are
require a
countries that are still not
license
doing.
from
And in fact, Mark
Treasury to
Rutte
be able to
yesterday
do that.
pointed out,
And so
that
that doesn't require
without the
congressional
United
action, but I wanted you to
the
be
countries
aware
of
of it when
Europe
you
would
start
have
to
to
see
spend
some of these things.
10%
Some of these are
of
just
their GDP
exploratory.
for the next
The
20
second
years
is,
to
I
be
think,
able
in
to make
time,
up
look,
the hole.
Venezuela is
So
a
I
very
do think there
wealthy
needs to
country.
be a
This
rebalancing,
is not
and
a
hopefully
country
we'll
that's
have
going to
cooperation. I think
require
we will. Rutte's
money from the United
has done a
States
great
to
job of
rebuild, to
managing that.
And I'm not
stabilize, to
arguing that
transition.
point
It really
with you.
isn't. It has
As
the
I
ability
said,
to be, and
I
it has
agree
been
with what the
historically,
president
the
has
wealthiest
asked of our
country in the
European
Western
allies.
Hemisphere,
What I'm
in
arguing
South America.
with you about is that his
in many
rhetoric
cases.
is
The problem is that the
undermining
wealth of the country was
NATO
being stolen.
and
so part of
partnerships with our
both the
allies, and
recovery
that's
and
a
the
problem.
transition
Thank you,
phase
Mr.
is
Chairman.
ensuring that you
Thank
leave
you,
in place
Senator
a
Shaheen.
prosperous,
Senator Ricketts.
free, democratic, allied with the
Chairman,
United
thank you,
States and
Mr.
friendly,
Secretary
but
Rubio,
also
for being here.
prosperous Venezuela, where
So
the resources of
some
the
of the
country
comments
are
from
being done
my colleagues on the other
responsibly, are being
side,
utilized
of the
responsibly
aisle
and to the
are
benefit of the people and
difficult
their
to square
economy.
with the record.
So in time, you know, I
The
imagine we will be
goalpost
coming
didn't
back to you
move,
with
nor
specific
did
legislation that
Maduro
may be
change.
required
The only thing that changed
to assist in
was
that
President
function.
Trump
But we
acted
don't
on
expect that
what
this is
members
going to
of both
require any
parties
spending on our
said needed
part.
to
On
be
the
happening,
contrary,
that needed to
unlike
happen.
many of the other parts of the world we've gotten
And
involved,
did so,
Venezuela
by the way,
is,
with an
we're not
operation
spending
that
any
will go
money
down
in
in
Venezuela right
history
now, other than
as one of the
whatever
most
it costs to
impressive and tactically
stand up our
proficient
embassy.
to be ever carried out.
Switch gears on you a little bit.
So
One of
Secretary
the
Rubio, I'd
common
like to get your
criticisms
response
after
to a few yes or no
Maduro's
questions.
capture
I know that's
was that
typically
this would
not your nature.
incentivize
Please bear
communist
with me here
China
a
to
moment,
take
okay?
similar
let's hear 'em
actions
first.
in Taiwan. In my opinion, this couldn't be further from the truth.
I hate
As far
game
as
shows.
communist
Go
China
ahead.
doesn't care about international law
For
or
years, the
norms.
United
They've
States
demonstrated that
had a standing
repeatedly.
boundary on
Just
Nicholas
ask the
Maduro,
Philippines.
correct?
Have what,
Nor
I'm
does it
sorry?
believe in
Standing boundary on
international
Nicholas
law even
Oh, yes.
applies to Taiwan. And
But
that
most
this
importantly,
bounty was
Xi
increased
Jinping's
by both the
calculus
Biden
on whether
and
to
Trump
take
administrations,
kinetic
correct?
action
Correct.
against Taiwan rests solely on
And
whether or not
despite
he
that
believes
bounty,
he will be
did
successful
Maduro
or not.
remain in power?
In this sense, the
Yes.
tactical proficiency displayed during
Did he
Operation
continue to support
Absolute
drug
Resolve
traffickers?
may have actually given
Oh, yes.
Xi more pause
Was the Operation
to take
Abs- was
than,
Operation-
taking
Operation
action in
Absolute
Taiwan.
Resolve a law enforcement
Because despite
operation
its massive
supported by the
military
military?
buildup, the PLA
It was.
continues to lack the experience
Did that
to
operation
clearly
successfully
on display
remove
Maduro
that
and
the
his
United
wife
States, they were taken into
demonstrated in Maduro's capture.
Yes. Great question.
And the PLA leaders
Were
do
any
have
service
combat
members,
experience
law
like
enforcement
General
officers
Zhang
killed
just
in that
got
operation?
purged, or at least one of them did.
Not any of
Secretary
ours.
Rubio, do you believe that
None of ours,
operation,
right.
the operation
Has there
to take Maduro
largely
into
been a
custody
broad support
will have any
across Latin
impact
America
on
for
Communist
Maduro's
China's
removal?
actions or
Yes.
intentions toward Taiwan?
No, look,
And is the United States
the
better
situation
off
on Taiwan is a
with
G
Nicolas
legacy
Maduro
project that he's made
in
very
custody?
clear that that's what he intends Yes, to do. and Venezuela too. And that's going to be irrespective of anything that happens in the world.
I
Your point,
realize
though, is well
that
taken,
you'll
and that is the
hear
U.S. in
different views
conducting this
during this
operation, I
hearing,
think was
but
certainly
I
startling
want
to
at
China,
least
to
offer
Russia,
my
to
personal
Iran,
congratulations
to
to
any
you and
adversary
everybody who
around the
helped carry
world,
this
because
out,
the U.S. is the
because
only
the
country in
world
the
is
world, the
better
only
off
country in the
without
world that
Nicolas
could have
Maduro.
done this operation.
A few weeks ago,
Mr. Chairman, if I
you
could
briefed the
just real
Senate
briefly,
on your three-phase plan. You've been talking about it here today on
I just mentioned
stabilization
General
and
Zhang
recovery
getting
and the
purged
transition
here
is
is
obviously
Venezuela.
a very important official.
Is there anything
and,
this
can you share
Congress
with
can
us
do
your
to be
assessment
helpful
in
what that means,
executing on that plan?
There will be
Xi
in
is
time.
purged
There's no
all
doubt
these-
about
This is, I
it.
think,
On the
part of a
stabilization
pattern we've
front,
seen over the last few
in
years,
order to
which is a
stabilize it,
purge
for
of
example, we're
leaders
going to have
and
to
their
begin to
military. They're
provide
spending
some
a lot of
licenses
money on
to
their
OFAC.
military, and obviously
So as an example,
some of these guys
if
are
a company
stealing that
wants to
money,
go
and they're
down
trying
and
to address
explore
that. So
the opportunity
it's an
to
issue
do
internally in their system. There's
some
obviously
economic
not sharing with
activity
us
in
or
Venezuela that
talking
will
to us
require
in
a
depth about
license
any of that,
but
from
it's certainly
Treasury
something
to
to be
watch
able
with
to do
interest.
that. And so that doesn't require
Thank you,
congressional
Senator
action, but I
Coons.
wanted you to be aware of it when you start
Thank
to
you,
see some
Mr.
of
Chairman.
these.
Thank
Some
you,
of these are just
Secretary Rubio.
exploratory.
Good to be with
The
you
second
again.
is, I think, in time,
my
look, Venezuela is a
basic
very wealthy
question
country.
is,
This
what are we
not a
doing
country
here?
that's going to require
What is the point?
money
What is
from
the
the United
goal
States
of
to
this
rebuild,
hearing?
to stabilize,
As
to
you know well,
transition. It
having
really isn't.
served
It
on
has
this
the
dais
ability to
alongside me
be,
for
and it
14
has been
years.
historically,
This is
the
an
wealthiest
oversight
country
hearing.
in the Western Hemisphere,
And the
in Latin
point,
and South
the
America.
purpose of oversight
In many
is to
cases.
encourage,
The problem is that the
if
wealth of the
necessary,
country
to
was being
compel
stolen. And so part of
consultation between the
both the
administration
recovery and the
and
transition phase is
And
ensuring
I
that
just
you leave
wanted
in place
to
a
raise with you
prosperous,
at the outset.
free,
Of
democratic,
course, the
allied with the United
Commander-in-Chief
States and friendly,
has, under
but
Article
also
2,
prosperous
the
Venezuela,
power to
where
defend the American
resources of the
people
country are
against
being
an
done
imminent
responsibly,
threat
are being
or an
utilized
incoming attack.
responsibly and
How
to the
else could
benefit
we
of
be
the
kept
people
safe?
and their economy.
But our Article
So in
1
time,
power
I imagine we
requires
will be coming back
consultation.
to you with specific
I'll
legislation
agree
that may
with
be required
all of my colleagues. Nicolas
to
Maduro is
assist
a
in that
bad guy.
function. But
He
we
was
don't
indicted.
expect that this
There
is
was
going
a
to
bounty on
require
his
any
head over
spending on
several
our part. On the
administrations.
contrary,
His
unlike
removal,
many of the other parts of the world we've
flawlessly
gotten involved,
executed by American
Venezuela
troops.
is. We're not
Thankfully,
spending
none
any
of
money
them
in
hurt.
Venezuela right now,
Did
other
cost the
than whatever
lives
it
of
costs
75 to 100
stand up our embassy.
Venezuelans and Cubans.
Let me
Was
switch
a
gears on you a little
dangerous
bit.
and
One of the
high-risk
common
maneuver.
criticisms after
I am glad that it
Maduro's
ended
capture
as well as it
was that
possibly
this would
could.
incentivize
But the
communist
point
China
here
to take similar actions
that I
in
want to make
Taiwan.
first is that it
my
was
opinion,
rehearsed for
this
months.
couldn't be further from the truth.
The administration had a number of contingencies it was trying to navigate through. But over the course of months, when the administration was taking strike after strike after strike against drug trafficking boats,
But most importantly, Xi
in
Jinping's
several
calculus on whether
instances
to
where
take
senior
kinetic
leaders of
action
the
against
administration
Taiwan rests
briefed
solely on
this
whether or not
committee
he
and
believes he will
others,
be successful or
we were
not.
told
In this
that
sense,
military
the
action
tactical
to remove
proficiency
Maduro was
displayed
not on
during
the table.
Operation Absolute
That
Resolve
the
may have actually given Xi
campaign
more
to try
cause
and deter
to
drug
take
trafficking
than,
was
taking
not
action
going
in
to
Taiwan.
include the
Because
exact
despite
military
its massive
action
military
that
buildup, the
followed.
PLA continues
Yet
to
it
lack
was being
experience so
rehearsed.
clearly on
If there was
display
time to
that
practice,
the United States
there was time to
demonstrated
consult.
in Maduro's capture.
And consulting with
And the
Congress
PLA
is not
leaders,
just some
that do
high-minded
have
principle,
combat
not
experience,
some
like General
abstract
John
thing, not a
just
nice
got
to have.
purged, or at least
It's a
one of them
got
did.
to have.
So, Secretary Rubio, do you
And
believe that operation,
look, the
operation
chairman
to take
opened by
Maduro into
saying that
custody
this was
will have
limited in
any
scope
impact
and
on
duration,
Communist
that
China's
it was
actions or
executed
intentions
flawlessly,
toward
and we should
Taiwan?
all be
No,
happy
look,
about the result.
the
That much I
situation on
agree.
Taiwan is a G
But our
legacy
president
project.
continues
He's
to
made very
threaten
clear that that's what he intends
Delcy
to do.
Rodriguez and the remnant
that's
of the
going to be
Maduro
irrespective of
regime
anything that
with
happens
military
in the world.
force if they
Your
don't
point, though, is
comply.
well taken, and that is the
We
U.S. in
should
conducting
know
this operation, I
what
think,
are
was
the
certainly
policies,
startling
what is the
to China,
path,
to
what is
Russia,
the
to
plan
Iran,
forward?
to
You
any
and I both
adversary
know
around the
the
world,
long
because
and
the U.S. is
painful
the only
history
country in the world, the only country in the
wars
world
that
that could have done
began
this operation.
and seemed to be
Mr.
resolved,
Chairman, if I could just real
and then
briefly,
opened up
just-
into
and
excruciating,
I just
expensive,
mentioned General John
years-long
getting
conflict.
purged here. He was obviously
Iraq
a
in
very
particular,
important official in
and
China.
Libya and
Can you
elsewhere,
share with
things
just
do
your
not always
assessment
go
on
as planned.
What that
and so
means,
consultation with
that
Congress
she just
that is
purged one of these-
truthful
Well, this is, I think,
and
part of a pattern
forthcoming
we've seen over
and
the last few
transparent
years, which is a
critical.
purge of
In your
leaders in
service
the
in this
military.
body,
They're spending a
you
lot of
knew
money
that.
on their
You
military, and
experienced
obviously
it. I was in the
some of these
room as
guys
you
are
held
stealing
to
that money,
account
and they're
members
trying
of
to address
previous
that. So
administrations
it's an issue
for not
internally in the
coming
system.
forward
They're obviously
as they
not
should
sharing
have.
with us
So,
or talking
look,
to us in depth about any
in
of
order
that,
to
but it's certainly
avoid
something we watch with
our
interest.
men and women in our armed forces
Thank you, Senator
going
Ricketts.
into harm's way,
Senator Coons.
doubting
Thank you, Mr.
whether
Chairman.
they have
Thank
the
you,
support
Secretary
of the
Rubio. Good
Congress.
to be with you again.
Consultation,
My
hearings,
basic
and
question
deliberations are
is,
required.
what are we doing
I
here?
understand the risk of leaks.
What is the point? What is the
That's
goal
a risk every
of this
administration
hearing?
takes. But
As
at
you
the
know
end of
well,
the day, our
having
framers
served on this dais
entrusted
alongside me
the
for
power
14 years,
of the Declaration
this
of War
is an
to
oversight
this
hearing.
body. Not
And
to
the
the
point, the
executive.
purpose
and where there
of
is
oversight
the time to consult,
is to encourage,
there has to be
if
consultation.
necessary, to compel.
Second, consultation
I just wanted to talk
between
about
the administration
allies
and Congress.
I
And
was just
I
in
just
Europe. Wanted to raise.
I
with
led
you
a
at the
bipartisan
outset.
delegation, as,
Of course, the
Senator
commander-in-chief
Sheen referenced to
has
Denmark.
under Article 2
and
the power
our
to
president's
defend the American
comments
people
about NATO,
against an
about
imminent
Denmark,
threat
and his
or an
attempts
incoming
to
attack.
how else could we be kept
Coerce
safe?
Denmark
But our
into
Article
giving
1
up
power
Greenland
requires
are
consultation.
They
I'll
profoundly
agree
harmed
with
our
all of my
security.
colleagues.
Nicolas
And I am
Maduro is a
asking
bad
you
guy
to do
He was
everything
indicted
you can
There was a bounty on
to
his head over several
reinforce our
administrations.
commitment to
His
NATO.
removal. I was
Flawlessly
concerned that you just said
executed
NATO
by
needs to be
American troops.
reimagined.
Thankfully, none of them
Let's just be
hurt.
clear about the record.
Did cost the lives of
You know as well as
75
I,
to
Article
100
5 has only been
Venezuelans
invoked
and Cubans,
once, was
and it
a
was in
dangerous
defense
and
of
high-risk
us
maneuver
after we
I
were
am glad that it ended
Danes
as well as it possibly
and
could.
soldiers from
But
almost
the
every
point
other
here
NATO ally
that I want to make
deployed and
first
served
is that
fought
it was
and
rehearsed
died.
for months.
52 days.
The administration had
And
a
for
number
me,
of
the most
contingencies
emotional
it was
moment of
trying
my
to
visit to
navigate
Denmark
through.
was
But
laying
over the
a wreath
course
at the
of months,
memorial
when the
to the
administration
Danes who
was
served,
taking
fought,
strike
and
after strike
died
after strike
alongside
against
Americans.
drug
So when our
trafficking
president
boats.
says we never asked for anything
In
from
several
NATO,
instances
and they never
where
gave us
senior
anything,
leaders of the
and you
administration
suggest
briefed
that they
this
aren't committing
committee
their
and
weight.
others.
We
Whether
were
it's in
told
bases
that military action to
or in
remove Maduro
access
was not on the table,
or in troops,
that the
or in service.
campaign
It is
to try
allies
and
that will
deter
keep us
drug
safe in the
trafficking
Indo-Pacific
was not
are going
treaty
to
allies,
include
Korea and
the exact
Japan and
military
Australia
action
and
that
the Philippines
follow.
are going to be critical
Yet
to
it was
Indo-Pacific
being
security
rehearsed.
against
If there
our
was
principal
time to
threat,
practice,
China. There was time
and
to consult.
in Europe.
And consulting
I'm worried
with
that the
Congress
very
is not
foundations
just
of
some
trust
high-minded principle,
are
not some
being shaken.
abstract thing.
Our democracy
not a nice
depends
to
on
have.
consultation
It's a
with
got
Congress
to have.
that is truthful and timely.
Look, the chairman
And the confidence
opened
of
by
our
saying that
allies
this was
depends
limited
on
in
them
scope
knowing
and
where
duration,
we're going
that it was
next.
executed
Today in
flawlessly,
Armada
and we
is
should all be
steaming
happy
towards
about the
Iran.
result. Our president
much
is
I
on
agree
social
with.
media threatening Iran.
But our president
and
continues
I
to
hope I
threaten.
can count on you,
Delcy
Mr.
Rodriguez
Secretary,
and the
to
remnant of the
consult with
Maduro
us and
regime
inform us
with military
before
force
our
if they
next
don't
actions,
comply.
whether against
We should
Nigeria,
know
Colombia,
what are the
Cuba,
policies,
Iran, or
what is the
anywhere
path,
else.
what is the plan
and
forward?
I hope and
You and I
believe
both
that I
know
can count on
the
you
long
to
and painful
reinforce
history
the sanctity
of wars that
of NATO,
began,
not to reimagine
and
it,
seemed
but
to be
reinforce
resolved
it.
and then opened up into
Thank you. Well, let me
excruciating,
unpack the
expensive,
3 points you touched upon:
years-long
consultation,
conflicts.
NATO,
In Iraq
Green,
in particular,
alliances,
in Libya and elsewhere, things do not always go as planned.
Not
And
just
so
in this administration and
consultation with
Congress, but in multiple
that is
administrations, as you
truthful
rightly pointed
and
out.
forthcoming and transparent is
I was a big
critical.
fan of
In
consultation
your
when I was
service in this
sitting over
body,
there. Now,
you
you
knew
know,
that.
it's a different
You
job, different
experienced
time.
it.
But it's
I was
not,
in the
that's not
room as you
necessarily
held to
the
account
point. This is a very
members
unique
of previous
situation that we faced here.
administrations for not coming forward.
The fact
as
of the
they
matter
should
is that
have.
our
So,
mission, and the one you
look,
were briefed on and talked about,
in order
that
to
mission
avoid
remains ongoing, and that is the
our men and
counter-narcotic
women
mission
in
that we
our
continue
armed
to carry
forces,
out. In
going into
as
harm's
controversial
way,
as it may be, you
doubting
may
whether
not
they
all
have
be
the
fans
support
of it,
of the
obviously,
Congress.
but it is happening in the Eastern
Consultation,
Pacific, and it is also
hearings,
happening in the
and
Caribbean
deliberations are
basin.
required.
The problem is,
I understand
the
the
good
risk
news
of
is there aren't a
leaks.
lot of drug boats moving
That's
in
a
the
risk
Caribbean
every
basin
administration
anymore.
takes.
And
But
that's
at
what
the
we
end of the
briefed
day, our
Congress upon.
framers
The specific mission
entrusted
that
the
you've
power
talked
of the
about,
Declaration
one of the
of
reasons why you
this
rehearsed
body,
it is to see if it's
not
even
to the
feasible.
executive.
To
And where
basically
there
go to the
is the
president
time
and
to
say, is this
consult,
something that's even an
there
option on
has
the
to be
table? The
consultation.
truth of the matter is that
Second,
this
I just wanted to talk
mission
about
could not have
allies
been
and
briefed to
alliances.
Congress because it even
I was
wasn't
just
even
in Europe.
in the realm of
I
possible
led a bipartisan
until very late
delegation,
in
as
December,
Senator Shaheen
when
referenced, to
all of our
Denmark.
efforts to negotiate
And
with Maduro had
our
failed, and the
president's
president was
comments
finally presented
about
these options
NATO,
and made
about
these decisions.
Denmark, and
It was
his
also a
attempts
trigger-based
to
operation. It may never have happened. It
Denmark
required
into
a
giving up
number of
Greenland
factors to all align
are
at the right
appalling.
place at the right time
They
in a very
profoundly
limited
harmed
window.
our
And
security.
it wasn't even clear if it was
And
ever
I
going to
am
be possible.
asking you to do
There's also the
everything you
aspect which
can
I do not control,
to
and that is the deference to
reinforce
the
our
Department of War
commitment
on
to NATO.
operational security.
I was concerned that you
Despite
just
the
said
fact that
NATO
we had kept
needs
this
to be
quite constrained.
reimagined.
The truth of the
Let's
matter
just
is
be
that
clear
this
about
was
the
leaked.
record.
We now know it was
You
leaked
know as well as
by
I,
a
Article
contractor,
5 has
the
only been
Department of War,
invoked once.
that had
and
it
it was
been
in defense
published,
of us
would have endangered
after
the
we
lives
were
of people and or
Danes
would have probably
and
canceled the
soldiers
ability
from
to carry out
almost
the mission.
every other NATO
so
ally
this is a real
deployed
tension, and
and
one that I'm
served,
doing the
fought,
best I
and
can to
died.
try to manage
52
within the
days.
constraints of two things.
And for me, the most
Operational
emotional
security,
moment of my
and
visit to
also
Denmark
decisions
was
being
laying a
made.
wreath at the
We have-
memorial to
There
the
are
Danes
multiple
who served,
contingencies
fought,
for
and
events all over
died
the world, including
alongside
some that none of us
Americans.
think we're ever going to
So
come
when
to
our
fruition.
president says we never
And,
asked for anything
in this
from NATO,
particular case,
and
one
they
of the
never
reasons
gave
why
us
you
any.
rehearse these things in
And you
advance is to know
suggest
whether
that
it's
they
even
aren't
possible,
carrying
is this
their
even
weight.
doable, and
Whether
what are the
it's in
risks associated
bases,
with doing. So you can
or in
present options to
access,
the president who
or in
ultimately
troops,
makes these decisions.
or in service.
In the case of
It is
reimagining NATO, it
allies
most
that
certainly
will
has
keep
to be
us safe in the
reimagined. And the reason why it has to be
Indo-Pacific. Our
reimagined is
treaty
not because
allies,
its purpose is
Korea,
reimagined.
Japan, and
Its
Australia,
capabilities have
and
to
the
be
Philippines are
reimagined.
going
Let
to
me
be
give you as a
critical to
point of
Indo-Pacific
example.
security
There's a lot of talk about
against our
security
principal
guarantees.
threat, China.
And it's something that there's general agreement
and
about now with the
in
case
Europe.
of Ukraine.
I'm
But those
worried that
security
the very
guarantees
foundations of
basically
trust
involve the deployment of a
are being
handful
shaken.
of European
Our
troops,
democracy depends on
primarily
consultation with
French,
Congress
the UK,
that is truthful
and then a U.S.
timely.
backstop.
And
But
the
in fact, the
confidence
security
of our
guarantee is the
allies
U.S. backstop.
depends on them
It
knowing
is not
where we're
the-
going
and
next.
I'm not diminishing
Today, an armada
the
is
fact
steaming
that
towards
some
Iran.
countries in Europe
Our
are willing to
president is
place
on
troops
social
in
media
a
threatening
post-war
Iran.
Ukraine.
And
What I'm
I
pointing
hope
out
I
is
can count
that
on
is
you,
irrelevant
Mr.
without the
Secretary,
U.S. backstop.
to consult with us and
so,
inform us
and the reason why you
before
need
our
such a
next
strong
actions,
U.S. backstop
whether against
is because our allies and
Nigeria,
our partners
Colombia,
have not
Cuba,
invested
Iran, or
enough in their
anywhere
own defense
else.
capabilities over the last
And I
20 or
hope
30
and
years.
believe that
Now,
I can
hopefully
count
that's
on
going
you
to
to
change.
reinforce
Hopefully that
the
is changing.
sanctity
And in some
of
cases
NATO.
and in some
Not to
particular
reimagine
countries, it's already
it,
changed.
but to reinforce
But
it.
this is a fact that we cannot ignore.
Thank you.
NATO
Well,
is
let me
going to be
unpack
stronger
the three
if our
points you
allies are
touched
more
upon:
capable,
consultation,
especially, and
NATO
here's the
agreement,
reality, whether we want to accept it or
alliances
not,
and
we
agreement.
have
Let me turn on the
interests
consultation.
all
Look, this
over
has
the
been a
world.
point
We
of
have interests
tension,
in the Middle East,
not just in
we have
this
interests in the
administration
Western
and Congress,
Hemisphere,
but in
we
multiple
most certainly have
administrations, as
interests
you
in the
rightly pointed
Indo-Pacific.
out.
A number of you have already pointed out that China
I was a
is
big
the
fan
chief
of consultation when I was
challenge.
sitting over there.
We
Now,
can't have the
it's
same
a different
soldiers
job, different
or the
time.
same
But it's not-
ships
that's not
in both
necessarily
Europe
the point. This
and
is a
in
very
the
unique
Indo-Pacific.
situation that
we
we
have to
faced
pick.
here.
No matter how many ships we build,
the fact of the matter
no matter
is
how
that
many
our mission, and the
capabilities
one
we
you were
grow,
briefed on and
we're going to
talked
have
about,
to make
that
these
mission
adjustments.
remains
And
ongoing.
the stronger
That is
our
the
partners are in
counter-narcotic
NATO,
mission that we
the
continue
more
to carry out.
flexibility the United States
As controversial as it
will
may
have
be,
to
you
secure
may
our
not
interests
all
in
be
different
fans
parts
of
of the
it,
world.
obviously,
That's not an
but it is
abandonment in
happening
NATO.
in the Eastern
That
Pacific,
is
and it is also
a
happening
reality
in the
of
Caribbean
21st
basin.
century, and the
problem
world is
is,
changing
or
now. In
the
the
good
case of
news is there aren't a lot of
I'll
drug
say
boats
we're in a
moving
good
in the
place right
Caribbean
now.
basin
We had
anymore.
excellent meetings
And that's
with
what
the
we had briefed
General
Congress
Secretary
upon.
of-
The
Secretary General
specific
of NATO,
mission that you've talked about,
in fact,
one of the
even as
reasons
I
why
speak
you
to
rehearse
now,
is to see if
there'll
it's
be
even
some technical level
feasible
meetings
to basically
between
go
us
to the
and our
president and
partners
say, is this
in
something that's
Greenland
even an
and-
option on the
and
table?
Denmark
The truth
on
of the
this
matter
issue.
is that this
And I think we have in place a process
could
that's
not
gonna
have been
bring
briefed
us
to Congress
a good outcome
because it even
for everybody.
wasn't even
the president's
in the realm of
interest on
possible
Greenland has been
until
clear.
very
It's a
late in
national security
December,
interest. It's
when
a
the-
long-standing
when all of our
interest that
efforts to
predate this
negotiate with Maduro
administration.
had failed.
It's one that
and
our
the president
allies
was
acknowledge
finally
is
presented these
real.
options and made these decisions.
I think we're going
It
to
was
get
also a
something
trigger-based
positive done.
operation.
We're going to
It
begin
may
that
never have
process in
happened.
a very
It required
professional, straightforward way.
number of
It begins
factors
today,
to all
and it'll be a
align at the
regular
right
process.
place at the right time.
We're going to try
in
to
a very
do it
limited
in a
window.
way that isn't
And
like
it wasn't
a
even
media
clear it was
circus
ever
every
going to
time
be
these
possible.
conversations happen.
There's
because we
also
think
the
that
aspect which
creates,
I do not control,
more
and that is
flexibility
the
on both
deference to the
sides to
Department of
arrive
War
at
on
a positive
operational
outcome.
security.
And I think we're going to
Despite
get
the
there.
fact
And I
that
thought
we
it was
kept this
noteworthy
quite
and
constrained,
important.
the truth of the matter is that
this was
the president
we
had a
now know
speech
it was
in Davos
leaked
made
by
very
a
clear
contractor.
that the United States
Department
was
of
not
War.
going to use
that
force
had it
or
been
military
published would have endangered the lives of people.
I think we're going to wind up in a good place. We got a little bit of work to do, but I think we're going to wind up in a good place.
So this is a real tension, and one that I'm doing the best I can to try to manage
Mr. Secretary,
within
the
the
Gang of
constraints
Eight
two
has
things.
never leaked.
Operational security.
Senator,
It is critical that you consult with
decisions being
Congress.
made.
For
We
us
have-
to be
I-
safe, our
there are
allies have to
multiple
trust us.
contingencies for events
and
all
for
over
this
the world,
committee to
including
do
some
our
that none of
work,
us think
we
we're ever
have
going to
to
come to
trust you.
fruition.
Thank
Let's
you.
work
And,
together to
in
restore
this
that.
particular case,
Senator
one of the
McCormick.
reasons why you rehearse these things
Mr.
in
Secretary,
advance is to know
thank
whether
you for
it's
being
even
here.
possible. Is this even
Defending
doable?
American
And what are the
interests,
risks associated with
in
doing
the
it?
face of
So you can
Russian,
present
Iranian,
options
and
to the
Chinese
president who
encroachment in the
ultimately
Western
makes these
Hemisphere. It's a
decisions.
key
In the
to
case of
Trump corollary
reimagining
of the
NATO, it most
Monroe
certainly has to be
Doctrine.
reimagined. And the reason why it has to be reimagined is not because its purpose is
in her
reimagined.
public
Its
commentary, at
capabilities
least,
have to be
defends their
reimagined.
ties
Let
to
me give you as a
Russia,
point of
Iran,
example.
and
There's
the
a lot of
PRC,
talk about security
and
guarantees.
had said this week
And
had
it's something
enough
that there's
of
general
US
agreement
interference.
about now
So
with the case of Ukraine.
beyond the oil
But those
leverage,
security
which you talked
guarantees
about in your
basically involve the
testimony,
deployment of a
what steps is
handful
the
of
administration
European
taking
troops,
to
primarily
demand
French,
from the
UK,
interim government
and
to
then a
put
US
incentives in
backstop.
place
But in
to
fact, the
ensure
security
that they
guarantee is the U.S.
prevent
backstop.
malign actors,
It is
foreign
not the
terror organizations,
and
and so
I'm not
forth
diminishing the fact that
continuing to
some
have,
countries in Europe are willing to place
influence
troops in a
and
post-war
safe haven in
Ukraine.
Venezuela.
What
Yeah,
I'm pointing out is
yes,
that
there's
is
leverage,
irrelevant
and
without
I
the
wouldn't
US
just say,
backstop.
well, I think anything that's
so-
sanctioned
and
in
the reason why you
Venezuela
need such a
will-
strong
in order
US
for them
backstop
to normalize
is
it
because
will
our allies and
require
our
cooperation
partners
with the United
have not
States.
invested enough in their
But
own
it's not
defense
just leverage,
capabilities
it's
over the
also
last
their
20 or
national
30
interest.
years. It's in alignment of their interests. The truth of the matter is that the United States will be a far better partner, and in some particular countries it's already for a future Venezuelan government. But this is a fact that we cannot ignore. And even for NATO is going to be stronger than some of the allies are more capable with now. Especially, and here's the reality, whether we want to accept it or not, we have interests all over the world. Venezuela's interest to have an Iranian presence or the sale of Iranian weaponry. We most certainly have interest in the Indo-Pacific. A number of you have already pointed out that China, we think and can argue that some of these criminal elements which they've allowed to act with impunity in parts of their country in both Europe, is a deal with the devil. And in the short term, it provided revenues to some corrupt regime officials, but in the long term, has created real destabilization, not just them, by the way, but also for Colombia. Just understand something. The FARC dissidents and the ELN operate with impunity from Venezuelan territory. They control Venezuelan territory. And some of that was through deals with individuals aligned with the regime because they made money off of that. But we don't think that that's in the long-term interest of the General Assembly. And what's been expressed to us by leaders of the interim authorities is that they agree. And now we're going to test it.
Despite the public commentary, there's a recognition, you think, and progress.
Look, we all have politics, even in places like that. And I think we have in place a process what I've said from the very beginning to a good outcome. We are going to judge based on the president's interest on Greenland has been clear. And that's going both ways. You can tell us you're going to do all these great things. If you don't do them, this administration, it's one that our allies I'm not going to do these great things, but if you do them, I think we're going to get something positive done. I think we've made. We're going to begin that process in a very professional, straightforward way. Just as an example today, and think about a regular process. Within 2.5 weeks, try to do it in a way that isn't like a media circus. They passed reforms to the hydrocarbon laws, we think that creates which basically more roll back on both sides many of the Chavez era restrictions. And I think we're going to get private ownership. And I thought it was noteworthy and important. That despite your concerns, it doesn't go far enough. It probably needs to do more. But that's extraordinary. That the United States was not going to use 2 or 3 weeks ago. It certainly wouldn't have happened if Maduro was still there. So I think these are signs of progress. In a good place. We got a little bit of work. Do they still have political prisoners? They do. And I think many are increasingly being released every single day, and some are actually being released and beginning to speak out again. And we're going to watch very closely.
It is critical that you consult with Congress for us to be safe. Our allies have to trust us,
question, which
and for
is
this committee to do
this
our
long
work,
history
we have
of,
to trust you.
Let's work very sordid history for outside investors coming into Venezuela.
Secretary, thank you for being here.
You had a meeting with
defending
American
energy
leaders in the face of Russian, Iranian, and Chinese encroachment on the Western Hemisphere. And there was worry the Trump corollary of the safety of investing. But Venezuela's new interim leader, beyond what you just described in terms of the defends their ties to Russia, security guarantees for workers, and the PRC, any sorts of had said this week certainty that investors are gaining, which is going to allow them to have the oil leverage, which you talked about in the opportunities of Venezuela.
Yeah, I mean, the first step is some of these investors or potential investors need to get a license from OFAC to be able to even explore this. Then they need to be able to go down there and meet with people and see what's happening and make that determination. Here's what I would say. Venezuela has a lot of oil. They do. But there's a lot of oil in other places too. Companies are only going to invest somewhere if they know we're going to invest. I mean, we're going to make our money back with the profit. I wouldn't just say, well, I think anything that's sanctioned in Venezuela, we can go to in order for them to normalize it. That's the level of certainty that we're talking in terms of security. But it's not. And that's part of this transition process. That's part of this recovery process. The truth of the matter is that the United States will be a far better partner. Because if not, they'll just invest the money in the Venezuelan government, or they'll just invest the money in some other part of the world that has oil. They're not going to risk it. So it's to their benefit now to have set up a normal, we think, transparent process Venezuela's that encourages foreign investment, not just in oil, by the way, and other natural resources, but in other sectors of their economy. So I think there's alignment there. We think and can argue that some of these criminal elements, which they've allowed to act with impunity in generating economic activity, is a deal with the devil. In the short term, it provided revenue, including corrupt regime officials, but in the long term, has created real destabilization, not for just them, by the way, but also for Colombia. Just understand something. The FARC dissidents and the ELN operate with impunity from Venezuelan territory. They control Venezuelan territory. And some of that was through deals with individuals aligned with the regime. They made money off of that. But we don't think that that's in the long-term interest. Well, I don't. And what's been expressed to us by leaders of the interim authorities is that they agree. I think we're going to test,
including the public commentary, there's a recognition, you think,
that when you start shooting people, we all have politics, snipers. Even in places like that, it works. Suffice it to say what I've said from the very beginning, and that's what we've seen. We are going that regime is probably weaker actions than there's ever been, and that's going problem. You can tell us you're going to do all these great things if you don't do them on some other topics. Or you can say I'm not going to do these great things, but if you do them, the core complaints of the protesters, which is that their economies in collapse. I think we can point to and the reason why there's economies in collapse, just as an example, because they spend all their money within all their resources 2.5 weeks of Maduro building weapons removal and sponsoring terrorist groups around the world instead of reinvesting it back into society, and as a result of taken on many of the Chavez era isolated their economy and their country. On private ownership and so that's what the Iranian people are demanding. It doesn't go far enough. It probably needs to do about them, but that's extraordinary. That never would have happened. And this regime is unwilling to do it. So the core challenges, so I think these are signs of progress, but they will spark up again in the future. Do they still have, because this regime, unless they are willing to change, many are increasingly being released every single day, have no way of addressing some are actually being legitimate and beginning to speak out again. And we're going to watch very closely how they're treated and how that happens, because that'll be part of how we judge them in our actions.
Thank you very much,
Mr.
Chairman. Listen, I think
which is
the scope of the project that you are undertaking in Venezuela is
very sordid
precedent.
history
You
for
are
outside
taking
investors
their oil
coming
at
into Venezuela,
gunpoint.
and
You
the
are
president
holding and selling that
and you had
oil,
a
putting
meeting
for
with
now the receipts
our
in an
energy
offshore
leaders
Middle Eastern account. You're
in the Oval
deciding
Office to
how
talk
and for what
about
purposes
the
that money is going to be used in a country with 30 million people.
About
I think a lot of us believe that that is destined for failure. And I know that you're telling us today just to be patient.
Described in terms of
a month later, we have no information on a timetable for a democratic transition. Maduro's people are still in charge. Most of the political prisoners are in jail. And by the way, those that have been let out have a gag order.
The first step is some of these investors or potential investors need to get a license from OFAC to be able to even explore this. Then they need to be able to go down there and meet with people and see what's happening and make that determination. Here's what I would say. Venezuela has a lot of oil. They do. But there's a lot of oil in other places too. Companies are only going to invest somewhere if they know we're going to invest. We're going to make our money back with a profit, and our land isn't going to be taken from us. And if we try to, there's a court we can go to and contract to enforce. That's the level of certainty that we're talking about in terms of security. And that's part of this transition process. That's part of this recovery process, is to normalize their industry. Because if not, they'll just invest the money in Guyana, or they'll just invest the money in some other part of the world that has oil. They're not going to risk it. So it's to their benefit to have set up a normal,
to two companies to sell Venezuela's
that
oil.
Encourages foreign
One
investment,
of them
not just
is
in oil, by the
a
way, and other natural resources, but in
to
other
many
sectors
Americans
of their economy.
That
I mean, it's
and so
unlimited.
my question
Whether
is,
it's
can
retail,
you
whether
commit
it's
that
banking,
partners for
a country
future
that's prosperous
sales
and
are
generating
going to be
economic
chosen
activity
through a
holds
fair,
the promise
open
of all
selection
sorts of
process?
economic activity.
Second, one more question, if
if Delcy Rodriguez,
in my remaining seconds,
who
just
is
very briefly, we've heard such
an
differing
unelected
accounts.
leader, the head
the
of
president spoke
Maduro's
strongly. You have
torture
as well on
operation,
the
is
deaths
still
in
in power 6
Iran,
months
and the horrible atrocities are being committed.
Does that mean
Can you give us some sense
your
of
policy is a
reports of
success
thousands,
or failure?
tens of
How do we
thousands?
judge
What's the State Department's
when
best
we've had
estimate
enough
of what's happened on the
Rodriguez?
ground?
Well, I don't.
And third, in your testimony, you reserve the right to use force again.
I think regimes,
in the
including
future,
that one in Iran, have
the
learned
Venezuelan government
that
isn't
when you start shooting
complying
people in the head with snipers,
with your
it's
requests.
effective. I mean, it works.
So
and
if,
they've
for
done it, and it's
instance, they
horrifying.
refuse to give you access to
that
the
regime
oil
is
in
probably
the future,
weaker
if they said,
than it has ever been.
we're just going to keep
and
it
the core
for
problem they
ourselves,
face, unlike
would
the
this
protests
cause
you
you
saw in
to
the past
consider
on some
military
other
action?
topics,
And do you
is
concede
that they don't have a
that
way
if
to
you're using
address
military action
the core complaints
simply
of the
to try to
protesters, which is that their
compel
economies in
cooperation
collapse.
from the
And
government?
the reason why there's
you
economies in
absolutely
collapse
need
is because
congressional
they spend all their
authorization
money
for that. So if
and
you
all
could
their
answer those three
resources
questions.
So the building
first
weapons
question was about the trading
and sponsoring
companies,
terrorist
the
groups
second
around the
about
world
Delcy
instead of
still in power
reinvesting
6 months
Six
back
months
into
from
their
now.
society.
And the third
and as a
is
result
on
of taking
the,
on massive global
use of
sanctions,
force.
which has isolated their
On the first
economy
one,
and their
two
country.
traders.
So
And
here's
so
the problem.
that's
we
what the
face.
Iranian people are demanding.
The problem we
is
face
that they
in the
stop
short
doing
term
that
is
and start
they had no
caring
place
about
to
them
put
and
oil.
get these sanctions.
They were
off
running
them.
out of
And this
storage
regime is
capacity for
unwilling
their
to do
oil.
it.
We had to
So
move
the
that
core
oil to
challenges,
market very quickly.
the only way to move
protests
it
may
to
have
that market
ebbed,
very
but they will
quickly
spark
is
up
to
again
plug
in the
into
future.
these
Because
two
this
primary
regime,
trade
unless they are
companies
willing
that
to
could
change
sell it in the
and or
open
leave,
market.
that is
Have
not
no
the
way of
permanent
addressing
outcome
here.
here.
That is a
Legitimate
short-term
and
fix to a
consistent
short-term
complaints
problem,
of the
which is
people of
they
Iran
were
who
literally
deserve better.
storing oil.
Thank
They
you.
brought
Thank
in
you, Senator
tankers and had tankers sitting
Thank you very
offshore
much, Mr.
just to
Chairman.
hold their
Listen, I
oil.
think
At some
the
point,
scope of the
capacity to
project that
produce
you
is
are
going to be shut
undertaking
down,
in Venezuela
and their
is
ability to
without
generate revenue.
precedent.
So we had to
You
move
are
that oil very
taking their
quickly.
oil at
The long-term
gunpoint.
plan
You are
is not
holding and
those two
selling
trading
that oil,
companies.
putting
The
for now the
long-term plan is
receipts
for
in an
them to
offshore
have a
Middle Eastern
normal
account.
energy
You're
program
deciding
that sells
how
directly
and for
into the
what
market,
purposes that money is going to be used
to
in a country of
refineries and
30
to
million
companies
people.
that are
I
exploiting
think a
and
lot of us
exploring
believe
it.
that that
For example,
is destined
Chevron
for
has
failure.
operations
And I know
there
that
that
you're
never
telling us
stop.
today
They
just to be
seek to
patient.
expand those
but,
operations. They don't use
a month
they don't need
later,
those
we have
trading
no
companies.
information on
So
a
those trading
timetable
companies
for
were
a
a
democratic
short-term fix
transition.
for a
Maduro's
very
people are
acute
still
problem
in
because we
charge.
wanted to prevent
Most of the political
societal
prisoners
collapse
are in
because they
jail.
had no
And
money
by the
for
way,
revenue.
those that have been let
On the
out
second point about
have a
her being
gag
still
order
in
on
power.
them from the
Look, let me say this a
government.
couple
The
of things.
opposition
This is
leader
not
is still in
unprecedented.
exile.
I can point to a number of places.
This looks
Spain,
already
Paraguay,
like
two
it
examples
is a
of
failure.
places in
You
which
say
there
you're
was
in
a
serious
transition.
talks, but as you know,
from
the
an
Venezuelans
autocratic
are
regime to a
great
democratic
at being
regime, and
in
it took
serious
time.
talks.
I can't give you a timeline of how long it takes. It can't take forever.
I'm just going to give you my 3 questions.
It's not even been 4 weeks since Maduro
answer
was
them,
a year.
because I do
Well, I
think
think we need to be
try to understand
we need to be
how
much
to
further along
judge
6 months from now,
the efficacy
even 3
of
months from now.
this
That may not be
as time goes
satisfactory to you,
on,
but I'm
because I
saying
worry you
we have
won't
to be
be
much
back
further
before
along
this
3, 4,
committee,
5 months. 3 or 4,
anytime
5
soon,
months from now cannot
and
look
to
like what
understand
today
whether
looks
this
like.
is
And I think
just
there's acknowledgement on
facilitating
both sides of
corruption,
that. I
both
can
in
probably give
Venezuela
you a
and
better
here at
answer,
home.
and this
So
is not
here are my 3
deflecting,
questions.
when we finally have people on
First,
the ground, like the
reports are that
ambassador
you've
and the
given
team around her on a daily
no bid
basis that are interacting.
licenses
Because one thing is for me
companies to sell Venezuela's oil. One of them is a massive donor to the president. To many Americans, that reeks. And so my question is, can you commit that partners for future sales are going to be chosen through a fair, open selection process?
All I'm saying to you is,
second,
before this was stagnant.
If Delcy Rodriguez,
before this, we had spent 14 years. You were involved in some
of
those
efforts.
14
leader,
years
the head of
trying to change the dynamic in Venezuela. 13,
is
12,
still
11,
in
10.
power 6 months
part of my
from
career
now.
in the Senate was spent on this.
Does that mean
this is the first time in over a decade
is a success
that we see
or
even the
failure?
glimmer
How do we
of an
judge
opportunity to change
when
conditions?
we've had enough?
A lot of that will
of
depend on us,
Rodriguez.
but a lot of that will depend on them.
And third,
it also
in your
depend on the rest
testimony,
of
you
Venezuelan
reserve
society.
the right
How
to
quickly
use
can we
force
get all these
again
Venezuelans that want to
in
go
the
back to
future
Venezuela
if
and participate
the Venezuelan
in civic
government isn't
and economic life
complying
back to Venezuela? That's
with
going to be
your
critical
requests.
here. We recognize
So
that.
if, for instance,
yes,
they
we have to be much further
refuse to
along
give
in
you
6 months. We
access
expect
to
be
the
further
oil in the
along.
future,
And
if
if
they
we're
said,
not, I'll tell you.
we're just going to keep it for ourselves.
On the third point of use of force,
would this
look,
cause
the
you to
president
consider
never rules out
military
his
action,
options as
and do you
commander-in-chief
concede
to protect
if you're
the national
using
interests of the
military
United
action
States? I can
simply
tell
to
you
try
right
to
now with full
compel
certainty,
cooperation
we are
from
not
the government,
postured to,
you
nor do we
absolutely
intend or
need
expect to
congressional
have to take any
authorization for that.
military
So
action
if
in
you can answer those
Venezuela
three.
So
at any time.
the first
only
question was
military
about the trading
presence you'll see
companies.
in
The second
Venezuela
is
is our
about
Marine
Delcy still in
Guards
power
and
6 months
6
from now.
months from now.
And
And
that
the
is our
third
goal,
on
that is our
the,
expectation,
use of force.
and that is what everything that
on the first
towards.
two
But if
trade.
That said,
So
if
here's
an
the
Iranian
problem
drone
we face.
factory pops up and
The problem we
threatens
face in
our
the
forces
short
region,
term is
the
they
president
had no
retains
place
the
to put
option
oil.
to eliminate
They were
that
running
I'm
out of
asking
storage
a more
capacity
specific
for the
question
oil.
because in your
We had to move
testimony
that
you
oil to
suggest
market
that you
very
would use
quickly.
force
The only way to move it to
compel
market very quickly
cooperation, for
is to
instance,
plug
with
into these
oil
two
sales.
primary
Do
trade
you
companies
agree that
that
you
could
have to
sell
come
it
to
in the open
Congress
market. That is not the
to
permanent
get
outcome here.
authorization
That is a
if you were
short-term
simply using
fix to a
force to try
short-term
to
problem,
compel
which is,
cooperation?
well, there's two
literally
things. There's the
storing oil.
look, they brought in
There's a-
tankers, and we had tankers.
seems like
Under
an
the War
offshore
Powers
just
Act,
to
no,
hold
under the
their
War
oil.
Powers
At
Act,
some
if
point
we're going to
their
be involved
capacity
in
to produce
something,
was going to be shut down.
that's going
and
to
their
put
ability to
us in there
generate revenue.
involved
So we had
in
to
a
move that
sustained
oil very
way.
quickly.
We have to
The
notify
long-term
you within
plan
48
is not
hours
those
after
two
the
trading
fact, and then
companies.
if it's going
The
to last
long-term
longer
plan
than
is for
60
them
days,
to have
we
a
have to come
normal
to Congress
energy
with it.
program that
We don't
sells
anticipate
directly
either
into
of
the
these
market
things having to
directly.
happen. Everything
To
is moving in a
refineries
very
and to
different
companies
trajectory
that are
right now.
exploiting and
On the
exporting.
other hand, if
For
we tell
example,
them we don't
Chevron
want
has
to see drones
operations
from
there that
Iran,
never
as an
stop.
example,
They seek to
pointed at the
expand
United
those
States,
operations. They
or
don't use. They
threatening
don't
our
need those
forces
trading
or our
companies.
presence in the
So
region.
those
or
trading
our
companies
allies'
were a
presence in the
short-term
region,
fix
and they
for a
refused to
very
comply
acute
with
problem
that.
because we
The
wanted to
president does
prevent
reserve the
societal
option in
collapse
self-defense
because they
to
had no money
eliminate
for
that
revenue.
threat. We don't
On the
see
second
that. We
point
don't
about her
anticipate
being
it.
still in
But it
power.
could happen.
Look, let me
But
say
we
this
hope
a couple
not. We don't
things.
want
This
it
is
to
not
happen.
unprecedented.
On the contrary,
I can
if we
point
had
to
to
a
take
number of
military
places.
action, it
Spain,
would set us back
Paraguay,
on all
two
these other
examples.
things that we're talking about.
Places in which
I
there
can tell
was
you
a
military
transition.
action is not good for
from an
autocratic
autocratic
regime
regime to a
transition.
democratic
That's
regime,
not
and
what
it
we
took
hope
time.
to see. It's
I
certainly
can't
not
give
our
you
goal
a
here.
timeline
A
of
lot
how
of that
long
will
it takes.
depend
It
on
can't take
them.
forever.
But I think it would
It's
require
not even been 4
the
weeks.
emergence
It's
of imminent
been
threat
a
of the
year,
kind that
two
we do
years.
not
I think we need to be.
anticipate
Let me
at
put it
this
this way.
time.
We need to
But
be
that's
much
not
further
we-
along.
They get a
6
vote
months
on
from
that
now.
too. Even 3
Senator
months from now.
Brassel.
That may not be
Thanks very much,
satisfactory to you,
Mr.
but I'm
Chairman.
saying we have to be
Very
much
great to
further
see you.
along. 3, 4, 5
Congratulations.
months.
What you and
3 or
President
4,
Trump have
5 months from now
demonstrated in
cannot
the
look like
past
what today looks
year
like.
is clearly
And I think there's
peace through
acknowledgement on
strength,
both
and I
sides of
appreciate
that.
the
I
leadership
can probably
from
give you
both
a
of
better
you.
answer.
We've talked
This
a
is
lot
not
about
deflecting.
Venezuelan
When we
oil.
finally
You
have
know, I
people on
focus
the
a lot
ground, like the
energy
ambassador
going
and the
to
team
China,
around her
and
on a daily basis
three-quarters
that
of
are
all the oil that
interacting.
went from
Because one thing is for me to
Venezuela
pick up the phone and talk to
last
Delcy
year,
Rodriguez 3 times
75%
a
of it
week. Another
went
thing
to
is to
China.
have
They
someone
got
on the
it at
ground on
deep
a daily
discounts.
basis
They
that's following
lots
these
of
events,
money back
is
to
talking civil
Venezuela
society,
through
but
oil
also
for loan
engaging
deals.
with interim
Since the start of this
authorities.
blockade,
But the fact of the
basically
matter is that,
Venezuela
yes,
crude
we want to see
shipments
quick
to
progress.
China have
As you said,
fallen
it's unprecedented.
dramatically.
Okay? All I'm saying to you is,
talk a little bit
before
about
this,
the
this was
impact this has
stagnant.
on China's broader
Before this,
energy
we had spent
strategy.
14 years.
Just to be
we were
clear, it's
involved
a
in some of
quarantine,
those
not a
efforts.
blockade.
14 years
A blockade is
trying to
an
change
act
the
of war.
dynamic in Venezuela. It's a quarantine, and it's been very effective. 10, I was a big part of my career in the Senate was spent on this. In fact, can I just add something? This might be to Senator Murphy's question as well. Even the glimmer of an the Venezuelan authorities are now identifying. A lot of that will depend on us, but a lot of that they want us to grab, and it also depends on the rest of Venezuela. A week and a half ago, we grabbed one of these Venezuelans that want to go back to Venezuela. Here's what happened in the participate in civic and economic life. About 5 ships took off without authorization from the Venezuelans. We recognize that because they yes, we have to be much further along in 6 months. We expect with the cooperation of the interim authorities. And if we're not, I'll tell you, we seized one of those ships. On the third point, we brought it back into Venezuelan waters. Never rules out his options off to the Venezuelans who, in turn, protect the national interests of the United States. I can tell you right now, with full certainty, we are not postured to, nor do we intend or expect. I think your question to have to take any military action in Venezuela. Yeah. So look, China can buy the only military presence you will see like everybody else is our Marine Guard units. Yeah, that is our goal. That is our expectation, and that is what everything back to the benefit. But if that said, if an Iranian drone factory pops up and threatens our forces in the region, the president retains the option to eliminate that threat.
I'm asking a more specific question because in your testimony you suggest that you would use force to compel cooperation, for instance, with oil sales. Do you agree that you have to come to Congress to get authorization if you were simply using force to try to compel cooperation?
Well, there's two things. There's the talking about we're talking about under the War Powers Act. No, under the War Powers Act, if we're going to be involved in economic activity of people who own chains of pharmacies in a sustained way, we have to notify you within 48 hours after, including American retailers, and then if it's going to last longer than 60 days, we just want it to be a normal with it. We don't anticipate either of these things having to happen. Everything is moving in a very different trajectory right now. And we're going to try to. On the other hand, if we tell them we don't want to see drones from Iran, as an example, that will require actions on our part, not money, or threatening our forces, ultimately that will require region or our allies. This is ultimately going to be on the Venezuelan and they refuse to comply with that. The president does reserve the option in self-defense to eliminate that threat. We don't see that. We don't anticipate. And we feel like we're making really good progress. But if we make as much progress over the next 4 weeks, on the contrary, we had made in the last 3.5 weeks, back on all these other things. I'll feel very good about that. I can tell you, military action is not good for recovery and transition. That's not going to be able to continue to work. Certainly not our goal here, because a lot of that will depend on them. But I will point out to this: after this operation happens, of an imminent threat of the kind that we do not anticipate at this time. China, but that's not Russia. They get a vote on that. Iran, Hamas.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, great to see you. Congratulations. What you and President Trump have demonstrated in the past year is clearly peace through strength, and I appreciate the leadership from both of you. We talk a lot about Venezuelan oil. You know, I focus a lot on energy going to China, and a lot of three-quarters of all the oil that went from Venezuela out of the country there last year, 1 million barrels a day last year, went to China. They got it at deep discounts. The dictators, money back to Venezuela through oil for loan deals. Talk a little bit about what we can do to prevent this blockade. Basically, Venezuela crude shipments.
Some of that is sanctioned oil. This requires the willingness to enforce those sanctions.
Let's talk a little bit about the impact this has on China's broader energy strategy.
Just to be clear, it's a quarantine, not a retribution. But that's certainly something that will be under consideration. And others have done that in the past. And we have seen, in the sense that it's given us this leverage. In fact, can I just add something? And this might be to Senator Murphy's question as well. And in fact, some of the ships, remember, all of the Venezuelan authorities are now identifying ships that they want us to grab. We either have a court order about a week and a half ago. We grabbed one of these ships because it's in violation of the sanction. Because here's what happened in the aftermath of the shadow fleet. Maduro, and we were 5 ships. Many of these ships without authorization from the Venezuelan, and some of that oil was going to be controlled by some network in the country. With the cooperation of the interim authorities, we seized one of those ships. We brought it back into Venezuelan waters, handed the ship off to the Venezuelans, who in turn fed it into this mechanism, the short-term mechanism that I described to you.
Targeted. I know that so we're seeing Sweden and Finland have both detained Russian ships. I think your question more specifically was about China. We're going to have a markup on that bill.
Yeah, so look, China can buy Venezuelan oil, but they're going to have to buy it like everybody else. It is, and it's featured prominently in the agenda, both at the G7 this year, as it did somewhat last year, but again this year in the G7 will be one of the top items we'll be discussing. And we've also been pushing it as a priority for NATO to consider. In the long term, 2 things we want NATO to make a priority. Our intention is that it would be governed by a democratically elected undersea cable infrastructure and Arctic security, government. And the third is critical minerals and supply chains, because ultimately you can spend all the money in the world on weapons if you can't make them because you're missing some chip that requires some mineral that China controls. We're not talking about some third world country. I mean, we're talking about a country that doesn't just have wealth.
Thank you. We started this operation on September 2nd
of people who own chains of
pharmacies. The attack on Venezuelans in boats and open waters,
inclling American retailers who have presence there.
We are nearly 5 months in. Next week is 5 months. Finally, a public hearing.
Russia and China in our own hemisphere.
Wow.
And we're going to try to help them get that because
finally
we think it serves our national interest.
In the Senate or House.
That will require actions on our part, not money. But ultimately, that will require them.
Folks who
this
are
is ultimately going to be on the Venezuelan people and Venezuelan society and Venezuelan leaders to make this happen. We're going to be there to help and assist
on Armada amassed. The announcement of the new Monroe Doctrine,
if we make as much progress over the next 4 weeks as we've made in the last 3.5 weeks, I'll feel very good about that. If it slows down or gets complicated, I'll certainly let you know. But our anticipation is that we're going to be able to continue to work cooperatively with them because it's in their interest and ours. But I will point out to this, after this operation happened, look at the people who criticized
of the legal rationale about the strikes on boats in international waters, but I can't
Iran,
because the administration
these are the people that were upset about this strike and this raid and what we did. And I can tell you
why
that
the
in many countries in the Western Hemisphere,
is hollow
there was great pleasure in the fact that Maduro was removed.
I can't tell you why the rationale for attacking Venezuela is hollow because, again, the rationale
still going from Iran to China
in a closed
million barrels a day last year.
I can't share with you the grim details of the murder of shipwrecked survivors in open waters that we all know because
that from continuing to go and what we're doing to support
and we've questioned
some of that is sanctioned
U.S.
oil.
military
It just requires the willingness to enforce those sanctions.
Legality,
and obviously that
because
comes with
the
a cost-benefit
administration will
analysis.
not
The Iranians are
release
also
that
capable of seizing
publicly.
ships and doing
They
that in
released the
retribution.
boat strike
But that's
videos
certainly something that
publicly,
will
but
be
they
under
hid
consideration,
the
and others have
second
done that in the
strike
past.
that
And we have
killed
seized,
struggling
for example,
shipwrecked
weapons shipments in the
survivors,
past
even
that
from
involved
Congress,
Iranian
for nearly
and in fact,
3
some
months,
of the
but I
ships,
can't really
remember,
talk
all
to
of
you
these
about
ships
it.
that we're
I
seizing
can't
with the
talk to you
oil are
about
with
the
court
weakness
orders.
of the targeting
They're either one of two
criteria
things. We
being
either have a
used to
court
attack
order
boats
from a federal
in
judge
the
that allows us to
Caribbean and
seize it
Pacific.
because
I
it's
would
in
encourage
violation
any
of a
colleague,
sanction,
if you have
or
not,
it's a flagless vessel in the shadow
go to the
fleet.
classified
And we
setting
were,
and ask
many
for a
of these
briefing
ships
on
here
each strike
involve
and ask
Iran.
this question,
And some
what
of
was
that
the
oil
evidence
was
that
going to
there
be
were
ultimately
narcotics on
transferred
that
to the
craft?
excess refining
You will be
capacity that
very
China currently has.
surprised if you
mentioned the
ask
words
that
shadow
question
fleet.
about every
Senator
strike.
Shaheen and I have legislation
And so
on
even in this
subsea
first
cables. I've
public
asked you about
hearing,
that the last
5
time we were
months
here.
in, there's a lot
The
we can talk
sabotage being done, directly being
If it was such a
targeted. I know
righteous
that
operation,
Sweden and Finland have both
why is
detained
the
Russian ships
administration
along
and the
those lines.
majority
We're going to have a
in the
markup on
Senate
that bill tomorrow. Is that
so
something you continue to support our efforts to go after?
It is, and it's featured prominently in the agenda, both at
to
the
the
G7
American
this year,
public. I have
as it did
Virginians
somewhat last year,
deployed
but again this year in the G7
in this
will be one of
operation.
the
I
top
can't
items we'll
answer
be
their
discussing.
families'
And we've also been
questions.
pushing it as a priority
God we're
for
having
NATO
a
to
public
consider. The
hearing
two new
5
things we
months
want
in.
NATO
This
to
is
make a
supposed to
priority
be the
this year in our
greatest deliberative
conversations are
body
the
in the
undersea
world.
cable
Mr. Secretary,
infrastructure
who
and
won
Arctic
the
security,
July
and the third is
2024
critical minerals
Venezuelan
and supply chains.
presidential
Because
election?
ultimately you can spend all the money in the
I think
world
the
on
whole world
weapons
would acknowledge
if you
it was
can't make them
Maduro
because you're
Gonzalez.
missing some chip that
Who lost
requires
that election?
some mineral that China controls.
and his
you're in a
vice
lot of
president,
trouble.
Delcy
Thank you, Mr.
Rodriguez.
Chairman.
Now, Senator King.
You have made the decision.
Thank
the
you. We
administration
started
has
this
made the
operation
decision
in the
on
aftermath of the attack
2nd
that
with
Delcy
the attack
Rodriguez
on
should be
Venezuelans
leading
in
the
boats in
country.
open
Let me
waters.
read something that
And now
President Trump
we are
said
nearly
about
5
it.
months in. Next week
On
is 5
January
months.
14 about
finally
Delcy
a
Rodriguez,
public
who lost the
hearing.
election with Maduro. We just had a
Wow,
great conversation
how
today. She's
novel.
a terrific
Finally
person. I mean,
a public
she's
hearing
somebody
in
that
the
we have
Senate or
worked with
House.
very
This
well.
is the first
Let me tell
public
you what
hearing
Delcy
we've had.
Rodriguez said
200
the day after
folks who are on
Venezuela
secret
was
designated
attacked.
combatants.
Governments around the world
US
were
troops
simply
have been
shocked.
injured.
Hundreds of millions of
Bolivarian
dollars have been
Republic of
spent.
Venezuela
An armada
is the victim,
amassed.
and
The
targeted
announcement
attack
of a
this
new
nature,
Monroe
which
Doctrine, which
undoubtedly
does not
has
land well in the
Zionist
Americas. Democrats have been
undertones.
asking over and over
What
again,
the hell
can we
did
have
Delcy
a public
Rodriguez
hearing?
mean when she
Can we
said
share
this
what we
attack
know
had
with the American
Zionist
public?
undertones?
Finally, a public
I'm
hearing.
assuming you have no
But even
idea.
that hearing is constrained.
Oh, I have an idea what she meant. I mean, what's the
I'd like
question?
to talk about the
what does she mean when she says this
of the
attack
legal
has Zionist
rationale
undertones?
about the strikes on
I'd have to
boats
answer,
in
but let me
international
answer
waters,
in a
but
broader
I can't
context.
because the
No one here is telling
administration
you this
has
is what we
only
want to see in
shared
the
it
long
with
term.
members.
We're not.
in
This
a
is not a
classified
campaign
setting.
to leave in
I
place
can't
the
tell
systems
you
currently in
why
place.
the
But we either have
rationale
no,
is
but I mean the
hollow
criticism
and
of us is.
I'm
All right, go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I can't tell you
I'm
why
ready
the
to switch
rationale
now
to
for
talk
attacking
about
Venezuela
somebody
is
thought you raised an
well,
important point. If I could
because
get back to it,
again,
well.
the rationale
You know well,
has
and
been
you
shared
respect
with us
Maria Karina
in a
Machado.
closed setting. I
President-
can't
here's what
share with
President
you
Trump
the
said
grim
about her, won the
details
Nobel Prize
of the,
in the
murder
aftermath
of
of the attack on
shipwrecked
Venezuela.
survivors in open waters
I think
that we
it
all
would
know
be very
we've
tough
seen
for
the
her to be the
videos.
leader. She doesn't have
And
the
we've
support
questioned
within
the
or the
U.S.
respect
military
within the country.
officials
She's a very
involved
nice
about
woman, but she
legality
doesn't
because
have
the
the
administration
respect.
will not
What did President
release
Trump
that
mean by that?
publicly.
Yeah. First of all, I've known Maria
They
Karina
released
for
the
probably
boat
12
strike
years,
videos
13
publicly,
years.
but
I've dealt
they
with her
hid
probably more than anybody
the
on
second
anybody
strike
as
that
much as
killed
anybody on this
struggling
committee has for
shipwrecked
certain.
survivors,
And I'll be meeting with her
even from
today, in
Congress,
fact, and we met
for
with her a couple
nearly
weeks ago.
3
So
months, but
here's
I
the
can't
reality,
really
though, and I
talk
think what
to
the
you
president
about
was
it.
pointing to. And
I
I think
can't
Maria
talk to you
Karina
about
would
the
acknowledge
weakness
this.
of the
She
targeting
only way for
criteria
I talked to her last week.
being
Well,
used to
there's
attack
very
boats
disappointed in those
in
comments,
the
and so are
Caribbean and
Venezuelans
Pacific.
in
I
my
would encourage
state.
any
Okay,
colleague
well,
if
she didn't
you
share
have
that
not,
with me or with us, but I would sell to
go
this
to
you,
classified setting and asked for a
the
briefing on
President is
each strike
acknowledging
and
is that
asked
today,
this question,
as it stands,
what was
whether
the
we like it
evidence
or
that
not,
there were narcotics
the elements
on that
of control
craft?
in that country, the people
You will
with the
be
guns,
very
the people that control the
surprised
guns
if
and
you
the
ask that
institutions of
question
government there
about every
are in the hands
strike.
of this regime.
And so
we either,
even in this
on the
first
one hand,
public
we're getting
hearing,
criticized, some people
5
saying we
months
don't
in,
want
there's a lot
regime
we can't
change.
talk about.
On the other hand, we're being
If
criticized
it
for
was
not
such a
undertaking regime
righteous
change.
operation,
What we're trying to trigger
why
here
is
is a
the
process of
administration
stabilization,
and the
recovery, and
majority in
transition
this Senate
into something where Maria Karina and
so
others can be a part of.
jealously
And that's what we're working
protecting
towards.
the
Respect for her,
details
don't you?
about
Sure.
it from being
Great.
revealed
My
to
last
the
question
American
is
public.
this.
I have Virginians
So does the president, by the
deployed
way. He met with her. They had a great
in
meeting.
this operation.
And
I
he
can't
actually spoke to her last
here's
week.
what he
in my
said.
presence.
Here's what he said after that
Thank
meeting.
God we're having
talking
a
to
public
her,
hearing 5
and
months
maybe
in.
we
This
can
is
get her
supposed to be
involved
the
in
greatest
some way. I'd love to be able to do that.
body in the world.
Maybe we
Mr.
can
Secretary,
do that.
who
We'll-
won the
we'll set the
July
terms for this
2024
Nobel Prize
Venezuelan
winner
presidential
having a
election?
leadership role. Last question is
Oh,
this.
I
You
think the
talked
whole world
about
would
the
acknowledge it was
speech
a
in
Mundo
Davos.
Gonzalez.
Here's what something the president said in Davos.
Maduro.
and his vice president until the last few days when I told them about Iceland. You have made the decision. The administration has made the decision. They're not here for us on Iceland. That I can tell you. Our stock market took the first dip yesterday because of Iceland. So Iceland is already President Trump said about her. On January 14 about Delcy Rodriguez, who lost the election. We're not mad. We just had a great conversation. She's a president just mistook the two countries. She's somebody that we have worked with very well.
Yeah, he meant to say Greenland, but I think we're all familiar with presidents that have
the day after
stumbles.
Venezuela was attacked.
We've had presidents like
governments
that
around the world
made a lot more than this.
Shocked. Nice try. That the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela is the victim and target of an attack of this nature, which undoubtedly has Zionist undertones.
Our founders debated extensively over which branch
Delcy
of government
Rodriguez
should have
when
the
she
power
said
to
this
declare
attack
or
had
initiate
Zionist
war.
undertones?
Virtually unanimously,
I'm
they
assuming you have no
decided
idea.
what was entered into the
Oh, I have an
Constitution
idea
was
what
that
you meant.
the declaration or initiation of war would be the power of Congress.
What does she mean when she
Now, we have
says
many
this attack
advocates.
has
Many of
Zionist
them
Look,
are here today.
I'd have to answer, but let me understand in a
who've been
broader
advocates
context.
for an
No one here is
expansive
telling you this is
notion
what
of
we want to
presidential
see
power.
long term.
Okay.
We're not. This is
They
not a
often argue
campaign
that
to
wars
leave
are
in
not
place
really
the
wars,
system
that
that's
they're
currently in place.
kinetic
Let me
actions.
But we either have
drug
no, but I
busts.
mean the criticism
No,
of us is.
I think,
All right, go ahead.
though,
No, go ahead.
if
Go
you
ahead.
reverse the circumstances,
I'm ready
it
to
becomes
switch
very
now
difficult
to talk about
for these
somebody that
arguments
you raised
to
a
hold
important
up.
point. If I could get back
So I would
to
ask you, if a
know
foreign
well, you
country
respect
bombed
well,
our
Ukraine
air
and China.
defense missiles, captured and removed our
Here's
president,
what
and
President Trump
blockaded
said
our
about her,
country,
won the Nobel
would
Prize
that be
in
considered
the
an act of
aftermath of the
war?
attack on
Well,
Venezuela.
I think your question is about the.
I think it would be
I will
very
acknowledge
tough
you've been
for her
very
to be the
consistent
leader.
on
She
all
doesn't
these
have
points
the
the
support
entire
within
career.
or the respect within the country. She's a very nice
no matter
woman,
who's
but
in
she
charge.
doesn't
So I will
have
point to two
the
things. The
respect.
first is it's hard
What
for
does
us
President Trump mean by
to
that?
conceive
First
that
of all,
an
I know
operation that lasted about 4.5 hours, there was a law enforcement have dealt with her probably more than anybody on someone we don't recognize as much as anybody on this committee. Indicted in the United States, and I'll be meeting with her today. Wanted with a $50 million
question would be, if it only
So
took 4
here's
hours
the
to
reality,
take
though,
our
and I think what the
president,
president
very
was pointing
short,
to, and I think
nobody
Maria
dies
Corina
on
would
the other
acknowledge
side,
this.
nobody
The
dies
only
on
way
our
for
side.
I talked to her last
It's
week.
perfect.
Well, here's
very
Would it be an act
disappointed
of
in
war?
those
we just don't believe that this operation comes anywhere close.
Very
She didn't share that with me or with us.
But would
I
it
would
be
sell
an
to
act
this
of
to you.
war if someone did it
For-
to us? Nobody
The president
dies,
is
a few
acknowledging is that
casualties
today,
are in
as it
and out.
stands, whether we
Boom,
like it or
it's a
not,
perfect military
the elements
operation.
of control
Would
in
that be
that
an act
country, the
of
people
war?
with the guns,
Of
the
course
people
it
that
would be
control
an
the
act
guns
of
and
war.
the
I'm probably the most
institutions of government there
anti-war person in
are
the
in the
Senate,
hands of this regime.
and I would
So
vote
we either,
to declare
you
war
know, on the one hand,
if
we're getting
someone
criticized for
invaded
people
our
saying we don't
country and
want
took our
regime change.
president.
On the other hand,
So
we're being
I think
criticized
we
for not
need to
undertaking
at least
regime change.
acknowledge this
What we're
is a
trying to trigger
one-way
here is a
argument.
process of
One-way
stabilization,
arguments that
recovery,
don't
and transition
rebound,
to something
but
where
you can't
Maria
declare
Corina and
yourself.
others can be a part of.
You cannot
And that's
be
what we're
universally
working
applicable
for
are
her,
bad
don't you?
arguments.
Sure.
So my next
Great.
question
My
would
last
be,
question is this.
let's say
So
it's
does the
not a
president,
war.
by the way.
We're
He
just
met
going
with
to
her. They had a
define
great
it away and
meeting.
say it's not a war.
And he
That's one
actually
way.
spoke to her last
here's
week.
what he
It's a drug
said.
bust.
Here's what he said after
What
that
if a
meeting.
foreign
We're
country
talking to
indicts
her,
our president
and maybe
for
we can get
violating
her
a
involved
foreign
in some way.
law?
I'd love to be able to do that.
Should we
Maybe we
extradite
can
our
do
president, or
that.
should we
We'll
be okay if
set
they
the
come in
terms
and get
for
him
this
by
Nobel
force?
Prize.
Look, I think ultimately we're
having
always
a
going to
leadership
act
role.
in
Last
our
question
national
is this.
interest.
You
And
talk
so if
about
somebody
the
comes after
speech
our
in
national
Davos. Here's
interest,
what
like the case you
something the
described,
president
which
said
obviously
in Davos.
does not exist
I'm
at
helping
this time,
NATO
but
until the last few days.
the case you described, the U.S. always has the right to act in its national interest and to protect itself.
They're not
I don't know about
Iceland,
this
that I can
equivalency.
tell you. Our
Does this
stock
justify
market
them
took
doing
the
it?
first
We're
dip
always going to do what's
yesterday
best for the
because of
United States
Iceland.
and America.
So
We're always going to
Iceland is
protect our
already
system.
But the point
cost us
isn't,
a lot
and
of
you're
money.
exactly right. We will act in our
President
national interest. We
repeatedly
should. So I'm not
mistook
disagreeing
Iceland
with you at
for
all.
Greenland, right?
What
We're
I'm
not
saying
mad
is,
at
though,
Iceland. They
that
haven't cost
our
us any money.
arguments
The
are
president just
empty. The
mistook
drug
the
bust
two
isn't
countries
really
for
an
each other,
argument.
correct?
It's a ruse.
Yeah, he meant to say
The
Greenland,
war
but I think we're all
argument, not a
familiar with
war, is a
presidents
war,
that have
is a
verbal
ruse.
stumbles.
It's not a real argument.
We've had presidents like
And
that before.
We
Some
do
made a
what
lot
we
more
do
than
because
this.
we
Nice
are-
try.
We
Thanks.
have the force. We have the
thought he
might.
did
We
well.
do it because it's in our
Let's
interest.
see.
So
We
we
got
wouldn't let
Senator,
anybody come in,
Senator
bomb us,
Paul.
blockade us, and take our president. Our founders arguments debated about extensively over which branch of government should have the
elections,
power to
rigged
declare or
elections.
initiate war.
So there's all kinds of same
Virtually
arguments
unanimously,
that we've had in
they
our country
decided
that have had in
what was entered into
Venezuela.
The Constitution was that
Well, we wouldn't
declaration or
argue
initiation
for an
of war would be the
indictment.
power of
And these
Congress.
things aren't idle
Now,
speculations.
We have many advocates, many of them indicted by the ICC. And one of the reasons I object to being part of the ICC, and I would say a presidential power, the administration probably agree, is we're not going to let any international wars are not really wars, that they're kinetic actions or drug busts. We're not going to do that. I think, though, if you reverse the circumstances, it becomes very difficult as well. So I think the arguments are valid. So I would ask you, if a foreign country bombed our air defense missiles, captured and removed our president, and blockaded our country, would that be considered an act of war?
Well, I think your question is about the.
So I will talk about at least one of the arguments.
Consistent on all these points the entire career.
A constitutional war, therefore it doesn't rise to the constitutional notion.
So I will point to two things. The first is it's hard for us to concede that an operation that lasted about 4.5 hours and was a law enforcement operation to capture someone we don't recognize as the head of state, indicted in the United States, wanted with a $50 million bounty.
Would be if it only took 4 hours to take off 50-60,000 soldiers who died in Vietnam might be enough for them to call that a war. It's perfect. But here's the problem. Would it be an act of war?
We just don't believe that this operation comes anywhere close to the constitutional
definition. Your founders gave us the power to initiate or declare war. Nobody dies. Other few casualties are in and out. Those are boom. It's a perfect military operation. But if we have to wait to see how many people are killed, of course it would be an act of war. I'm probably the most anti-war person in the Senate. If we have to wait to see the scope, nature, and extent, if someone invaded our country for some time, it's hard to vote to initiate a war that's been going on. We can say this war is over, but we're still blockading one-way arguments that don't we may go back in that you can't apply to yourselves. But there are no clear answers. Cannot be universally applicable are bad arguments. So my next question would be, let's say it's not a war. The definition of war is very important. We're going to define it away and say it's not a war. That's one of the arguments. Have to acknowledge the problem of the argument. What if a foreign country indicts our president for violating a foreign law? In war, you don't have a medal of honor. Should we extradite our president, or should we be okay if they come in and get him by force?
So I think ultimately we're always going to act in our national interest. Let's vote on these things. So if somebody comes after our national interest, like the case you've described, which obviously does not exist at this time, but the case you've described, the U.S. always has the right to act in its national interest and to protect itself. I don't know about this equivalency, but we didn't justify them doing it. We're always going to do what's best for the United States and America. Someone was not elected, and it was actually an indicted and you're exactly right. In the United States, and their system.
Our laws, I'm not disagreeing under our laws. Look, what I'm saying is that our arguments are empty. The drug bust isn't really an argument. Our president said Biden wasn't the war argument. Not a war is a war. 2016. It's not a real argument. So you have these arguments, and do what we do because it probably was, and most likely was, most assuredly was in our interest. So we wouldn't let anybody come in, bomb us. But at the same time, if that's our predicate, and you have to come to us because it's a drug bust. We've had arguments about legitimate. You can see where it leads to, and it leads to elections. So there's all kinds of same arguments. And that's why we have rules we've had in our country, so we don't get so far out there that we wouldn't argue for an indictment. And these things aren't idle speculation. For 7 years, Netanyahu's been indicted by the ICC. But it's one of the reasons I object to being part of the ICC, and I would say you and the administration probably agree, is we're not going to let any international council indict our president and arrest him somewhere in foreign soil. We're not going to do that.
This is the first
most of us probably object to indicting Netanyahu in that way as well. So I think the arguments are invalid. So we did get the legal opinion that Senator Kaine referred to, the OLC opinion, Office of Legal Counsel. And I think a lot of it has been released, plus they came to our
going forward, and that we'll see you at least every 6 weeks or so. So
I will talk about at least one of the arguments. They say this war wasn't a constitutional war.
I feel like the strategy of keeping basically these very weak arguments secret so that they can't be discussed openly for the legal justifications. I've gone down and read them, and there's a reason. Obviously, you'd be incredibly embarrassed if those were public. So make them public. Let's have an actual transparency here in the United States of America. And let's be clear about what has gone on. We had a dictator we didn't like. We replaced it with a dictator we think we can manipulate. And if that doesn't work, we'll do something else in order to pry open that economy for oil. And I must say that you did say something I liked. So let me emphasize that.
We have to wait, as they describe it, as the scope,
you said
nature,
no
and
U.S.
extent.
taxpayer dollars will be used, no spending on our part.
The war has been going on for some time. It's hard to vote to initiate a war that's been going on.
Can you restate your commitment to that?
But we're still blockading it.
They're not going to need it. For example, we're not spending money in Venezuela right now. I mean, obviously, look, I think you're putting aside embassy operations and all of that. And by the way, there may be some program through foreign aid that some of you might be interested in the future. We don't think that Venezuela is the kind of country that needs that. This is a very wealthy country.
Thank you. I'm glad you restated that because I think that we will see some moment when the administration says, let's subsidize our American oil companies to rebuild the infrastructure in Venezuela. And I must say that's a very unpopular idea among my constituents. I think America needs a lot of investments in infrastructure here. And I think you have an
way too rosy sense of the oil economy there. Many experts have said, look, without 10-year prospect horizon of stability, without Canada deciding to ship a lot more of its heavy oil from instead of to the Gulf, doing it to Asia so that we prop up the kind of demand in the Gulf,
and their system
without keeping Iran off the international stage so that the cost of oil, the value is higher.
Our president said
those
Biden
factors would have to be there for
Hillary Clinton
our oil
said in
companies to
2016
want to
Trump wasn't
invest their own money.
So you
I think
have
they'll be
these
coming to the
arguments, and
administration.
I agree
I
with
think
you.
you'll all
It
be trying to
probably
find some way to
was, and most
subsidize
likely
them.
was.
But I'm
Most
glad what you
assuredly
said
was
today that
a
you're not
bad
going to
election.
do
He
it, and I
wasn't
want
really
to
elected.
hold the administration
But at the same
accountable for
time,
that.
if that's
Second,
our
on
predicate,
terms of
and you have to come to us
the
because it's a
$500
drug
million
busters removing
fund,
somebody,
$300 million,
you can see
my
where it
understanding,
leads
has
to,
gone back to
and
the
it
Central
leads to
Bank of Venezuela,
chaos.
and they have
And that's why
essentially
we have rules
exchanged
like the
it
Constitution,
for
so we don't get so
bolivars
far out there that presidents
to
can do whatever
key
they want.
industry
It is this
players.
check and
I don't think
balance.
we have any
And I would argue for
transparency
70 years
on
we've been
what
going the wrong way. It isn't
corporations
just
or
this president,
entities
but it's a
got
debate
that
that I
hard
think is worth
currency.
having.
And yet you did say there's going to be a lot of transparency.
Oh, thank you, Mr.
You
Chairman,
also
and I
said,
want to
if I
associate
understood right,
myself with the
that those
comments
funds are
of
eventually
Tim
going to be
Kaine.
brought back into
the fact that we're 5 months
the
into this,
structure
and this is the
of
first
U.S.
oversight hearing,
control
is
as part
really
of
a
our
complete failure of the responsibility of Congress, failure of this
formal
committee to
structure
demand
of
oversight, but
funds.
also a
And in
reflection of
that
the reluctance
sense,
of the administration.
the Constitution
to
says
engage
no
in
money
the
should be
proper
drawn from the Treasury, but in
consultation
consequence
with
of
Congress. So I hope we
appropriations
do a
made
lot
in law.
better
So are you going to make sure
we'll
that
see
if that
you
money comes
at least
back
every
into
6 weeks or
kind
so,
of full
not
U.S.
every
control, not an
5
offshore
months.
account the way it is now?
I also
that we're going to abide by the
feel like the
Constitution.
strategy of keeping
Third
basically
point
these
here
very weak
is that
arguments secret
one
so
of the
that they
things
can't be
that
discussed
transpired
openly for
is
the
cutting off
legal
the oil to
justifications.
Cuba.
I've gone down and
I know you
read
have a
them,
strong interest
and there's a
in
reason you'd
making life
obviously you'd be
difficult
incredibly
for
embarrassed if
the
those were public.
leadership
So
in
make them
Cuba.
public. Let's
Can
have
you
an
lay out
actual
for us what other
transparency
things
here in the
you might be
United States
planning in that
of
regard
America.
and how those fit
And let's
into
be
an
clear
overall
about
plan?
what has gone on.
I'll try to do that
We
in
had
a
a
minute.
dictator we didn't like. We've replaced it
Let me
with a
just say on the
dictator we
rosy
think we can
projections
manipulate.
of oil,
And if that doesn't
it's
work,
not
we'll
rosy
do
projection.
something
I mean,
else
it's either going to happen
in
or
order
it's not. In
to
essence,
pry
oil,
open that economy
there's no
for
world
oil.
in which the United States is
And I must say
subsidizing investment
that
in
you
Venezuela
did
oil.
say
It's very
something I
simple. Oil
like.
company will
So
go in
let
and
me
say, okay, this is the
emphasize
oil
that.
you have. This is how much it's going to cost
said
us.
no U.S.
investing on the
taxpayer
front end
dollars
to one end
will be used,
make
no
money,
spending on
pay
our
back our
part,
investment plus a
on
profit
part
at the
of,
back end,
to,
and
kind
then
of prop
depending
up
on the terms
Venezuela.
of that
Can
investment,
you-
they'll make a
can
decision
you
about whether it
restate
makes
your
sense for
commitment
them
to that?
or not. Right now, what you have
they're not
in Venezuela, for example, we're not spending money in Venezuela right now. I mean, obviously, government. That basically
you're putting aside embassy operations
and all of that. And by the way, there may be some program through glue that keeps the regime together. We want it to become a normal oil economy. Venezuela is the kind of country that's what the ultimate goal is. And in a normal oil economy, companies are going to go in, they're going to look at Venezuelan law, they're going to look at Venezuelan authorities, and they're going to make a determination about whether or not it's worth their investment. And that's the normalization process that we're talking about. That's going to be up to them.
That's a very
if they want to have a
unpopular
normal
idea
oil
among my
economy as opposed to one that's
America
basically
needs a lot of
used as a way to
investments in
feed graft in a
infrastructure
very
here.
inefficient
And I
way,
think
but they
you
didn't
have
care about
a way
that.
too rosy
If they do it the right
sense
way,
of
we
the
think it has
oil
great
economy
promise
there.
and
Many
potential
experts have
over
said,
the long
look,
term,
without
especially because these
10-year
investments take a long
prospect
time.
horizon of
But the U.S.
stability,
doesn't have to put any
without
money to
Canada
encourage
deciding to
companies
ship
to
a
go
lot
in and
more of
invest,
its
nor is there any
heavy
interest
oil
in doing so.
from
But a lot of it
that's a point I really do appreciate.
Yeah, no,
I don't want to see.
well, I don't even think that's even been. I don't think that's even been
keeping
discussed
Iran
or
off the
considered by
international
anybody.
stage.
Your
So that
second point was
cost of oil, the value is higher. It's
All of
the
those
$300 million
left
being
here, I
redistributed to
need
corporations in Venezuela. And
the second one was what, I'm sorry?
So I think they'll be coming to the administration.
Oh, yeah.
I think you'll all be trying to find some way
so
to subsidize them.
that's not
I'm
the
glad what you
permanent
said
structure we
today
want
that
to
you're
see.
not going to do it.
In the
I
long
want
term, we just want them to have a
administration
normal industry
accountable
where
for
the
that.
companies are
Second,
involved in it, they're
terms of
selling it directly to the market.
the $500
we're out of
million
that game.
fund,
What we're talking about now
$300
is the
million,
sanctioned oil.
my
The
understanding,
oil
has
that's
gone
under
back
our
to the
sanction.
central bank
So we have to monitor
of
how that money
Venezuela,
moves. So yes, the
and they
first
have
$300 million
essentially
moves for the
exchanged
following
it
reason.
for
We would all agree we didn't want to see systemic collapse. Like one of the things a lot of you told me you were worried about on the short term.
I don't think we have any transparency on what corporations or entities got that hard currency. And yet you did say there's going to be a lot of transparency. You also said, if I understood right, that those funds are eventually going to be brought back into the structure of U.S. control as part of our
meet their basic needs as part of the stabilization.
formal
We should
structure
not
of
confuse
funds.
stabilization
And
with
in
transition. This is not what the permanent structure is going to look like.
No money should be drawn from the Treasury,
look, the Treasury is handling the structuring of that account. So I would refer you to them, and I can get you an answer for them as to what the legal framework of that Treasury
that would be very helpful,
offshore
because what you just mentioned now, money to meet payroll is very different than what we've heard about the money being used. Point here, hard currency is that inside of Venezuela. One of the things that transpired is this is where complete oversight is. And I know you have a strong interest in transparency, making life difficult.
Remember, the first $300 million we're going to have to on that one because of the urgency in moving
funds. Can you lay out for us what other things you might be
is going to require us to undertake a retroactive audit of how that money was spent. The first $300
I'll try to do that in a minute.
But there's probably another $2.5 to $3 billion.
Let me just say on the rosy projections,
which will have
oil.
It's not rosy projection. I mean, it's either going to happen or it's not. In essence, oil. We're still finalizing.
There's no world in which the United States is subsidizing investment in Venezuelan oil. It's very simple. Oil company will go in and say, okay, this is the oil you have. This is how much we're going to. It's going to cost us investing on the front end to one end. That's money, pay back our investment plus a profit. On Friday, we'll mark the 4-week and then depending on the terms of that investment, they'll make a decision about whether it makes sense for that or not.
This was front page.
Right now, what you have in Venezuela is a corrupt and broken oil company run by the government that basically takes this money, doesn't reinvest in it at all, and basically sprinkles it to its treasury. And obviously, as we finalize it, we want it to become a normal oil economy.
This is not the system.
That's what the ultimate goal is here. And in a normal oil economy, companies are going to go in, they're going to look at Venezuela law, they're going to look at Venezuelan authorities, and they're going to make a determination about whether or not it's worth their investment. And that's the normalization process that we're talking about. That's going to be up to them. If they want to have a normal oil economy as opposed to one that is basically used as a way to feed graft in a very inefficient way, but didn't care about that. If they do it the right way, we think it has great promise and potential over the long term, especially because these investments take a long time. But the U.S. doesn't have to put any money to encourage companies to go in and invest, nor is there any interest in doing so. But a lot of it.
That's a point I really do appreciate. I don't want to see.
Well, I don't even think that's even been. I don't think that's even been discussed or considered by anybody. Your second point was,
on behalf of Floridians, thank you for what you guys did.
I wrote it here, but now.
It's the $300 million being redistributed to corporations in Venezuela.
The second one was what, I'm sorry?
We would love to have free and fair
election
tomorrow.
On the account. So that's not the permanent structure we want to see. In the long term, we just want them to have a normal industry where the companies are involved in it, they're selling it directly to the market, and we're out of that game. What we're talking about now is the sanctions.
Venezuelans,
the oil that's under our sanction. So we have to monitor how that money moves. So yes, the first $300 million moved for the following reason. We would all agree we didn't want to see systemic collapse. Like one of the things a lot of you told me you were worried about on the short term is this is going to trigger internal chaos.
First, I would remind everybody, let's
just
go back 6 months.
1 million people are going to storm
at this time.
border with Colombia.
The Venezuelan challenge for us was frozen.
Brazil was
a frozen situation.
We had a regime that was entrenched. Its opposition was either in hiding or had been forced overseas.
Key to that stabilization
is ensuring that the government had
Maria Corina is no longer. She's very brave. She stood there as long as she could, but she had
part of the stabilization.
The others are in jail.
Confuse stabilization.
They were increasing their relationships.
This is not what the permanent structure is going to
look
look like.
And accordingly, have existing ones
with Russia, Treasury is handling the structuring of that account.
China.
So I would refer you to them.
Other than more sanctions and more speeches and more threats and whatever,
that would be very helpful, because what you just mentioned,
now for the first time in literally a decade, there is the opportunity that something could change. There's not the guarantee that something will change, but there is the opportunity that something will change. We have changed that dynamic, which goes back to the question that Senator Merkley had about Cuba. What we are looking for is the opportunity for a change in dynamic. That's a country that's been backwards. It has no functional economy.
Is going to require us to undertake a retroactive.
You can call them Marxists, we can call them communists, but not even Lenin would recognize this version of communism and Marxism that they've installed in Cuba. It's an economic model that hasn't worked anywhere on the planet. The suffering in the rural areas of Cuba, we would send them a letter saying, and it's not because of the embargo, it's because they don't know how to run an economy. How is it the fault of the U.S. embargo that Cuba, you have the world's largest sugar producers, now imports sugar? That's the process.
Because no sector of their society works.
On Friday, we'll mark
frozen,
and it's broken.
This all began.
But in the case of Venezuela, we have a glimmer of hope now, the opportunity to change the dynamic. This was front page. Now, what that requires is smart decisions on our part, but ultimately it will require decisions made by Venezuelans. So it's only both those currently in charge of the interim authorities and those who may be in charge. And obviously, as we finalize it, we'll provide that to you. It is our sincere belief that the only way you're going to have a free, prosperous, Venezuela that's allied with the United States is one in which every sector of their society is represented in their politics. And that includes many people who currently live abroad.
And even the opposition, people like to say the opposition is very diverse.
Secretary Rubio,
there are members of the opposition that were once part of Chavismo and turned against it. There are members of the opposition that have never been Chavistas, like Maria Corina Machado, and have been very forceful against it. So that broad sector has to be represented as well. So you have to have a process of internal reconciliation that allows these voices to begin to participate in the political life of that country, and that ultimately bring us to a point in which you can have a country where all of these elements of their society are represented in their politics. And look, there's a percentage of the Venezuelan population, I don't know what the number is, whether it's 15 or 20, that may not have liked Maduro, but are still committed to Chavista ideology.
We would love to have
and they'll be represented in that platform as well. They may not win elections, but they'll be involved in this. That'll be up to the Venezuelan people. But our desire here is to have, what's the end state? We want a Venezuela that has legitimate democratic elections.
Venezuelans
sometimes elects leaders that are friendly to the United States. Sometimes elects leaders that maybe are not, the person we would have wanted to win.
What would be the sort of the milestones you would give them to look at?
We're not disputing that Petro is the legitimately elected president of Colombia. First, I would remind everybody, let's go back 6 months. So, but we also want a Venezuela that's prosperous. The Venezuelan challenge for us was frozen. And a year ago at this time, we had a regime. Now we have a real opportunity. Its opposition was either in hiding or had been forced overseas. Through our help, but their efforts. Maria Corina is no longer. She's very brave. She stood there as long as she could, but she had the central base of operation. The others are in every geopolitical adversary we have. They were increasing their relationships and outreach with Iran. And that's what we hope will importantly have existing ones with Russia, Cuba, and China.
If you're a Venezuelan that lives in
Miami, other than more sanctions and more speeches and more threats and whatever, it was a frozen situation.
There's a lot of
now, for the first time in literally a decade, there is the opportunity that something could change. There's not the guarantee that something will change, but there is the opportunity that something will change. We have changed that dynamic, which goes back to the question that Senator Merkley had about Cuba. What we are looking for is the opportunity for a change in dynamic. That's a country that's been backwards. It has no functional economy. The people, I would say, is that we share the same goal. We can call them communists, but not even Lenin would recognize we have to do it through a realistic process that has the highest chance. But doesn't. It's an economic model that has a way to view it. If you use the medical analogy, the suffering in the rural areas of Cuba are acute. They've broken their legs. It's not because of the embargo. It's because they don't know how to run an economy. How is it got to deal with the life-threatening first? Cuba, one of the world's largest, and even when you deal with a broken leg, there's going to be a period of rehabilitation. You don't just go from no sector of their having your leg repaired in a surgery to running on a treadmill. But in the case of Venezuela, we have a glimmer of hope now. But the process has an arrow moving towards. Now, what that requires is smart decisions on our part. What I would say to the people who I know quite well is made by Venezuelans for the first time. Both those who are currently in charge of the interim authorities and those who may be in charge in the future. And a lot of it will depend on them. It is our sincere belief living in Florida that the only way you're going to have a who would like to go back and be a part of Venezuela that's allied with the United States. Many of them are eager one in which every sector of society is they're going to need them. Venezuela is going to, and that includes many people who currently live abroad. And even the opposition, people like to say the opposition. The opposition is very. But again, I remind everybody, there are members of the opposition that were once part of Chavismo and turned against it. I get it. There are members of the opposition that have never been Chavistas, like frozen dinner, Machado, microwave for 2.5 minutes. It comes out ready. That broad sector has to be represented as well. So you have to have a process of example reconciliation that allows these voices to begin to transition from autocracy in the political life to democracy. It's not, and that ultimately bring us to a point in which you can have a country where all of these elements in the right direction of their society are represented in their politics. With the recognition that, look, there's a percentage of the Venezuelan population, I don't know what the number is, whether it's 15 or 20, that may not have liked Maduro, but are still committed to Chavista ideology.
Frankly, be playing to Senator
and they'll be represented in that
and playing
platform as well.
They
may not win elections, but they'll be involved in this. That'll be up to the Venezuelan people. But our desire here is to have what's the end state? We want a Venezuela that has legitimate democratic elections.
To provide checks
sometimes elects leaders that are friendly to the United States. Sometimes elects leaders that maybe are not, the person we would have wanted to win. But that's not unique for us. That happens all over the world. We're not disputing that Petro is the legitimately elected president of Colombia, and yet he doesn't always say nice things about us.
Tens of millions of dollars a day.
But we also want a Venezuela that's prosperous, and a Venezuela that's aligned with the United States.
But we're not.
And a year ago at this time, this was frozen. Now we have a real opportunity, not just to create change systemically within that country, through our help, but their efforts, but also one that is no longer a base of operation, the central base of operation for every geopolitical adversary we have. And that's what Venezuela was under Maduro, and that's what we hope and intend to change.
Whenever it wants. So I want to pick up on my colleague's questioning because I actually know from years of conversations with you your heart about human rights in countries like Venezuela, Mr. Secretary.
But you'd say right now, political prisoners are being released, never fast enough.
A level 4 travel
advisory
advisory
being reduced,
from your
not
department's
fast
website that
enough.
says, right now in Venezuela, there's a high risk of wrongful detention, torture,
so we're making progress, and you're going to
terrorism,
continue
kidnapping,
to control
arbitrary enforcement of laws,
the oil to make sure
crime, and more.
That we continue down this path.
What I would say is that we share the same goal and the same outcome we want for Venezuela. And the question is, we have to do it through a realistic process that has the highest chance of success.
When it comes to
the way to view it, to use the medical
rights
analogy, is this is a critically ill patient that has suffered some very
Cabello
serious things. They've broken their leg, but they also have a ruptured
continue to intimidate and suppress.
You've got to deal with the life-threatening
voices.
first before you
He
deal
remains
with the broken
in control
leg.
of
And even when you deal with a broken leg, there's going to be a period of rehabilitation. You don't just go from having your leg repaired in a surgery to running on a treadmill the next day. There's going to have to be a process here. But the process has an arrow moving towards accomplishments, achievements, and positive things. What I would say to the people who I know quite well as you do is,
so I just want to know,
for the first time in over a decade and a half, there is the real possibility of transformation. And a lot of it will depend on that, because there are many people living in Florida and across the country who would like to go back and be a part of Venezuelan economic life.
Because if
many of them are eager to do so.
Stabilize their
and they're going to need them. Venezuela is going to need them to come back and rebuild the businesses that were taken and lost and engage themselves in both civic and economic life. But again, I remind everybody, on Friday we'll mark the 4 weeks since this happened. I get it. We all want like something immediately, but this is not a frozen dinner you put in a microwave.
Venezuela I described that we want to see emerge from this is one in which none of that is happening.
And
if you think about travel advisors are us imagining worst case scenarios. We have a duty to warn transition from autocracy travel to a place that does have a history of Americans being arrested. In some cases, there are ups and downs along the way.
And they may be taken by a deliberate action
of a government or entity with a recognition. They may be taken by criminal gangs that control parts of that society. For example, you have these collectivos,
I just want to start
which basically are these armed
by saying what's
motorcycle
plain,
gangs that are allowed to act with impunity in return for their support for the Maduro regime in the past. You have the ELN and the FARC and other drug trafficking organizations, inclinging Trained Agua, that are involved. So these are real risks that we have a duty to warn Americans. Because here's what we didn't want to see. I don't mean to interrupt you. We have this announcement that Maduro has been taken. All of a sudden, people conclude, oh, he's gone. Let's flood over there. Let's all go over there, and we could expose people to danger.
But this is the hypocrisy that I see. We have at the same time that you're issuing that are literally costing the human rights caution tens of millions of about what's going on there for Americans. The buildup in the Caribbean alone is hundreds of lifting temporary protected status, but we're not providing that kind of oversight. Many of them are so from our individuals that have lived in our country for years, if not decades, work of providing a check and balance. When I hear from the Venezuelan community, what we're seeing right now is that at the very same time that you are affirming is a growing constitutional that these armed militias are running around suppressing voices. We have an administration that has said very clearly that they're not only going to be lifting temporary protected status for Venezuelans living in the U.S., but instead of protecting long-time American residents, human rights and countries like Venezuela, Mr. Secretary, the administration is putting people back on travel flights and sending them into that madness. Does that make sense to you?
Well, first of all, the travel advisories for American citizens traveling there and the threats posed to Americans. What you're describing is
why lift temporary protected status?
Well, the problem with temporary protective status was it was granted to so many people in such a vast numbers so quickly without proper vetting by the previous administration. That there's a real concern that there were
to that extent,
gang members that had received TPS simply because of the nation they came from and the time in which they came. It became so big and so massive. The overwhelming majority of Venezuelans are not members of Trained Agua, but there were Trained Agua and other criminal elements embedded in the TPS system. And the numbers were so large that the administration felt it had to cancel the program in order to appropriately vet it through on the individual cases.
Mr. Secretary, this might not surprise you. I don't trust this administration. And the way they use terms like terrorists, I've seen them calling American citizens of the people domestic terrorists, who are people trying to peacefully protest. The problem we have right now is administration continues to make policies that seem to contradict their words. And yet we don't have a process in place for Congress to do its job because people are not calling folks in for these hearings and not providing the kind of oversight that we need. It is very frustrating to me that we still have a repressive regime in power in Venezuela suppressing human rights, yet we are cooperating with them. We are funding them, and we're not calling out the ridiculousness of the violence that's going on there. At the same time, we're taking people who have lived in our country for years and years and years and sending them back into that hell where they can be targeted, where they can be abducted, where they can be held for hostage because they know they have American family members that are still here. This is a situation ripe where we are being complicit in continuing human rights violations.
They may be taken by criminal gangs that control parts of that society.
Just on 2 points. We're not cooperating with them to continue doing what they're doing now. We're cooperating with them to transition away from what's happening now. And as I said, we're not even 4 weeks into this. You have the ELN and the FARC to look like this in 6 months, 9 months, a year from now. Progress isn't being made. So these are real risks that we have a duty to warn Americans. What we're cooperating on is not the continuation of what's happening. It's a movement away from all this. We have this announcement transitioning ultimately to something that looks nothing like this. He's gone. That's the goal. Let's flood over. It's been less than 4 weeks, and we could expose people to substantial progress in a very short period of time. But I acknowledge we want to make a lot more progress. This is not the end state that we want.
These human rights cautions about what's going on there for Americans. You have a president that's lifting temporary protected status for Venezuelans. Many of them are individuals that have lived in our country for years, if not decades. When I hear from the Venezuelan community, I hear an outrage that at the very same time that you are affirming here that these armed militias are running around suppressing voices, we have an administration that has said very clearly that they're not only going to be lifting temporary protected status for Venezuelans living in the U.S., but instead of protecting longtime American residents, they're, quote, the administration is putting people back on deportation flights and sending them into that madness. Does that make sense to you?
Well, first of all, the travel advisories for American citizens traveling there and the threats posed to Americans. What you're describing
why lift temporary protected status?
Well, the problem with temporary protected status was it was granted to so many people in such a vast numbers so quickly without proper vetting by the previous administration that there's a real concern that there were gang members that had received TPS simply because of the nation they came from and the time in which they came. It became so big and so massive. The overwhelming majority of Venezuelans are not members of Trained at Agua, but there were Trained at Agua and other criminal elements embedded in the TPS system, and the numbers are so large that the administration felt it had to cancel the program in order to appropriately vet it through on the individual case.
Excuse me, Mr. Secretary, this might not surprise you. I don't trust this administration and the way they use terms like terrorist. I've seen them calling American citizens domestic terrorists.
On the second point, absolutely,
people trying to peacefully protest.
Because
the problem
it's a complex
we have
situation
right
to
now
describe.
is the administration continues to make policies that seem to contradict their words.
But you literally have a
don't
place
have
in
a
which
process
certain
in place for Congress
the glue
to
that
do
held
its
the regime
job
together
because people
was
are not
corruption
calling folks in for these
said,
hearings
I'm supportive of this
providing the kind of
regime.
oversight
They didn't, not because they like Nicolas Maduro,
frustrating
but because
to me
Nicolas Maduro
that we
set
still
up a
have
system
a
that guaranteed
repressive
them a
regime
profit.
in power
Some
in
people were making that
Venezuela,
profit from drugs.
suppressing human
Some of them were
rights,
making it
yet
from
we are
stealing money from their
cooperating
food
with
program
them.
called
We are
CLAP.
funding
Some of
them,
them were making their
and
money
we're not
from
calling out
an oil field that was literally given to
ridiculousness
them in
of the
exchange
violence
for
that's
buying
going on there. At the same time,
some
we're
were
taking
making their
people who
profits
have
from
lived in our country for years and years and years,
so
and
there's no doubt
sending
that
them back into that hell where they can be targeted, where they can be abducted,
that's why we
where they can be
sanction
held
oil.
for hostage
The ghost
because they
fleet
know
exists
they
for
have
the following
American
reason.
family
When something is
members
sanctioned,
that are
when we
still
say
here.
it is illegal
This
for
is
them
a
to move this
situation
oil,
ripe for
none
where
of
we
the
are being complicit in
traditional
continuing human
legitimate
rights violations, and that needs to stop.
will carry that oil. They won't touch it.
Just on 2 points. We're not cooperating with them to continue doing what they're doing now. We're cooperating with them to turn these ships away that are either falsely flagged, meaning they're flying the flag of Liberia, but they don't really have a Liberian flag. And if it continues to look like this in 6 months, 9 months, a year from now, if progress isn't being made, we'll have very different feelings about it. But what we're cooperating on is not the continuation. And these vessels are made up with crews from all over the world. Movement away from the majority of transitioning ultimately to something that looks nothing like
we've seized others. The majority of them are Russians.
It's been less than 4 weeks,
and we think we've made
and so what's happened is a lot of this oil is
going.
But I acknowledge we want to make a lot more progress. This is not the end state
even outside the PDVSA system. And those are the ones that we have now been seizing as well as the ones that are involved outside the PDVSA system. Our goal is to rope all of this illegal oil into a channel that goes into this account that ultimately goes to the benefit of the Venezuelan
primarily
people.
what I want to
This
do
is an interim step. This is not the way we want the oil industry to look like in perpetuity. This is simply a way to provide revenue so that there isn't systemic collapse while we work through this recovery and transition phases. So there's no doubt that when Maduro was there, we had no cooperation on any of this. Zero cooperation. But I will tell you this, since the time Maduro was removed, not a single illegal ship has headed towards Venezuela.
of
international
and the ones that you hear us
terrorism
seizing
and
are
funded
all the
proxies,
legacy ones that took off or have been seized in the past.
so much
So
death
we
and
have got a
misery
really
in the
good
Middle
handle
East.
on this as a result of
So
it. And what's really changed is
it
the
strikes
dynamic
me
that the
that
Venezuelan
Venezuela,
interim authorities
even
are
though
now
it has
actually
a lot of
helping us
oil,
identify
has been more
shadow fleet ships
involved
that
in
they
trying
want us
to
to seize
assist
and feed into
its
this new
allies,
interim
namely
mechanism.
Iran and Russia, in circumventing these sanctions to help them fund their nefarious activities, both in the Middle East and in Ukraine. But obviously, they're also the president of additional energy authorized to strike against China. Iranian nuclear. Can you help us understand that better? What I consider to be a magnificent demonstration law enforcement of American military power to arrest Nicolas Maduro. The arrest current of Nicolas Maduro was not engagement with Venezuela, primarily a military operation, deal with that they provided the support or the evasion to law enforcement authorities.
Yeah, on the first point, on the second point, absolutely, it's helping us deal with it because it's a complex situation to describe.
Most Americans
the oil in Venezuela, we all think is under the control of one entity, and some of it is. But you literally have a place in which certain individuals performed. The glue that held the regime together. But I know the president's very concerned about what's happening to the demonstrators. People said, I'm supportive of this regime, and they didn't, not because they like Nicolas Maduro, but because Nicolas Maduro set up a system that guaranteed them a profit. Some people were making that profit from drugs. Some of them were making it from stealing money from their food program called CLAP. Some of them were making their money from an oil field that was literally given to them in exchange for buying them their loyalty. Some were making their profits from all three. So, and other
what happens
activities.
If the
so there's no doubt that his removal has created the conditions to begin to move away from that. That's why it's an open question. I mean, no one knows. The Ghost Fleet exists for the following reason. Their system is divided. Something is sanctioned. When we say it is illegal for them to move this oil, none of the and then you've got these traditional, legitimate, quasi-elected individuals, the ones that will carry that oil. They won't touch it because they don't want to be sanctioned by the United States. But ultimately have to run everything they do by the Supreme Leader. So you have to turn to these pirates. You have to basically. I don't think anyone can give you a simple answer. That are either falsely flagged, meaning they're flying the flag of Liberia, but they don't really have a Liberian flag, the hope that there would be some ability to have somebody within their systems that you could work towards a similar transition. They have to turn to them. Imagine it would be even far more complex than the one we're describing. And these vessels are made up of crews from all over the world. We seized one where the majority of the crew members were Ukrainian. So that's going to require a lot of careful thinking if that eventuality. We seized others, the majority of them are Russians. On the issue of our presence in the region, here's the baseline. And so what's happened is a lot of this oil is going. The baseline is this: a lot of this shadow fleet oil is going even outside the 8 or 9 facilities in that region. And those are the ones all are within the reach. Now been seizing as well. Theoretically, not theoretically, in reality, all are within the reach. Our goal is to rope all of this Iranian oil into a channel that goes into this account that ultimately goes to the benefit of the Venezuelan people. This is an interim step. This is not the way we want the oil industry to look like. We have to have enough. This is simply a way to provide revenue so that there isn't systemic collapse while we work through this recovery and transition. That at some point, as a result, there's no doubt that the Iranian regime decides to strike at our true presence in the region. Zero cooperation. The president always reserves the preemptive defensive option. Since the time Maduro was, if we have indications that in fact they're going to attack our troops in the region, not a single illegal ship has headed towards Venezuela. We also have security agreements. The ones that you hear us seizing are all the legacy ones that require us to have a forced posture in the region to defend against that. So we've got a really good. So I think it's wise and prudent, and what's really changed is the dynamic that the Venezuelan that could respond are now actually helping us identify shadow fleet ships, but if necessary, that they want us to prevent and feed into the attack against mechanism. Thousands of American servicemen and other facilities in the region and our allies. I hope it doesn't come to that, but that's I think what you're seeing now is the ability to posture assets in the region to defend against what could be an Iranian threat against our personnel. They certainly have the capability to do it because they've amassed thousands and thousands of ballistic missiles that they've built, despite the fact that their economy's collapsing and keep spending money on that.
Thank you. Arrest of Nicolas Maduro was not
do I understand that
primarily a military operation, but they provided the support to law enforcement authorities as they executed an arrest warrant against Nicolas Maduro.
I thank my colleagues. My daughter has dental surgery,
most Americans were very
they're being
proud
very kind, so I can get her to that.
How the U.S.
Thank you.
Government and
Mr. Secretary, last March, the President invoked the Alien Enemies Act.
But I know the President is very concerned about what's happening to the demonstrators.
He said that he was responding to the Maduro regime's supposed invasion or other acts of war against the United States. But in recent weeks, you, the Department of Justice, and our friends across the aisle have repeatedly said that we are not at war with Venezuela. Secretary Rubio, if that is true and we are not at war with Venezuela, will you advise the President to rescind his invocation of the Wartime Alien Enemies Act?
Well, that was a mechanism to remove people from our country that prevent grave danger. So, for example, we know that's an open question. I mean, no one knows
would take over. Obviously, their system is divided between the Supreme Leader and the IRGC that responds directly to him.
Mr. Secretary.
And then you've got these
are we currently at war with
quasi-elected
Venezuela?
individuals, the ones that wear the suits. No, we're not in the state of war. Part of their political
okay, the Supreme Court has described the Alien Enemies Act as a wartime power.
So I don't think anyone can give you a simple answer as to what happens
the Alien Enemies Act was
in Iran
only
if the
invoked
Supreme
during the
Leader
War of
and the regime were to
1812,
fall, other than the hope that there would be some ability to have somebody within their systems that you could work towards a similar transition.
Are you really arguing that the president should be able to wield an internment law?
No, but we're talking about a regime that's in place. So you're talking about the state of Venezuela or describing a regime. And we're talking about, but what the president on the issue of our presence in the region. I know, Senator, let me be clear with you. No, but what the president, the baseline was talking about are these gangs that have, and these narco-trafficking groups that are waging war on the United States. There's no doubt. All are within the reach. These groups have waged war theoretically, not theoretically, in reality. For example, Train Dog was not just a criminal gang presence on the street. It is a Iranian gang responsible directly responsible for UAVs.
The Trump administration has acknowledged that the vast majority of the men it rounded up and deported to torture under this law had no criminal record whatsoever.
We have to have enough force and power in the region, just on a baseline, to defend against that possibility. We've arrested people that are members of gangs, and we've deported some. We don't want gang members. The Iranian regime decides to strike at our troop presence in the region. The president always reserves the preemptive defensive option. In essence, if we have indications that in fact they're going to attack our troops in the region, to defend our personnel in the region. We also have security agreements,
to rescind
the Defense of Israel plan, and others that require us to have a force posture. I mean, these are people that are threats to the national security of the United States. So I think it's wise and prudent. I've described this to have hearings in the past, including
so you're saying that we're at war?
We are absolutely, when it comes to narco-trafficking groups and criminal gangs that are targeting the United States for criminal attack against, there's no doubt about the fact that we're confronting them in a war like that. They're waging war on our allies. They're waging war against us, and that's, I think, what you're seeing now. And the fact of the matter is that we are confronting these irregular groups, and that's one of the great challenges in Iranian threat against our personnel. They certainly have these non-state actors because they've amassed state-like capabilities in terms of their weaponry that they pose a grave danger to the United States. I don't think any American would dispute that we have cartels that pose a threat to the national security of the United States.
Gentlemen, do I understand that you're yielding to Senator Duckworth?
Warfare. I mean, you're saying
both of you, Senator Van Hollen,
he can invoke.
Are you going to yield to Senator
this
Duckworth?
Wartime?
Okay, Senator Duckworth.
I'm saying, you're asking me, I'm here to discuss foreign policy and what's in the realm of the Department of State. I think your question is better directed to the Department of Justice. But I would tell you that
wartime, which is something that
but you're asking me a question that's
can be invoked during wartime.
You're asking me a question
during the War of 1812, World War I, and World War II. Responding to the He's been invoked 3 times, and this president is invoking acts of war.
You're asking me a question about the domestic application of a law that's best directed to the Department of Justice.
And our friends across the aisle
because you're asking me something to opine on something that's in the realm of the Department of Justice in terms of its domestic application.
If that is true,
I can tell you that the United States is most certainly confronting terrorist and criminal organizations operating in our hemisphere. Well, that was a mechanism to remove people. Anyone who believes that gangs that flood our country with fentanyl or cocaine are not threats to the United States is not living in reality, and certainly is not reflecting the opinion of most Americans. I may have been the first member of Congress.
The wartime said that he was ready to put American troops in Venezuela again. So we at war. Are we currently at war with Venezuela? So if things don't go well with the Chavistas, you can.
When did the president say he was going to put troops in Venezuela?
Act as a military option, putting you. What is your criteria for returning to now the Alien Enemies Act?
I don't recall the president saying he's going to put troops in Venezuela.
World War I. I'm asking you, what are your?
But that's what you said. I didn't remember the president
has already said that he was ready to put civilians.
Are you really arguing? No, I think the president said that he retains the right as commander. No, but we're talking about two separate things here. So you're talking about the state of Venezuela or our describing the regime. And we're talking about, but what the president designated.
Invoked the Alien Enemies Act.
I know, Senator, let me be clear with you. No, but what the president, I just gave testimony here. And these narco-trafficking groups that are waging war how well things are moving forward, not as fast as everybody would like.
Yeah, but you also said that in 6 or 9 months, if things don't go well, you're going to have to do something else. And the president's already said that he's not ruling out the military option. And we've also just said that, yes, the Trump administration has acknowledged the vast majority of men reasonable for me to ask you under this law had no criminal record
every president retains the right to defend the United States against an imminent threat. Yes, if there are Iranian, just give you an example. Iranian, we've arrested people that are members of gangs and we've threatened the United States. We don't want gang members in
have found that
even if it's located in Venezuela. But we hope we don't get to that point. We don't expect to get to that point. We're not trending in that direction.
What protections do totally innocent people have?
But that said, on the
one hand,
we're unhappy, we're cooperating with Venezuela.
Well, yet another forever war, Mr. Secretary, wartime. We need to be in another forever war.
I mean, these are people that are threats to the national security of the United States. I've described this in forever war. We're dealing with it. When it comes to narco-trafficking groups and criminal gangs that are targeting the United States for criminal activity, there's no doubt about the fact that we're confronting them in a war like that.
When I served in Iraq,
they're waging war against us, and
there were Polish forces there with us. There were British forces there with us. There were Spanish forces there with us.
And that's one of the great challenges of the new century in this hemisphere in particular, is that these non-state actors who possess state-like capabilities in terms of their weaponry pose a grave danger to the United States. I don't think any American would die that we have cartels that pose all the president wants for NATO to have more
NATO allies have stood beside us.
He wants our allies to have more naval
to maintain the strength of that alliance.
I get it. All the president wants
your time's up. Not making much progress here.
This wartime.
Well, let me just say, the president just wants our allies to have more capabilities. I'm here to discuss foreign policy. Be involved in operations like that. Department of State.
Well,
I think your question is better directed. Not an but I would tell you that
wartime, which is something that.
Yeah, but you're asking. Well, not every country in Europe, not every country in NATO.
Denmark and World War II suffered some of the greatest military
There's no doubt that many of our allies have stepped forward. You're asking me a question about the domestic application of the law that's best directed to do it now or in the future. No, it is because you're asking me to opine on something that's in the realm of the Department of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Rubio, for being here.
I can tell you that the United States is most
certainly
confronting terrorist criminal organizations operating in our hemisphere that pose a grave danger to the United States. Anyone who believes that gangs that flood our country with fentanyl or cocaine are not threats to the United States is not living in reality and certainly does not reflect the opinion of most Americans.
I've long been a believer in the fact that the United States has been abundantly blessed by geography.
So if things don't
God
go well
and
with
nature's
their
God
circumstances,
have
you've
blessed
when did the president say he was going to put troops in Venezuela?
Two vast oceans.
What is your
one to our
criteria
east, one to our west, that have protected us
well,
from
I don't
the
recall the
powers
president saying he was going to put troops
other
in
parts
Venezuela. Where
of
did
the
he say
world.
that?
I'm asking you,
we should use those to our advantage.
I didn't remember
the president has already said that he was ready to
in our
put
past, we have
American troops in Venezuela.
No, I think the president said that he retains the right as commander-in-chief to protect the United States against any imminent threats.
Pleased that
maybe that involves
you and
troops, maybe that
President
involves air
Trump have
power.
been
We hope, but we don't
refocusing on the Western Hemisphere.
in Venezuela.
As we look at burden sharing in other parts of the world,
and testimony here.
Pivot some of this focus
yeah, but I just gave
back
you
to our
testimony
own
on how well
hemisphere.
things are moving forward, not as fast as
Yeah, but you also said that in 6 or 9 months, if things don't go well, you're going to have to do something else. And the president's already said that he's not ruled out the military option.
Well, I think you're seeing some of it now. Look, our hope is eventually not to have every president retains the power to use military presence of the kind you've seen in the Caribbean. And I gave you a very specific example. But the truth of the matter is that it was surprising in the first place. Against an threat. If these ships, there are Iranian, and these assets were deployed in the Indo-Pacific or in the Mediterranean that could threaten the United States somewhere, no one would blink an eye. Even if it's located in Venezuela. The fact that they were deployed in the Western Hemisphere was a shock to everybody. We're not trending in that direction. According to Southcom, they've rarely ever had, on the one hand,
America are worried that this is the president who engages in yet another forever war, Mr.
deal with a very acute
We don't need to be in
that
another
is, and these are,
forever war.
these things become interrelated here at some point, but they're separate in many ways.
How are we going
towards our forever war if we're dealing with
Nelson Rodriguez? You're not going to ask him to rescind his invocation of the Alien Enemies Act. That puts Americans in jeopardy. And let me just say something about the president's recent comments about NATO allies. When I served in Iraq, there were Polish forces there with us. There were British forces there with us. There were Spanish forces there with us. I personally landed in
What is the primary threat in Colombia? Transnational
which came under direct attack by insurgents.
What is the threat to the Caribbean basin?
Polish troops who worked with the Illinois military, with the Illinois National Guard for 30 years.
What's the threat in Haiti?
In Afghanistan,
to systemic collapse. All the president wants NATO to have more control territory, and he wants our allies to have more naval form of government.
The strength of that alliance.
So your time's up. And it ultimately impacts the United States through mass migration. Well, let me just say, the president just wants our allies to have more capabilities, and so we need to have involved in operations that can confront that, and that can provide assistance. That's not an unreasonable other partners. We also need more countries that are willing to cooperate with us. Well, not every country in Europe, not every country in NATO participated in those missions.
Denmark
Trinidad and
suffered some of the greatest military casualties.
There's no doubt that many of our allies continue to do forward and provided assistance to us, and we hope Venezuela will be one of the capability to do it now or in the future, or even the current interim authority or a future
legitimate government of Venezuela.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Rubio, for being here. I also want to thank you for reaching out to me the night of the execution of the arrest warrant against Nicolas Maduro. I could tell when we talked that you had been up all night.
Require some force posture in the region. I think the one area, if your question is in the context of NATO, the one area we have to recognize is that we need to have a presence in the Indo-Pacific. Many of you travel overseas and are constantly being told by our Indo-Pacific allies they want to see a sustained commitment of the United States to the
American continent.
We still have obligations and needs that we need to address
one to our east, one
when
to
it
our
comes to the
west,
Middle East.
We
have a growing threat
powers
of the rise of
other
terrorism
parts
potentially
of the
in the
world.
African continent.
We should use those to our advantage.
And then, of course, you point to the Western Hemisphere.
So
in our that doesn't mean we're abandoning NATO or abandoning Europe. It does mean that we are going to have to, at some point, readjust our force posture in the world to deal with all of these realities. And as a result, is why I keep making the point. The stronger our allies and more capable our allies in NATO are, the more flexibility we'll have to do that. We'll still be there with our assurances. We'll still be there with our presence. We'll still have some of the largest military deployments in the world.
What that looks like. Tell me what it looks like to
but we are going to need some flexibility to do this over time. And we've told this to our allies. And we've told them there'll be no surprises.
Well, I think you're seeing some of it now. Look, our hope is eventually not to have a
and that's why they're moving very quickly in many
military
cases
presence of the kind you've seen in the Caribbean to deal with this very acute matter.
But
the truth of the matter is that it was surprising in the first place.
China gain
if these ships
significant footholds
and these assets were deployed in the Indo-Pacific or in the Mediterranean or in the Middle East somewhere, no one would blink an eye and say, well, that's normal. That's what we always do. The fact that they were deployed in the Western Hemisphere was a shock to everybody because we haven't done it. In fact, according to Southcom, they've rarely have ever had assets permanently deployed to them. They may have been transiting through at some point,
how would you describe the connection between those two things? Are they correlated or is
and that is, and these are, you know, these things
correlation maybe to the extent that you have usually when you have strong
narco
organizations or drug trafficking organizations, you also have very weak states that are these. We have a real reality vulnerable to corruption. So the general Chinese practice has been: you go into a country, you offer to build a bunch of stuff that in many cases possess weapons that you end up building, ascribe to a nation state, and to get that contract, you do it as a market share thing, not because you can make money off it, but because it puts you in place at the expense of everybody else. But also to the stability of the region. You sometimes have to bribe people locally in order to get that, and it gives you a foothold into that country and allows you to expand into other sectors. What is the threat to the Caribbean? In some cases, frankly, it has been like in telecommunications because Huawei shows up with a deal. What's the threat in Haiti? Western company shows up with a deal that's affordable, and that is these criminal gangs that basically control territory and threaten the ability to use a product that's not the best, but it's good enough. So it's endemic throughout the region, subsidized by the Chinese government. And it ultimately impacts the United States. So we've seen that play out in mass migration. It became drug trafficking and other related Panama Canal zones. And so we need to have a Chinese company ended up owning both and that can provide assistance and conduct and on the Caribbean side and Atlantic side. We also need more countries that are willing to cooperate with us and collaboratively work on these things. The way Ecuador's seen their presence, largely through economic means, the way Trinidad and create leverage, the way we historically have done with Colombia, emboldened and either trapped and continue to do in many respects, or trapped in bad contracts they can't. We hope Venezuela will be one of them. Always in sectors that are valuable to China, that include authorities or a future critical legitimate government of Venezuela and cooperated with the United States against Trinidad Agua, cooperated with the United States against the ELN, the FARC, and the drug trafficking organizations. How much easier it would be to confront these challenges that we face. But it will require some force posture in the region. I think the one area, if your question is in the context of NATO, the one area we have to recognize is that we need to have a presence in the Indo-Pacific. Many of you travel overseas and are constantly being told by our Indo-Pacific allies they want to see us. It's not our funds. The funds are in a we still have obligations and needs that we need to address. It's an account that belongs to Venezuela, the Middle East, but it has U.S. sanctions as a blocking mechanism on it. And one of the primary reasons why it was in a third country initially, and then of course we could create the mechanism to move it to U.S. So that doesn't mean we're abandoning NATO or abandoning Europe. One, we have an issue we're working through that we are going to have to at some point. What is exactly readjust you have to recognize the government, but we don't recognize all of these realities. We recognize the 2015 National Assembly. So we have to find some creative way legally to meet that standard. The other is frankly creditors. If any of that money touched the U.S. bank, even if it was an account in the name of the Venezuelans, it would immediately be seized upon by a number of creditors who eventually we'll have to take care of. But in the short term, that would impede the ability of the Venezuelan authorities to receive the funds they need to operate.
And most of them understand it. Frankly, they do.
And that's why they're moving very quickly in many cases to rearm
American money, in which case it's subject to the miscellaneous
over the last 5 to
Act,
10 years, we've seen China
gain
pretty significant
money, but it does sound like, according to the EO, according to the President's statement,
in Central America,
you are in charge of that money. How? What authority are you relying on to be in charge, almost in a sort of receivership kind of arrangement of how
places where drug cartels
funds are both
the
received and expended for a foreign country. Like, wouldn't you have to come
Are they
to
correlated, or
Congress
is it
to establish that kind of relationship?
Well, no, because the money never enters the money. Usually we don't have strong narco organizations. We don't control the actual money. Like it comes into our bank account.
Do you think that
in some cases vulnerable to corruption?
So
So the general Chinese practice has been you go into a country, you offer to build a bunch of stuff that you end up building poorly. Well, they've agreed to get that contract. That's the key. They've agreed to this arrangement in which the sanctions that are placed on this oil is what blocks its distribution. So we've agreed to release sanctions and allow the disbursement of the funding as long as they're spending it in a certain way. So understand it's novel. In some cases, frankly, it has been like in telecommunications because Huawei shows up with a deal and no Western company shows up with a deal that's affordable. I believe there is and there will have to be one most certainly once we transition Huawei provides a product that's not the best, but it's good enough and they can afford it. And it's subsidized by the Chinese. Well, so we've seen that play out in place after. And you probably wouldn't because it's a Treasury matter. Treasury's handled it, but I can most certainly talk to Treasury about providing you the information.
Also, you're the National Security Advisor, so you do have a role here in coordinating between
that canal, which is a great
so it's not
concern to
just
the
like
United
you can punt
States.
this to
So I just didn't bring the document with the presence.
I just want you to
largely through
land it
economic
and get it
means
to
over
the committee,
time,
because
create
look,
leverage
you're being
over nations in
transparent. I
the
think this
country
is
who
novel.
become
I think it's
emboldened and
funky.
either
I think
trapped
it
in
may
debt
not even
traps
be
or
permissible.
trapped in bad
But I
contracts
don't
they can't
know
get themselves
until I
out
see the
of.
document,
And always in
and I'd
sectors
like
that are
you to just
valuable to
land it for
China
us, if
that
that's all
include rare earths.
Yeah,
No, like I said, and by the way, by the time I get it to you, hopefully we won't even have that account anymore. It'll be in a bit more traditional, where we can use our sanctions as leverage on how the money's being spent.
I want to ask about the oil. Under U.S. law, funds received by your comments must be deposited with that Havana should be concerned about the Maduro operations are being held short-term in Qatar, and then we'll move to a Cuba next account. Will you make a public commitment today to rule out U.S. regime change in Qatar to hold the funds?
Regime change? It's not our funds. The funds are in an account that's owned. That doesn't mean that we're going to make a change. It's an account that belongs to Venezuela. There's no doubt about the fact that it has U.S. benefit to the United States if Cuba was one of the primary reasons why an autocratic regime.
But you know what we mean by regime change. We don't mean I wish someone else were in charge.
One, we have an issue we're working
regime
through on
change,
recognition.
Using
what is exactly, you have to recognize a government, but we don't recognize this government. We recognize the 2015 National Assembly.
Coercion.
So we have to find some creative way legally to meet that standard. The other is frankly creditors.
I'm just saying,
if any of that money touched a U.S. bank, even if it was an account in the name of the Venezuelans, it would immediately be seized upon by a number of creditors who eventually will have to take care of. But in the short term,
yeah, but that's statutory.
The Helms-Burton Act, the U.S. embargo on Cuba is codified.
Do you have the
it was codified in law, and it requires regime change in order for us to lift the embargo.
Either it's American money, in which case we have not received any information on the Receipts Act, and there are all kinds of things that attend to that. You're saying it's Venezuela's money, but it does sound like, according to the EO, I mean, I'll just note that you are in charge of Armenia, Azerbaijan, Bahrain. What authority are you relying on to be in charge, almost in a sort of receivership kind of arrangement of how funds are both received and expended for a foreign country? Like, wouldn't you have to come to Congress to establish that kind of relationship?
Well, no, because the money never enters our hands. We only control the disbursement of the money. We don't control the actual money.
But
if you're, like it comes into our bank account.
Do you think that you have somewhere in the statute whether something in terms of a competitive structure to sort of either undermine the UN
well, they've agreed to this. That's the key. They've agreed to this arrangement in which the sanctions that are placed on this oil is what blocks its distribution. So 2 points. The impediment that they have is first of all, as long as they're spending it in a certain way. The UN understand it's novel, but it's the best we can come up with in the short term. And the primary and sole focus of that board right now is to administer. I believe there is and there will have to be one most certainly. And we welcome all these countries have been invited. Some in Europe have chosen not to join it, either because they have constitution. Well, they require constitution. And you probably wouldn't because it's a Treasury matter. Treasury's handled it, but I can most certainly talk to Treasury about providing you the information.
Also, you're the National Security Advisor, so you do have a role here in coordinating
vote. In other cases, because they are concerned about what you just pointed out, they argue. I just didn't bring the document with the UN.
I just want you to land it and get it to the committee.
But the UN has served very low purpose in the case of Gaza, other than the food assistance. And so we think it's critical to have something that's in charge of that.
One final, and I'd like you to 10-second question, if that's all right. We are hopefully about
like I said, and by the way, by the time I get it to you, hopefully we won't even have that account anymore. It'll be in a bit more traditional, where we can use our sanctions as leverage on how the money is being spent.
With my team, I'm just going to move on to a couple of other issues. Your comments implementation of the that Havana should be concerned about.
And we're very happy you're about to pass it. Even if you pass none of the other budgets, you should pass that one.
Thank you. Cuba next.
You could have gone a little further.
Will you make a public commitment today to rule out U.S. regime change in Cuba?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks,
Regime
Mr.
change?
Secretary.
Oh, no, I think we would
thank you for your service. You and I overlapped in the Senate by only a couple of days.
That doesn't mean that we're going to make a change, but we would love to see a change. There's no doubt about the fact that it would be a great benefit to the United States if Cuba was no longer governed by an autocratic regime.
But you know what we mean by regime change. We don't mean, I wish someone else were in charge. When we talk about regime change, we're talking about using the power of the United States, usually kinetic power, but often other kinds of
a safer place.
Coercion.
I push back on the false narrative.
I'm not even saying that that's always not in our interest. I'm just saying
far more than we were around the world.
I'm not asking you whether we would prefer a different
I'm grateful for that. I don't know how
I'm asking
you get around the world
the
way that you do. You must have some type
yeah, but that's
of
statutory. The Helms-Burton Act, the U.S. embargo on Cuba is codified.
Now,
it was codified in law, and it requires regime change in order for us to lift the embargo.
That I'd like to raise with you. I now chair the Western Hemisphere, which you previously chaired the subcommittee.
Do you commit to informing us about
and
what the
I'm often struggling to get briefings, clear information, or meaningful cooperation from the administration
Albania,
and the
Armenia,
State Department.
Azerbaijan,
Let me give you
Bahrain,
3 specific examples.
Belarus, Bulgaria, Cambodia,
I suspect
Egypt,
most
Hungary,
of these are out of
Indonesia, Israel, Jordan,
visibility,
Kazakhstan,
so
Kosovo,
I want to bring them to your
Morocco,
attention.
Mongolia, Pakistan,
Senator
Paraguay,
Kane and I,
Qatar,
who's the
Saudi
ranking member,
Arabia,
tried to do a
Turkey,
hearing on
UAE,
Venezuela
Uzbekistan, and
late
Vietnam.
last year. We
There
were
are
told
a
the State
lot of
Department
countries
would not
with whom we
participate in
normally
that
work
hearing.
very closely
I'm
and
trying
with
to put
whom
together a
we are
hearing right
aligned
now
geopolitically
on
in terms
the
of values
prioritization of the
that are
Western
not on the
Hemisphere, which
board
I
of
think
peace.
would
And
be
so I think it's
very
reasonable
helpful to
for
the
us to
administration,
wonder
and we're
whether
struggling to get
something
the State
in terms
Department
of a
to
I don't know,
participate
competitive
in that.
structure
I
to
couldn't
sort
get a
of either
briefing
undermine the
on
UN
the
or
drug boat
circumvent the UN.
operations.
I just worry that a lot of our
Cane,
friends are not on that
war
list,
power
and some of our
resolution,
adversaries
and all of a
are.
sudden we got a
So,
briefing,
2 points. The impediment that they have
because I was the chair of the Western Hemisphere.
first of all, it's chartered by the UN.
And I want to be clear, I
it's a
support
UN
what's
resolution that
happening
actually
with
created the
Maduro
mechanism
and
by
what's
which the
going
board
on
was
there,
set up.
but I do
And the
think,
primary and sole focus of that board
the
right now
administration
is to
could
administer
get Congress to be a
phase
better
2 and
partner
phase
by
3 of the plan in
informing us
Gaza.
better.
Okay.
And we welcome all these
from my
countries have been invited.
perspective,
Some in Europe have chosen not to join
that,
it,
and I
either
would
because
ask
they have
you, if you were the chair of the Western Hemisphere, would you be
they
okay
require
with that
constitutional
from the
approval
State
of their parliament in order to
reaction
join,
like that
depending
from
on
the State
some leaders.
Department?
Like, for
And what would you
example,
suggest I do?
No, look, I think one of the challenges we face, particularly on Venezuela, on the prioritization on the Western Hemisphere, you'll get in other cases because they are concerned about what you just pointed out. They argue and they want to know figure that out pretty quickly for the UN. And this is not a. But I would say both on Venezuela, but the UN has served very little challenge in the case of Gaza. This is other than the food assistance, and so we think it's critical to have something that's in charge of that. The drug boat operation, which I support, but is not a State Department.
We are hopefully about to enact.
I think now that I'm here testifying with you, there's a lot of State Department involvement in the issue of transitioning and all the projects that we're doing in Venezuela. But everything that led up to that point was not primarily within the jurisdiction of the Department of State. These were Department of War and Department of Justice. Of course, and we're very happy you're about to pass it. Even if you pass none of the other budgets, struggle in those cases would be to provide you witnesses that could say anything meaningful on a topic that was largely from an interagency perspective in the realm of other agencies.
Now, if you were in some of the other committees, I don't know if they've got those hearings. Thank you for your service. You and I overlapped in the Senate by only a couple of days, and as a result,
so I think that was the struggle. Both those were my 2 best days in the Senate with a hearing on Venezuela policy.
As a result, I've only had the luxury of watching you from
on the issue of the broader context.
But I will tell you unequivocally, I'm grateful for your role.
Our priorities in the Western Hemisphere. I think that's something we most certainly can and will provide because it features prominently in our national security strategy. And I think we have a lot of good stories to tell about the Western Hemisphere.
We're not respected. I think we're respected far more than we were around the world from the State Department. And so I'm grateful for that. I don't know how.
No, you'll get it. You'll get it.
You get around the world the way that you do. You must have some type of super power, and I'm grateful for the time you've spent with us
have that
this
type
morning.
of cooperation that the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, I just got to make sure that the people were. Look, I don't want you to have a meaningless hearing. If you're asking about something
that I'd like to raise with you, I now chair the Western Hemisphere, which
hearing on agriculture in front of the State Department. We have limited involvement from an interagency perspective.
To get
in the case of the drug boats in Venezuela, at the time you requested, this was primarily a Department of War function. And so, but in the case of the priorities on the Western Hemisphere, that will happen.
I suspect most
we look
of these
forward
are
to
out of your visibility, so I want to bring them to your attention.
You mentioned Russia, China, Iran.
Senator Kane and I, as the ranking member, tried to do a hearing on Venezuela. As you are, last year we were told the State Department would not participate in that hearing.
Venezuela aside
trying
from
to
just
put
a
together we're hearing right now on the prioritization of the Western Hemisphere, which I think progress we've made, very helpful to the administration, and we're struggling to get the State Department to participate. All of them are important, but specifically on China.
I mean, look, when Iran and Russia, in Iran, their primary foothold in the region was Venezuela. I mean, just put that up front. And it involved more than just selling weapons and all this other stuff. I mean, in many cases, there's clear evidence now that they were providing passports. Venezuelan
I want to be
passports
clear,
with
I
false
support
identities
what's happening
to
with
people who
Maduro
operated on behalf
what's
of
going
both
on there, but
Iran
I do
and
think
Hezbollah. And so the deep concerns about that, and that needs to
could
stop and end.
get Congress
In the
to
case
be
of
a better
Russia, their
partner
primary
by
presence of
informing us
influence in the
better.
region is Venezuela and to
from
some
my
extent
perspective,
Nicaragua and Cuba, which
I'm
is where they
struggling to
operate.
see that.
In the case of China, they do have a
the chair of the
presence
Western
in Cuba.
Hemisphere. Would
They
you be
have
okay with that?
this debt
from the
relationship with Venezuela, where they were basically taking Venezuelan oil as payment on debt. Yeah, no, look, I think one of the challenges we face, particularly on Venezuela, on the prioritization on the Western Hemisphere, you'll get that briefing. I don't know why. And their debt is legitimate. We can figure that out pretty quickly. And on deal with it. I would say both on Venezuela and the drug boat operation. But in the short term, that is now ended. But the primary way that China plays in the Western Hemisphere, I was there for many years, that has oversight over the State. They engage themselves in the drug boat operation. They're very interested in telecommunication. They're very interested in building and controlling key infrastructure. I think now that I'm here, very interested with you. There's a lot of states, and they've secured many leases for many years because of neglect on our part and allowing them to do that, and it's given them leverage. Everything that led up to these countries was not. I will say that I think that influence in our hemisphere has eroded, and Department of Justice operations that were ongoing. For example, Panama. For us to struggle in those cases, we have new leaders in Chile that could say anything meaningful in Paraguay on a topic that was largely from an interagency perspective. Honduras, in the realm of that have expressed a strong desire to realign with the United States and our priorities, and we have great relationships with Argentina, Paraguay, and other countries. So I think that was the struggle both in December, and we've had great cooperation with the hearing on Venezuela policy, and again, including now a case before the Supreme Court on the issue of the broader context submitted that could lead to the eviction and removal of our priorities in the Western Hemisphere. I think that's something we most certainly can and will provide because it features prominently in our national security strategy.
Thank you, Senator.
And I think we have a lot of good stories to tell about the Western Hemisphere.
Mr. Secretary, I want to discuss corruption in the White House and its intersection
to get what?
Help on hearing for
the President and his family have used the office of the presidency to pocket $1.4 billion
we can have that type of cooperation in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, I just got to make sure that people look. I don't want you to have a meaningless hearing. If you're asking about something that's
indicates that some of that is
like
a result of the
president a hearing on agriculture in front of the State
here at home, but much of it relates to the president selling out U.S. interests overseas.
In the case of the drug boats in Venezuela, at the time you requested, this was
including giving away sensitive U.S. semiconductor and AI
but in the case of the priorities on the Western Hemisphere, that will happen.
While the UAE
we look forward to doing that.
$1 billion into one of the Trump family.
You mentioned Russia, China.
And then there are all the other Trump deals that are intertwined with tariff or foreign policy matters. Golf courses in Saudi Arabia and Vietnam, Trump hotels and office buildings in other countries. And of course, there's the $400 million jet from Qatar. The list goes on and on. By any measure, this is the most corrupt administration
all of them are important,
in American history.
Specifically on China.
We also see the president wielding U.S. power overseas in a way that advances the interests of his billionaire buddies.
Put that up front.
At the expense
and it involved
of
more
American
than just selling
interests.
weapons and all this other
it was
stuff.
Ron Lauder,
in many cases, there's
who has
clear
business ventures in Greenland, who reportedly first put the idea of grabbing Greenland
false identities
into President
to
Trump's
people who operated on behalf
and
of
in the case of Venezuela,
Iran and Hezbollah.
President Trump has said he talked to oil executives about toppling
in the
Maduro
case of Russia, their primary presence of influence in the region
before
is Venezuela
in
and to some extent Nicaragua and Cuba, which is where they operate.
That
in the case of China, they do have a presence in Cuba.
Maduro
they have
not about stopping
this debt relationship with Venezuela, where they were basically taking Venezuelan oil as payment on debt.
DEA.
And then they were
reselling it at a huge the former Honduran president convicted of drug running.
That is now obviously
and the new president,
and
Delcy Rodriguez,
their debt is legitimate.
has herself been long suspected
Venezuelan
by
government
DEA
will have to address it
of
and
being
deal with it as
involved
part of a
in
broader
drug
restructuring
smuggling.
of their debt.
She's also a long-time hardened communist leader.
The primary way that
so
China
this
plays in the
operation
Western
certainly was not about bringing more freedom and democracy.
They engage themselves in a country. They're very interested in telecommunication. They're very interested in building and controlling key infrastructure. They're very interested in critical mineral rights. And they've secured many leases for many years because of neglect on our part in allowing them to do that. And it's given them leverage and a presence in many of these countries. I will say that I think that influence in our hemisphere has eroded.
And so the pattern of corruption is clear.
For example, Panama left the Belt and Road Initiative.
We
have new leaders in Chile,
that he had communications with folks from the oil industry about going into Venezuela. before anyone here
that have
in
expressed
Congress was
a strong desire to realign with the United
simple
States
yes
in our
or no
priorities,
question.
and we have
Were
great
you with
relationships
President Trump
Argentina,
during
Paraguay,
any of
and
those
other countries in the
conversations he
region
had
who are also very cooperative?
with
And
people
we've had
with
great cooperation
oil
from the
interests in
Panamanian
Venezuela
authorities as
about
well,
the possibility
including
of
a case
deposing
before the
Maduro?
Supreme Court.
That's not a simple yes or no question, but I can answer it quickly, and that is the president always elicits opinions from all sorts of people, including, for example, Chevron has an active license in Venezuela. They operate in Venezuela. They've been doing so even when the sanctions were in place. So of course you would ask Chevron, what is your opinion of Delcy Rodriguez? What are your opinion of her economy and other prospects? But the notion that somehow the president authorized this challenge at the urging of oil executives is absurd. That never happened.
Mr. Secretary, I'm asking whether you were with the president.
That never happened. I couldn't be with him because it never happened.
New York Times analysis entitled Trump's Plundering of America indicates that some of that is a result of the president selling, inform them, corruption here at home, but much of it relates to the president selling out U.S.
all of those
interests
executives learned about this operation
to make
the same
a killing
time
from
everybody else did.
Including giving away sensitive U.S. semiconductor and AI technologies. He said it. I think it was aboard the Air Force One on an airplane. It's on public record. You can take a look. Trump family. Paul Singer, you know. And then there are all the other Trump $8 million that are intertwined with 2024 or foreign policy matters. Conveniently, golf courses in Saudi Arabia acquired Citgo out of Trump hotels, which is suddenly very, very valuable. And of course, there's the $400 million. Did you or President Trump have any communications with Paul Singer goes on about Venezuela by any measure in the months leading up to the military action administration?
I can tell you, I did not, and I would be.
We also see the president wielding U.S. power overseas in a way that advances the interests of his billionaire buddies.
Was actually
at the expense of American interests.
We don't want to see.
It was Ron Lauder, who has business ventures in Greenland, who reportedly first put the idea of grabbing Greenland into President Trump's mind. And in the case of Venezuela, I appreciate that President Trump has said he talked to oil executives about toppling Maduro. And there's also Venezuela. They've been before anyone in Congress knew. Worth about $250 million. We know that Trump's Vitol senior partner opposing Maduro was not about stopping the flow of fentanyl drugs in the United States. And the list goes on and on. Budget, Mr. Secretary, and I have to say that the former Honduran president of the United States himself and the new president, Delcy Rodriguez, say this was has herself been long suspected by DEA of being involved. It does make all of us ask the question. She's also a long-time hardened communist leader, men and women. So this operation certainly was not about bringing more freedom simply so he could grab that Venezuela.
Well, that oil,
the president told us what it was all about at his big press conference after seizing
Number one, the only reason why we used Trafi and
President said it was about oil,
because in the short term we had to move
use the word oil
50 million barrels of oil that were stuck. And Venezuela needed to turn that into cash so that they wouldn't have systemic collapse.
Human rights.
And the fastest way to do it in the short term is for the traders to do it because that's in the business that they're in. That is not the permanent
Trump
structure.
Has said
the permanent structure we want to see is a normal oil industry where it's sold directly. You know, companies have licenses down there. They have an arrangement to pay royalties, and they move the oil directly to their refineries or sell it in the global market.
Mr. Secretary, simple yes or no question.
The only reason why they were used in this instance is because we had an acute short-term problem, which is how do we provide funding from their own revenue, not ours, to keep their government afloat. So in essence, we allowed Venezuela.
That's not a simple yes or no question, but I can answer it quickly, and that is the president always elicits opinions from all sorts of people, including, for example, Chevron has an active license in Venezuela. They operate in Venezuela. They've been doing so even when the sanctions were in place. So of course you would ask Chevron, what is your opinion of Delcy Rodriguez? What are your opinion of their economy and their prospects? But the notion that somehow the president authorized
Secretary Rubio, good to have you up here.
At the urging of oil executives is absurd. That never happened.
Mr. Secretary, I'm asking whether you were with the president.
That never happened. I couldn't be with him because it never happened. The oil executives were not involved whatsoever in any of the planning on this matter.
If I might.
Did the president,
by the way, I think if we were to pick an MVP of the West Wing, Secretary Rubio, my vote's for Marco Rubio.
I think those all those executives learned about.
I know you do. I know you do. We get a vote on one. I think you've done a great job.
President Trump has said the opposite in public.
No.
He has. I mean, he said it. I think it was aboard
Secretary
Air Force
Rubio,
One on an airplane. It's on public record. You can take a look.
Numerous reasons and good reasons why the U.S. is the arbiter of Venezuelan petroleum sales. With the new export sales framework, the Venezuelan government is now looking to other options to reimburse
suddenly very, very
adversaries, Iran, Russia,
did you or President Trump have any communications with Paul Singer
to include petroleum byproducts, which contain valuable minerals and so forth, Flexico,
yoke. I can tell you I did not, and I would be very surprised what the President did in that regard. And in fact, that Singer position that you've outlined, which is not just him but other creditors, was actually, well, I'm sure we would, except that I can tell you a couple of the reasons that are happening. They have, in essence, represented to us in a third country, and we have seen in action in the work that we don't want it to be Secretary Wright, who's handling this portfolio on a daily basis. He has a deep historic and career knowledge of this field. Is that on all of these things regarding natural resources, there's also VTOL, their preference and their partner of choice moving forward will be the United States and Western companies. But that's what they intend to do. As a point of example, and I said this earlier in the hearing, you may not have been here. Today, they used to get 100% of the
and the list goes on and on.
To have very heavy crude, and so it has to be mixed with light crude in order to make it refinable and movable. And they were getting 100% of it from Russia, primarily because of sanctions. They prefer to have ours. Why? Number one, it's closer. Number two, it's higher quality.
Make all of us ask the question whether he put
of that diluent is coming from the United States.
In the
they were involved in a very complex gold market,
simply so he could grab
in which they were mining that oil. Yeah, and I don't know if you were here. And it was being exported almost entirely through Turkey. And we believe the Iranians were using that as a laundering operation for themselves ultimately, simply because in the short term we had to move. You know that they had 50 million barrels of oil that were stuck. We are on the verge of a process in which that will be sold to the U.S. markets in a legitimate way. And the fastest way to do it in the short term is for the traders to do it. I think we'd like to apply that model to various. That is not the permanent structure. But the end goal in all of this, the permanent structure is number one, not to spend any American money, where it's sold directly. You know, companies have licenses down there. They have an arrangement to pay royalties, and they move the oil directly to the refineries and is not benefiting our geopolitical adversaries. The only reason why they were used in this interim authorities have expressed a desire to cooperate with us on how do we provide funding. You identify an area from their own revenue, not ours, and we're making progress. Government afloat. So in essence, we allowed Venezuela to regards to expanding that relationship.
Secretary Rubio, thank you. And maybe I'll talk to Secretary Wright. We think there may be some workarounds in terms of what's happening there.
That system with those traders, that is not the long-term plan at all.
And so we could talk with
my only point, Mr. Secretary, is those folks who gave a lot of money right now to our adversaries have done very well as a result of what's happened. Thank you.
As well as the Russians. But thank you. Rubio, good to have you up here. We're off to a great start to say we're playing a long game here, and you're playing it very, very well. There as well. I want to pivot now to Ambassador EU energy. I chair the subcommittee here in this committee very for Europe. Hope to debrief you next. We're going to have a hearing. We're looking about having a conversation. By the way, I think if we were to pick an MVP of the West Wing, Secretary Rubio, my vote's benefiting now. Of course,
we have a lot of MVPs.
I know you do. I know you do. We get a vote on one. Mr. Secretary, here's my question: as Russia continues its war in Ukraine, how important is it now for Europe to develop Secretary Rubio energy posture, as you've noted, to ensure there are numerous reasons?
Well, I would argue that one of the reasons why we have a war in Ukraine is because Russia thought they could get away with it because of how dependent Europe was on them for
framework. And the Venezuelan government is now looking to other options to reimburse.
So I think most certainly it served as a contributing factor to the war happening, among others,
as well as Iran's proxies.
The second point is the point the President repeatedly made.
Petroleum byproducts.
We want Europe to be strong. We share a lot of common bonds, both through history and culture.
Has the administration considered expanding
and part of our concerns is that Europe is becoming increasingly vulnerable when it comes to their energy supplies.
Petroleum byproducts.
Increasingly vulnerable both for domestic economic growth, I can tell you a couple things that are happening. They have, in essence, represented to us. But also vulnerable in the work that they're doing to Russian oil, Secretary Wright, who's handling this portfolio. So we are concerned, though it's not our decision to make. We are concerned that EU policies in general on all of these things regarding natural resources at a time when they should be getting stronger, and their partner and their ability to resist forward will be the United States and Western companies.
Secretary, thank you.
That's what they intend to do. As a point of example, and I said this earlier in the hearing.
Last question is
today they used to get 100% of the Asia. To have very heavy crude, and so it has to be mixed with light crude
the 5
in order to make it
that you were at,
refinable and movable.
As well as,
and they were getting 100% of it from Russia, primarily because of sanctions. They prefer to have
they're making
ours.
a
Why?
major
Number one, it's closer.
In terms of
Number two, it's higher quality.
Diplomatic and economic relations with the United States. That all fits in
of
part
that
of the
diluent is coming
puzzle.
from the United States. They were involved in a very complex gold market.
Here's my question:
in which they were mining for gold and silver, and it was being exported almost entirely through Turkey. And we believe the Iranians were using that as a laundering operation for themselves.
Senator Murphy and I are co-sponsors of that bill. We hope to actually get this done and on the President's desk.
We are on the verge of a process in which that will be
Soviet-era
sold to
restriction
U.S.
is not
markets in
relevant
a
at all,
legitimate way
but frankly
that
is
won't go to
hindering
finance
a
and
relationship
support.
with these
I think we'd like to. No, we agree. We agree, and but like I said, one of these areas that you've been focused on is number one, not to spend any Ambassador Gore, that as you know is in India, is also Venezuela to have a normal, countries just came back from Tajikistan a couple days ago. That's not benefiting. So I think that absolutely we would like to see that because it would allow our geopolitical adversaries.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
So far, the interim authorities have expressed a desire to cooperate with us on all of these fronts.
Thank you, Mr.
You identify an area you want to work with, they say yes. And we're making progress on all. We face no impediments to date in regards to expanding that relationship.
Thank you, Secretary Rubio. Thank you. And maybe we'll talk to Secretary Wright. We think there may be some workarounds in terms of what's happening there with some of these petroleum byproducts,
tons of cocaine into the United States.
And so we could talk to
Cocaine
Secretary
that
Wright,
contributed to the deaths of tens of thousands of
Americans. Trading right now
year
to our
after year.
adversaries like
Yet the
Iran,
president and his
Iranian
cabinet
proxies,
authorized a military
as well as the
operation
Russians.
to capture
But
Nicolas
thank you,
Maduro
and
in order to arrest
we're
him
off to
for
a great start to
virtually
say
the
we're playing a
same
long
crime.
game here, and you're playing
yes
it very,
or no,
very
because
well.
I have a bunch of questions here.
I want to pivot
the best
now
of your
to
knowledge,
EU
was
energy.
Hernandez
I
convicted
chair
of
the
trafficking
subcommittee here in
approximately
this committee
400
for
tons
Europe.
of cocaine into the United States?
Next, we're going to have a hearing.
I'm not involved in the
about
pardon
having a
process, I can tell you.
No, I'm just asking if he is.
Yeah, but I don't do yes or no. I don't play games. This is not a game show.
Do you know he was? Okay, so I'm just going to tell you he was.
So I can answer your question because I know what you're getting at, but go ahead.
Secretary, here's my question. As Russia continues
the president felt that he was unfairly treated.
How important is it for Europe
but I can't give
to
you much
develop
insight
a
because I'm not involved in the
posture
Would you
to ensure
not
they have energy security?
Well, I would argue that one of the reasons why we have a war in Ukraine is because Russia thought they could get away with it because of how dependent Europe was on them for energy. And they felt there's no way the Europeans are going to come hard at us because they're too dependent on us for energy. So I think most certainly it served as a contributing factor to the war happening. Again, I can't opine on the specifics of the second point is the point the president repeatedly made. We love you. Office holder. We want not even the president of Honduras. We share a lot of common bonds, either to convict them culture and also the difference between him and Nicolas Maduro and part of our actively engaged in narco trafficking. It was an ongoing endeavor when it comes to their energy
I think it does undermine
increasingly vulnerable both for domestic economic growth, which will allow them to sustain investments in defense and be more reliable partners, but also vulnerable to Russian oil and other things of this nature. So we are concerned, though it's not our decision to make, we are concerned that EU policies in general are leaving Europe more vulnerable at a time when they should be getting stronger in their ability to resist pressure from both Russia and China.
He's reportedly conducted
we
Russian
hope to have that
Ukraine
discussion
talks in
next week at
Switzerland
the subcommittee
beyond
level.
your awareness.
Last question
He and
is
Jared
back to one of my
Kushner
favorite
have been
topics,
described
back
as
to Central
managing the
Asia.
president's Gaza plan.
We had a great
Meanwhile,
dinner
Ambassador
at the White
Barrett is
House
leading
with the
on
5
Syria
Central Asian
policy, while
presidents that you
Special
were at,
Envoy
President
Poulos
Trump, as
is
well
appearing
as
to
Vice
lead on
President
our
Vance. I had
Africa
an
policy.
honor to be there with you
So
all.
I have to ask you.
They're making a major shift
I
right
know
now
the
in terms
answer
of
to
having
this,
a
but I'm gonna
closer
ask you, are
diplomatic
you
and
the
economic
lead
relations
for
with the
US
United States. That all
government
fits
on
part of the
foreign policy?
geopolitical
No,
puzzle.
the lead on U.S. foreign
energy
policy is named
supply
Donald J.
as
Trump,
well.
the President of the United States.
Here's my
on
question.
the individuals you've described, these
How
are very
important is it
valuable
that we
teams. We have an
end these Jackson-Vanik trade
I think it's important. It's a legitimate
as it relates to
question.
our relationship with Central Asia?
I
And for
have the
background here,
distinction, but I think both
Senator
the benefit
Murphy
of
and
being the
I
National
are
Security
co-sponsors
Advisor
of
and the
that bill.
Secretary
We
of
hope to
State.
actually get
As National
this
Security
done
Advisor,
and on
my
the
job is to
president's
coordinate the
desk. It's an
interagency
ancient
function of national
Soviet-era
security, and that
restriction
involves
that's not
foreign
relevant
policy.
at all.
So
and
I
frankly,
speak to
is
Steve
hindering
Witkoff and
our relationship with
Jared
this important
Kushner.
Central Asian
No, we
country.
agree. We agree. And now, like I said, one of these areas that you've been focused on. We have multiple meetings and Ambassador Gore. That all of it is we build a team. We gather facts. We present options, and then we take them to the president. So I think that absolutely it is the president who directs, because it would allow us to do the foreign policy of the United States. That's always been the case, by the way.
You can't overrule their decisions. Do you outrank the special envoys and ambassadors? Do they get your input
as an example?
Do they care about your input, or do they go straight to the president?
Right into it because I want to build
There's
on
no time in which the president is presented an option by one of us at the exemption of everybody else. It depends on the portfolio. But in every one of these portfolios, we have a team approach to this, which is the way the system is supposed to work. It's not the way it's always worked. You have had in the past tensions between the National Security Council that became operational in the Department of State. In this particular case, there's not much conflict between the two because it's the same person. And we basically,
in order to arrest him for virtually
what we basically try to do in every one of these unique missions is we create a consensus team around it, and then we present the president options together.
Was Hernandez convicted
It's
of
the president's
trafficking
decision, nobody
approximately
else's.
400
There's no
tons of
overruling here.
cocaine
The
into
president
the
makes the
United
decision.
States?
I'm not involved in the pardon
Shouldn't
process,
they
I can
report
tell
to
you.
you? I'm just asking if you-
Yeah, but I don't do yes or no. I don't play games. They report to me every day.
Where does the buck stop?
But they
Okay,
report
so
to
I'm
me
just
every
gonna
day
tell
in
you
terms
he
of, so I
was-
can answer
he
your
was
question. I know
convicted.
what's happening. I give advice. I
convicted.
give in some cases direction.
I
They
know.
involved heavily. The president felt that he was unfairly
special
treated.
envoys
I can't, but I can't give you much insight because I'm not involved in the pardon process. To assist them in all of their efforts. For example, on the Board of Peace, we helped them position the entire gathering last week and all the work that's going to happen now. On every one of these issues, it's not linear. No single individual other than the president has the ability to dictate our foreign policy. The difference is, our job is to come to a consensus view on the best way forward, because I wasn't where there are disputes, those are presented to the president, and he was not even the president of Honduras when that decision was made, either to convict him. The difference between him and Nicolas Maduro is he was actively engaged in narco trafficking. It was an ongoing endeavor.
I think it does undermine our credibility,
authority, but I'm going to move on to some foreign policy decision-making here, because despite the fact that you famously or infamously have numerous jobs in the administration, your Secretary of State, your National Security Advisor, Treaties and statutes must be approved by Congress. So when will the administration be requesting President Trump legislation to authorize the President to extend this benefits to the Board of Peace, creating the Board of Peace, and when will it be sent?
Well, actually, the Board of Peace was chartered and set up by the UN Security Council through a vote of the UN Security Council's deliberations. So it's an international organism recognized by the Security Council of the United Nations, which is something I think many of you should be supportive of. The fact that they're doing it.
Claiming his authority is from the International Organizations Immunities Act.
No, the lead on U.S. foreign policy is named Donald J. Trump, the President of the United States. On the individuals you've described, these are very valuable teams. We have an excellent, if I can answer, because I think it's important. It's a legitimate question. I have the distinction, but I think both the benefit of being the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State. As National Security Advisor, my job is to coordinate the interagency function of national security, and that involves foreign policy. So I speak to Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner in the case of Gaza, and now Russia. Probably 10 times a day. We have multiple meetings and coordination. All of it is we build a team, we gather facts, we present options, and then we take them to the President. It is the President who directs the national, the foreign policy of the United States. I hope that you will come more often. That's always been the case, by the way.
You can't overrule their decisions.
But I just wanted to clarify a couple of things. One is that under the CASE Act,
well, as an example,
do they care about your input, or do they go straight to the President?
The State Department is required, as
there's no time in which the President is presented an option by one of us at the exemption of everybody else. It depends on the portfolio. But in every one of these portfolios, we have a team approach to this, which is the way the system is supposed to work. It's not the way it's always worked. You have had in the past tensions between the National Security Council that became operational and the Department of State. In this particular case, there's not much conflict between the two because it's the same person. And we basically,
between you and Senator Rose, and
what we basically try to do in every one of these unique missions is we create a consensus team around it, and then we present the President options together. Options. It's the President's decision, nobody else's. There's no overruling here. The President makes the decision. Our job is to present them options.
Shouldn't they report to you? Shouldn't there be
denied access to any of that information?
They report to me every day.
I would hope
where does the buck stop?
But they report to me every day in terms of keeping me apprised of what's happening. I give advice. I give, in some cases, direction. They involved heavily. For example, the special envoys rely almost exclusively on State Department personnel to assist them in all of their efforts. For example, on the Board of Peace, we helped them position the entire gathering last week and all the work that's going to happen now. On every one of these issues, it's not linear. No single individual other than the President has the ability to dictate our foreign policy. Our job is to come to a consensus view on the best way forward. Where there are disputes, those are presented to the President, and he makes the decision.
Let's talk about the Board of Peace then, because all treaties and statutes have to be approved by Congress, and the President
be part
is
of the
starting a new
on
Board
the
of
war in
Peace
Ukraine and the negotiations
we would need that authority.
And we would love to do that, and I'll make sure that happens. And I will tell you, I can give you a brief update. I know it's late, but I don't mind. We can continue to talk about this a little bit because it's important. It's a very fluid situation, unfortunately. As you know, it's moving very quickly. My sense of it is that for the most part, I've discussed the security guarantees piece, which was part of a meeting and efforts that took place in the early part of this year. I think the one remaining item remains the one you're all familiar with, and that is territorial
Board of Peace, and when will it be sent?
Well, actually, the Board of Peace was chartered and set up by the UN Security Council through a vote of the UN Security Council's deliberations. So it's an international organism recognized by the Security Council of the United Nations, which is something I think many of you should be supportive of. The fact that we're doing it, and it will probably be very difficult. But nonetheless, it's one that work is going on. There was a meeting late last week in the UAE, which I think for the first time in many years is trilateral, involved the U.S. presence. Jared was there and Steve Witkoff were there, along with representatives of Russia and Ukraine. They were going to follow up talks again this week in that regard. Bilateral. There might be a U.S. presence, but it won't be Steve and Jared. And we continue to try to move that forward. I want to speak in frankness with you. Some of this stuff that's being talked about
expect that respect.
It's easier for the parties engaged to find flexibility on some of these matters. They're not being deliberated in the public on a constant basis.
We have just a couple of
because it creates political pressures internally on both sides. As you can imagine in Ukraine,
I agree. Thank you.
The notion that you would even consider
I hope that you will come more often before this
and after all that's gone in the war is not, it's difficult.
But I just wanted to clarify a couple of things. One is that under the CASE Act,
they're winning this war overwhelmingly, so people are going to wonder why are we giving up land if we're winning so strongly.
as our other agencies
so there's some dynamics dynamics there at play
documents
that are
like
important.
the one that Senator
But I think
Schatz was
if you
raising
need more information on
for
that,
the
we'll
agreement
provide it.
between
Just know
Venezuela
that this has been
and the
so
US
fluid
to this
that
committee.
an update
We
like
have
the one
not
I
yet
just gave
received
you
it,
could be
so I hope
outdated in
that,
72 hours
we
if
will
some
see
new
it
development occurs.
in the
But your point is
near
taken,
future.
and we'll be responsive to that.
I appreciate
The
that.
other
I
thing,
think the other point of a hearing,
with respect to the
people a chance to
exchange
ask
between you and
questions
Senator Rose,
that
and
we're
I can tell
hearing,
you
as
that
you
we
know,
have
from our constituents,
as
from
the
other
minority
people,
staff
and try and get
requested
answers
on
on
multiple occasions,
updates from the State
and that's always going to be
Department
the case,
on
and that there are
special
issues
envoys
on
negotiations
both in
on
Ukraine and in
Ukraine
Russia
war
with respect to
with
what
Russia,
comes out
and
in
we
public.
have
But
been denied access
given the
to
amount of
any
money
of that
that the
information.
United States has
I would
put
hope
into
that
supporting this effort,
given
number
the
one,
support among
that
the
would
American
be
people, and
available
given the support in
because
Congress,
I think
it seems to me that,
everybody's interested
we
in
owe
trying
people
to
the
support
ability
efforts
to
to end this
have
war
a
in Ukraine.
public hearing
This
and
should
to
not
ask
be an
questions.
adversarial.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate that. And number two,
Secretary
I would
Rubio,
also hope that, like Senator
don't
Curtis,
answer this
that you would
question
be
if you don't
willing
feel it's
to
appropriate, but did I
have
understand you to
someone
say
from
that,
state come before the committee.
The portion of
We
the
have not had a hearing on
discussions
negotiations over the war in
regarding settlement in
Ukraine
Ukraine,
since I've been
regarding
on this
security
committee
for Ukraine,
and since the
are
president
essentially
took
agreed to by both
office.
sides? Because that's
And so I hope
news
you will
to
make
me,
that
and
commitment
it's a big news item if that's a fact.
Well, I think you could argue
be part of a
they're
hearing
agreed to
on the
from
war in
our
Ukraine
side of the
and the
equation. There's
negotiations
obviously a
there.
Russian dynamic at play here.
We would love to do that.
Of course,
and I'll make
any
sure that
security
happens.
guarantees
And I will
will
tell
come
you
into play after
I can give you a
the
brief
conflict
update. I
would
know
end.
it's late, but I don't mind.
And
We
so
can
there's that
continue to
component
talk about
to
this
it.
a little
But
bit.
the broader
because
point I
it's
was
important.
making is that in all
It's a
these
very fluid
discussions about
situation,
security
unfortunately,
guarantees, as you know,
people
what's
are moving
putting
very
out there,
quickly.
it's pretty
My
clear
sense
that the
of
only
it is
security
that
guarantee for the most part, I discussed the security guarantees piece, is one that involves a deployment meeting and efforts that took place in the early part of this year. But with I think the one remaining U.S. backstop. My point being, and that is in the broader context of the NATO alliance, and that is we have to understand that even something like that. I know there's active work going to try to see if both sides don't have the capabilities of doing a real security guarantee. It's still a bridge we have backstop, which tells you it's still a gap. But at least we've been able to narrow down closed. And it's one of the reasons why the president keeps pointing to NATO, and it'll probably be very for our partners to get stronger. And it is true they've committed to 5%. There was a meeting late last week in the UAE, which I think for the first time in many years, that's really the broader point I was trying to make in that regard. But every notion of security guarantee that's been talked about and the Europeans have pushed is one that requires a strong commitment by the United States. They were going to follow up talks again this week in that regard. You know, in essence means there might be a U.S. presence. We would be committed, potentially, and we continue to try to move that forward. I want to speak, and that's something that I think needs to be understood in the context of what I've just described as the problems with NATO capabilities. It's easier for the parties engaged to find flexibility on some of these matters.
Thank you again for your time.
Not being deliberated
I'm going to leave the record open until close of business tomorrow
because it creates political pressures internally on both sides. As you can imagine in Ukraine, the notion that you would even consider a change
great job.
in land.
Thank you for spending
all
time
that's
with us.
war is not
we sincerely appreciate it.
And in the case of Russia, they've been telling their people for 2.5 years that they're winning this war overwhelmingly. So people are going to wonder, why are we giving up land if we're winning so strongly? So there's some dynamics there at play that are important. But I think if you need more information on that, we'll provide it. Just know that this has been so fluid that an update like the one I just gave you could be outdated in 72 hours if some new development occurs. But your point is taken, and we'll be responsive to that.
I appreciate that. I think the other point of a hearing is it gives people a chance to ask questions that we're hearing, as you know, from our constituents, from other people, and try and get answers. And I appreciate that it's a changing dynamic and that that's always going to be the case, and that there are issues on both in Ukraine and in Russia with respect to what comes out in public. But given the amount of money that the United States has put into supporting this effort, given the support among the American people, and given the support in Congress, it seems to me that we owe people the ability to have a public hearing and to ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate that.
Secretary Rubio, I don't answer this question if you don't feel it's appropriate, but did I understand you to say that